As soon as Wendy mentioned that a huge group of refugees from the Eastern Territory would be arriving, the entire room was then filled with chatters. Wendy then explained the shipping department was going all out to bring them over. And right now, the entire lake was packed with boats, all loaded with food and winter clothing, ready to bring them over. The witches then started asking about their hometowns. Some asked about the situation in Golden Sickle City. Some of them secretly hoped that people from their hometown might be among the refugees. However, one of the younger witches suddenly remembered how her father had kicked her out of the house when he found out she was a witch. Now, she wasn't so sure she wanted to run into anyone from home after all. Another witch tried to comfort her, saying that it was all because of the church's nonsense and they probably regretted it by now. Wendy tells everyone there were about 12,000 people on their way. She explained that these folks were coming from everywhere, from Golden Sickle City to Sewin County, so it'd be almost impossible not to run into someone back home. Once Scroll finished up the headcount, they could start matching people up by their backgrounds. But Wendy also reminded them not to stress out, since this was just the first wave and more people would be arriving in Neverwinter soon enough. She believed that if they stay here long enough they will run into a familiar face. Wendy then looks at the younger witch and tells her that even if she doesn't want to reconnect with family, at least hearing some news is better than nothing. Perhaps her family might regret what they had done and want to make amends. Hearing this, the younger witch named White Pear nodded quietly. That's when Akima piped up asking if they were planning to move the whole Eastern Territory to Neverwinter. Wendy smiled and explained, it's not just the Eastern Territory. The North, the South, and even the central parts of the kingdom are part of the relocation plan. Eventually, only a few big cities will remain, and everyone from the smaller towns and villages will be gathered in them. Akima, clearly confused, wanted to know why the king would go through all this trouble. Wendy shrugged, not entirely sure how to explain it either. She remembered Roland called it something like urbanization, quite a fancy word. Basically, things used to be super spread out because everyone needed a ton of farmland just to feed one city. Now, food isn't such a big issue anymore, and all those villages are tough to manage. So, they figured it's better to have people move to the cities, which is better for city growth and all that. Wendy then turned to Akima and asked her if she had ever wondered what would happen to her sisters if she had just decided to leave right now. Akima frowned, not answering right away. Wendy pressed on, asking her if she really wanted her sisters to abandon their loved ones and wander around their likely empty and rundown hometowns. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension, saying all of this is an act of weakness. Everyone whipped their heads around to see Nightingale emerging from the mist, casually sitting on the table. Akima, slightly taken aback, asked, "Who is she?" Wendy jumped in, equally surprised but quickly explaining that Nightingale meant no harm, she was just the witch secretly assigned to protect her. Nightingale, with a smirk, asked the group if they thought she was wrong. She believed the only reason they were hesitating was because of Bloodfang, and that deep down, they didn't really want to serve Princess Tilly anymore. She pointed right at Akima and said that all of them still rely on that sleeping spell to get by, so in the end, nothing really changed. Akima shot back, saying that was nonsense. Her excuse was if it wasn't for Doris, they would have left ages ago. She was quick to challenge Nightingale, asking what she even knew about the whole Bloodfang and Slumbering Isle issue. Nightingale didn't bother answering directly. Instead, she threw out a question, asking them why weren't they working. The question caught Akima off guard. Nightingale raised two fingers and started breaking it down for them, step by step, while doing some quick math for them. For example, the travel costs and food expenses for getting from Neverwinter to the Eastern Territory. Then add the daily expenses once they get there. She also mentioned that most of those places have turned into wastelands thanks to war and migration. So, if they wanted to buy supplies out there, it would cost them 10 times more than normal. That's why so many refugees were heading to Neverwinter in the first place. Jumping off the table, she walked slowly toward Akima and added that none of them had a single gold coin in their pockets, so leaving wasn't as easy as they thought. If she were in their shoes, she'd seize this opportunity in Neverwinter, apply for a job, and use it as a stepping stone to make their group self-sufficient. She didn't just stop there. She pointed out that for the last 2 weeks, they'd been enjoying food and supplies offered to them for free, and if they were still waiting for Princess Tilly to send them travel money too? Akima still tried to argue, but Nightingale cut her off. She didn't want to hear any excuses, and this is why she called it weakness. She believed initially they all turned to Bloodfang because of the church, which is understandable, but when the whole mess happened between Bloodfang and Tilly's faction, they still had many options, yet they did nothing. Nightingale may not have known all the details about Bloodfang and Slumbering Isle, but she is certain of one thing, which is that all of the Bloodfang members were in Neverwinter now. If they wanted to know what happened, they could go ask any time. She asked her if she honestly thought Heidi considered them as her sisters. Wendy rushed over, trying to calm things down, telling Nightingale to stop, but Nightingale wasn't finished. She went on, revealing Heidi's true intentions. Heidi doesn't see any of them as a sister, rather she sees them as a tool. If she really trusted or cared about them, why didn't she tell them about the plan to overthrow Tilly back on Slumbering Isle? Akima was speechless. Nightingale then pressed on, telling her that if she wanted to prove her determination, she better start with the basics. She can make up excuses when they are back on some deserted island all she wants, but here in Neverwinter, neither Tilly nor the sleeping spell won't hold them back anymore. Nightingale glanced at Wendy one last time, then disappeared back into the mist. Wendy sighed and turned to the others, explaining that Nightingale is just a very straightforward person, but she doesn't mean any harm, so they shouldn't take her words too personally. But the witches were already looking down, feeling quite embarrassed. They knew that without the sleeping spell, things could get really tough for them. Akima, lost in thought, remembered the old days back when she had to use her abilities just to find loose coins on the streets, scraping together enough for a single loaf of bread to share with her sisters. They huddled together in a leaky shack, with no clothes, just trying to survive. Some of them didn't make it through those hard times, at least not until they met Bloodfawn. Akima clenched her fists, realizing that Nightingale had a point. Ever since Bloodfawn came into the picture, her group had gradually lost its independence. After all, why bother scrounging for a few coins when the combat witches had quicker, more profitable ways of earning? Suddenly, she turned to Wendy and asked, if they decided to leave Sleeping Spell, just how hard would things get for them? Wendy wasn't sure of the exact details. She admitted she didn't know how much the Sleeping Spell was planning to give out to the witches, but she was pretty confident it wouldn't be less than what the Witch Union offered. So probably no less than 1 gold coin a month, maybe more, but still, that's about 4 or 5 times what the average worker earns. Plus they get food and a place to live. Even if they left the sleeping spell, the Witch Union couldn't take them in right away. Wendy explained it was because His Majesty didn't want to create any tension between the two groups, which could easily lead to misunderstandings. But Akima didn't seem to care. She scoffed and did some quick math. Although they will no longer get paid by the sleeping spell, they can still find a job working for 20 silvers a month. With the 6 of them, that's 120 silvers altogether. She believed Nightingale really underestimated her. Akima isn't some pampered noble girl. She has dug through sewers and trash heaps just to find food, so she's not scared of a little hardship. She says it loudly for everyone to hear, although not even sure if Nightingale is still in the room, but she still challenges Nightingale and tells her to just watch. Wendy opened her mouth to offer more advice, but Doris gently stopped her. Doris knew Wendy meant well, and after everything Nightingale had said, Doris felt a bit ashamed of their past actions too. Maybe Nightingale was right, perhaps Heidi never truly cared about them. Still, Doris supported Akima's decision no matter what. So did all of them. Akima turned to face the group. She's decided that she would be leaving the sleeping spell, and she would repay everything they owed to them. And she promises that she will prove Nightingale wrong. Since Akima was so determined, Wendy agreed to explain the situation to Tilly. At the same time, she'd ask Roland to allow them to keep their special wages. That way, when they joined the Witch Union later on, they could also earn some allowances to make things a bit easier. Akima turns around and tells Wendy to do whatever she wants to do. She doesn't care. After leaving the building, Wendy let out a long sigh. Nightingale, sensing something was off, asked what was bothering her. Wendy confessed that she suddenly felt a bit guilty. She's not exactly the person they think she is. Her goal coming in today was getting them to work for Roland. Nightingale walked up to her, offering a reassuring smile, saying Wendy's doing what's best for everyone. If she left them in their current state, their rebellious attitudes would eventually cause problems for Princess Tilly too. Clearly, that wouldn't help anyone. Nightingale had seen plenty of people like Akima, and she believes that sometimes tough love works better than soft words. Wendy felt a little better, and she believed asking for Nightingale's help was the right call. She managed to shut down someone like Akima, who doesn't even hold back in front of Tilly. No wonder they used to call her the shadow assassin of the capital. Nightingale replied it was all Wendy's plan and she's just delivered it with a bit more edge. Wendy shook her head, believing the little bit of edge was everything. Even she got scared for a moment since it didn't look like Nightingale was acting. Nightingale wasn't sure if Wendy was complimenting her or teasing, but Wendy just turned around with a grin, saying she really meant it and she will offer chaos drinks as proof. The next morning, after reading through Wendy's report, Roland finally felt relieved. Just as he set the report down, the phone rang. A voice on the other end informed him that the Fjord Explorer, Sandbirdman, and his fleet had arrived at the port. Roland quickly made his way to the port, flanked by a few guards. Waiting for him was Margaret, someone he hadn't seen in a while, and next to her was the Fjord Explorer, Sandbirdman. But Roland had to do a double take when he saw Sand's outfit. The guy was covered head to toe in feathers, looking more like a walking bird than an explorer. Looking at Sandbirdman, or perhaps we better call him Thunder, had completely misunderstood the assignment and took Roland's words way too literally. While he knew Thunder didn't want Lightning to recognize him, there was no way this over-the-top disguise would go unnoticed. With both Lightning and Maisie always keeping an eye on things, even with a fake mustache slapped on, Maisie would totally see through it. But Thunder seemed pretty pleased with himself. He was even a bit smug about his getup, saying how this look even becomes quite the trend across several islands, ever since he had it custom made. Roland couldn't help but wonder if it was because everyone in the fjord looked up to Thunder. Either way, it's nice to see Thunder, who's almost 40 but still kept this youthful energy, since Roland is sure no one else would bother going to such lengths for a made-up name. However, Thunder was surprised to hear the steamship was completely built. He knew in the fjord, even with the best craftsmen and materials, it would take years. Roland, however, thought it took long enough, since steel is a lot easier to work with than wood, so they didn't need to soak it to prevent rot or wait for it to dry and set. Just get the heat right, and they are good to go. He then invited Thunder to have a look. Hearing that, Thunder's eyes lit up with excitement. But then Roland glanced at the huge crate of gold coins. He asked what was with all the gold, since he was pretty sure they made an agreement where he would only charge Thunder the cost price for the ship. Margaret chuckled and explained, of course, they wouldn't dare refuse Roland's generosity. But this isn't for the ship, it's from the sales of perfume and chaos drinks. Roland stared in amazement. He believed the deadline for the delivery wasn't even close yet. Margaret smiled and added that they were passing through anyway, they thought they'd lighten the load for next time. Roland's two products were a massive hit in the fjord, especially the chaos drinks. The premium ones could be flipped for 10 times their original price after just a few trades, and even the lower quality versions had collectors eager to snatch them up. Chaos drinks had basically become a status symbol at all the major merchants' banquets. Hearing this, Roland knew letting professional merchants handle the business was definitely the right call. Just then, Nightingale whispered something in Roland's ear, snapping him out of his thoughts. He was told there was a witch in the crew. Looking more closely, he spotted her hiding behind two maids. When the girl saw Roland looking at her, she quickly ducked behind the maids, meanwhile sneaking glances at him. Roland remembered Margaret mentioning this was her childhood friend. Sure enough, Margaret introduced the girl as Joan. What caught Roland's attention, though, was that Joan had legs now and was able to come on land. He recalled Margaret once saying that Joan had chosen to live in the sea and hadn't interacted with humans for a long time. Margaret explained that this change was thanks to Tilly and Camilla. Without the ability to communicate directly through consciousness, Joan might still be struggling to adapt to life among humans. But there was still a big hurdle because Joan had forgotten how to speak. Thunder had brought in all sorts of scholars to help, but so far, Joan could only manage a few words, unable to hold a proper conversation. Margaret paused for a moment, and Roland, curious, asked what was on her mind. She hesitated before admitting, saying she was not sure if it was because Joan spent so long in her transformed state, but some parts of Joan's body weren't quite human anymore. She then continued explaining that normally, witches look just like anyone else when they're not using magic. But Joan, well, she can't fully return to her original form. For instance, she still has some scales on her body. Roland's mind immediately flashed images of Lorca's fluffy ears. He thought, scales are pretty cool too. But he quickly shook off the dirty thoughts. Now wasn't the time to be daydreaming. He remembered how Lorca's ears even made her own people uneasy, and he worried that Joan's situation might be even worse. After a moment of consideration, he asked Margaret if he could get a closer look at Joan. Margaret nodded, and as Roland slowly approached Joan, she looked a bit frightened, hiding further behind the maids. Roland looked concerned and asked Margaret has someone had been harassing Joan. Margaret let out a sigh and explained although they tried their best to prevent it, word still got out, and some people are just way too cruel. Thunder then explained to help Joan readjust to human life, they couldn't avoid her interacting with others. But unfortunately, very few in the fjord can accept her appearance. Some maids and scholars even ran off in fear, and even rumors started spreading that he was keeping a sea demon at home. Thunder shook his head, clearly frustrated, and he believed if this keeps up, maybe the sea is a better place for her after all. But Margaret didn't agree. From what she's seen, Joan doesn't seem to dislike these changes. Sure, she still needs to spend time in the sea every week, but she really enjoys hanging out with the maids who accept her. And she's even developed a taste for cooked food, no longer eating raw seafood. As they spoke, Joan peeked out from behind the maids, only to quickly hide again. Margaret apologized to Roland, saying Joan is just not used to so many people yet. Nightingale couldn't help but tease, saying it was Roland that scared her. However, he just shrugged it off, deciding not to push Joan further. He believed there's plenty of time, and she'll get used to things eventually. With that, he motioned for Thunder to follow him to the docks for a tour. As they arrived, the shipyard was a fortress in itself, surrounded by tall walls, watchtowers, and First Army soldiers keeping guard. When Margaret laid eyes on the massive iron ship, she was speechless, almost thinking she was dreaming. Even Thunder, who had seen all kinds of ships, was buzzing with excitement, even saying the biggest three-mast ship wouldn't stand a chance against this beast. Heck, he bet even a deep-sea monster would turn tail and flee if it saw this thing. The sailors who came with Thunder were equally thrilled. Thunder couldn't help but marvel, although he knew Neverwinter's shipbuilding was impressive, this was something else. Just the fact that they managed to piece together such hard steel and all the materials they used was far beyond anything the fjords could ever manage. Realizing just how costly this ship must have been to build, Thunder glanced down at his coin pouch, already calculating how much this was going to set him back. Roland noticed the look on his face and chuckled, telling him they could talk about the price later. But he promises, it'll be a lot cheaper than he thinks. However, that's not really the point. Roland's tone grew more serious as he continued, just like he said before, exploring new seas is important for all of humanity. And as the king of Grey Castle, he's more than happy to contribute to that cause. Thunder was moved by Roland's vision. Very few people were willing to spend money on something that didn't offer immediate returns, even in the fjord, where merchant guilds only cared about new trade routes that promised profit. Thunder thought Roland's way of thinking surpassed that of most explorers. Hearing this, Roland thought to himself, it seemed that back when they first met, Thunder didn't fully believe in his words. But in terms of sheer curiosity about the world, Roland felt no one could match him, especially since the mysteries he sought to uncover might hold the key to the divine war and the secrets hidden behind it. Before long, Roland led them aboard for a full tour of the ship. By the end of the tour, he was in awe. This wasn't just a ship, it was like a floating fortress. Thunder thought Roland had overestimated his own expectations because this was beyond anything he could have imagined. With this ship, Thunder felt confident he could cross even the treacherous Maelstrom Sea. But Roland chuckled, telling him to not jump to conclusions just yet. He admitted that he knew next to nothing about shipbuilding. He tells him this is really just a complicated machine right now, not a true sea vessel. And they need to test it in the water to see how it performs, testing its speed, stability, crew capacity, and food storage, things he will likely need Thunder to provide input on. However, if everything goes well, he will be able to head to the Shadow Isle after the month of the demon ends. Thunder was shocked by his words. Didn't Roland just say he didn't know anything about shipbuilding? He let out a laugh, saying if those old shipwrights heard Roland, they'd probably throw themselves into the sea out of shame. But deep down, he believed Roland. If Roland managed to craft such a beast without having much knowledge, then what about the stuff he actually knows? Roland gave him a sly grin and tells him that he would find out the answer to that question tomorrow. But first, they should enjoy tonight's banquet. And while they are at it, he will introduce him to the person he's been dying to meet. As evening fell, the castle came alive with music and laughter. The banquet tables were overflowing with food and drink, and Roland was still deep in conversation with Thunder. Off to the side, Lorca, Maisie, and Lightning were enjoying the feast. Lorca nudged Lightning, pointing to the man talking to Roland. She heard that guy's an explorer from Lightning's hometown, asking if she's curious to talk to him. Lightning, chewing on a piece of food, shrugged, recalling the man's name was Sandbirdman or something, but she'd never heard of him before, so probably not a very important person. She nonchalantly passed a mushroom up to Maisie, who was perched on her head. She tells them the fjord has tons of explorers, but most of them are just guys who've sailed a few routes and never even seen a hurricane. What she's more curious about is why Rem hasn't shown up yet. Lorca, wagging her tail with curiosity, watched the man closely. She believed the guy must have been quite important if her great chieftain was personally talking to him. She insisted that the man might have some news about her father. Maisie agreed, flapping her wings in support. Lightning let out a sigh, but since her friends were so interested, she decided to go say hello. After all, they were just looking out for her. As she slowly made her way toward the two of them, she watched Sandbirdman's exaggerated gestures and thought the guy was too flashy, and his clothes are rather quite ridiculous. In her mind, this guy is nothing like her father's calm, commanding, and respectful nature. Just as Lightning was about to approach, Margaret appeared, smiling warmly, and tells her it was perfect timing. She then pulled Lightning forward, introducing the man, saying his name is Sandbirdman, an explorer from Twin Dragon Island, and also the head of his local merchants guild, who happens to be a huge fan of her father. Lightning gave him a polite smile as they made eye contact. Thunder, ever the showman, played along and asked if she was Lord Thunder's daughter. Tells her that Margaret has told him so much about her and how Lightning really does look like her father. Lightning smiled, but inwardly her impression of him dropped even more. Her father had always told her she looked more like her mother, who she never had the chance to meet. Lightning remained polite and asked him if he had any recent news about her father. Thunder, still sticking to his third-person storytelling mode, recounted some of his recent adventures. He even warned Lightning not to believe any malicious rumors she might hear about her father. As they chatted, Lightning's impression of him improved slightly and believed the man wasn't so bad after all. At least now he seemed more tolerable. Curious, she asked if he discovered any new islands on his journey. Thunder paused, glancing at Roland, who gave him a knowing smile. Thunder then replied, saying how he owed it all to her father. After they discovered the Shadow Isles, his crew set off to deliver supplies, but along the way, they ran into a sea monster. It knocked them off course, and that's when they stumbled upon an uncharted island. Roland couldn't help but admire Thunder's acting. He was spinning quite the tale, and somehow, Lightning didn't seem to suspect a thing. But from Lightning's point of view, she had pieced it together. This Sandbirdman guy was just one of those lucky explorers who happened to discover something by chance after a few voyages. So she smiled and said, "That's exactly the thrill of exploration, you never know what you'll find." With that, she excused herself, bowing to Roland before leaving. As she walked away, Thunder breathed a sigh of relief, feeling confident that his disguise had worked. He turned to Roland and said he was glad that he made the right choice. He will leave Lightning in Roland's care from here on out. Margaret, watching Lightning walk off, said out loud how she's really grown up. The way she spoke so seriously just now made her just want to scoop her up and smother her like when she was little. Roland smiled and nodded, telling Thunder she hadn't given up her adventurous spirit. Even here, she's already started her own exploration team. Sure, it's only 3 members right now, but he's certain one day she'll be following in Thunder's footsteps. Thunder let out a sigh, believing if it's truly unavoidable, then maybe it's just fate. But he'd rather his daughter never face those dangers. At least, until that day comes, he just wants her to stay happy and safe. The 3 of them turned to look at Lightning. She was chatting and laughing with her friends, completely at ease. Roland gave Thunder a reassuring pat on the shoulder while telling him to not worry, and promised to take care of Lightning. Back with her small crew, Lightning's friends were quick to ask if she heard anything about her dad. Lightning shrugged, saying just as she thought, there's nothing new. But she wasn't too bothered by it. Even reassured them with a grin since she believed these things are more fun when they handle them themselves. That's what their little exploration team is for. She looked around, though, noticing that Rem still hadn't shown up. Lightning felt a bit disappointed. After all, Rem had been so confident before, and now she doesn't even show up. Lorca, curious, asked, "What's this challenge she's planning anyway?" Maisie fluttered her wings while saying she had no idea. Lorca facepalmed in frustration, wondering to herself why she joined this team in the first place. But both Lightning and Maisie, with typical adventurous spirits, were ready for whatever challenge Rem threw their way. Just then, Rem arrived, apologizing for being late. The group turned to her, and Lightning teased, saying she thought Rem chickened out. Rem puffed up proudly and explained that she was just investigating some things to make sure the challenge went smoothly. With a dramatic flair, she explained the rules of the challenge, but before they get into that, she's going to introduce her team. And then she announced, from today, the Neverwinter Detective Agency is officially formed. She said this with such enthusiasm, but Lily immediately protested, saying she was not part of this. Meanwhile, the 3 of them had no idea what a detective agency was. Rem blushed and quickly added, "It's the name that His Majesty gave them." She heard about it from Sister Wendy after they helped investigate that arson case in the Academy District. Apparently, Roland liked what they did and came up with the name. Lightning raised an eyebrow, feeling a bit skeptical, and said it sounds fishy. Rem shot back telling her to ask Sister Wendy if she doesn't believe it. Sharon, one of Rem's new recruits, seemed thrilled. Believed if they could help improve the safety of Neverwinter, she's willing to join the detective agency. For anyone who didn't remember Sharon, she was the girl who stood up to some bullies at school, protecting her classmates. It was at that moment she unexpectedly awakened as a witch, and her ability accidentally started a fire. Anyway, Summer also volunteered. After all, she was already part of the security bureau. Rem gave them both a big thumbs up. She knew Lightning often had scouting missions for the First Army, so as long as they prioritized the King's orders, there wouldn't be any issues with the challenge. Lily, however, raised her hand in protest. She tells them that she already has way too much going on in the lab, and she has to double the mushroom farming operations, so she doesn't have time for these games. No amount of persuasion could convince Lily. Rem huffed, calling her a traitor. Lily, irritated, was about to storm off, but Rem quickly hugged her to stop her. She pleaded for her to hear her out first. She tells everyone that everyone knew His Majesty had recently welcomed a group of guests from the fjord, and tonight's banquet was held in their honor. Among them, there was a witch. Rem explained that she had been down at the port doing a light inspection, but Lily interrupted, rolling her eyes. Wondering who checks lights during the day, pointing out Rem was clearly just wandering around. Ignoring her, Rem continued her story. She had spotted the witch among the group from the fjord. Apparently, they would be staying in Neverwinter for a few months, and that is where the challenge comes in. Turned out, the challenge this time is to see who can recruit the new witch into their team first. She pointed out that her detective squad now had 4 members, making it the largest group in the Witch Union. But since Lightning's group was formed earlier, she considered them tied in strength. This competition would settle who had the strongest group once and for all. Lorca, munching on some food while listening, finally chimed in. She then asked, "So the whole challenge is about recruiting a witch?" Which seemed kinda random to her. But Lightning and Maisie were already fired up, taking the contest very seriously. Lorca sighed, thinking to herself once again, is it too late to back out now? Even though Lightning's team was outnumbered, she didn't see it as a problem. With a confident smile, she looked at Rem and said, "Challenge accepted." Rem quickly warned the others not to think this challenge would be easy. She explained that Joan couldn't really speak and was very cautious around strangers. She explained it's kind of like how they were when the church was hunting them down, so she believed it was going to be a long game. Both teams agreed to the challenge with a handshake. That's when Lorca walked over and interrupted, asking a very practical question. Even if she stays for a while, Joan will eventually leave. So, what's the point of recruiting her if she's just going to move on? But Rem had a different view. She recalled how Roland had helped her out of her own dark place. So she believed if they could help Joan become more open and cheerful, then what they were doing wouldn't be meaningless. Meanwhile, her gaze drifted toward Roland. She believed to ordinary people, it might not seem like much, but for someone like Joan, it could be like a light shining into her darkness. Rem smiled softly and tells Lorca that's what His Majesty has been doing from the very beginning. Lorca couldn't help but smile back. Maybe this group wasn't as immature as she thought. Suddenly, Lily raised an eyebrow and asked, "How did Rem know all this about Joan?" Rem froze for a moment. Then it hit Lily, Rem must have used Summer's abilities to eavesdrop on Roland's conversation. Lily was fuming. Rem hurried to defend herself, saying she was just replaying the scene at the harbor. His Majesty said everything in front of everyone and it wasn't a secret. Lily wasn't having it. Since this was clearly crossing the line, she even planned to go and tell Wendy. Rem panicked, trying to plead her case, but Lily just pinched her cheeks. Rem quickly promised, saying it won't happen again. Just then, Maisie suddenly soared into the air. No one paid her attention as she flew across the banquet hall, grabbing a piece of roasted meat right in front of the surprised Sylvie. Carrying the meat, she headed straight for Joan. Joan and the maids around her were startled, but when she saw Maisie, Joan didn't seem to mind at all. In fact, she greeted Maisie with a friendly smile. The two then started talking to each other, Joan with soft grunts and Maisie with her usual bird-like cools, which caused Lorca to watch in bewilderment since the conversation was utterly incomprehensible. After a while, Maisie fluttered back to Lightning's shoulder, proudly announcing that Joan had agreed to join their exploration team. Everyone turned to see Joan, accompanied by her maids, slowly making her way toward Lightning. Even Margaret and Roland noticed them. Meanwhile, Maisie was flying back and forth between the two, as if she were relaying some important messages. To everyone's surprise, Joan allowed Lightning to hold onto her hands. Roland quickly realized what had just happened. Margaret, on the other hand, was completely stunned. She tells Roland this is unbelievable because it took them 2 months just to get her out of the water, and that was with Camilla's help. Thunder was equally curious. How did Lightning manage to do it so quickly? Roland took a sip of his drink and tells them Lightning didn't need to do anything special, just having Maisie and Lorca around did the trick. He explained that Joan's distrust stemmed from how people treated her as an outsider. But when she's surrounded by others who are considered different too, like Maisie and Lorca for example, that barrier naturally comes down. In Joan's eyes, they are just like her. Margaret still seemed a bit puzzled, so Roland elaborated, Margaret is already familiar with Maisie, but this is her first time seeing Lorca, but Lorca is very similar to Joan. As they watched the group interact, Joan seemed completely at ease, even picking up Lorca's tail with a sense of curiosity. Roland smiled, seemed like Joan is fitting in perfectly. As Margaret watched the girls laughing and having fun, she wondered if Lorca had ever felt feared or rejected by others. Roland shook his head, explaining that if she hadn't been, she might never have come to Neverwinter in the first place. Even in the far southern lands where she grew up and lived her whole life, where witches were honored as goddesses, but her different appearance still caused many of her own people to struggle with accepting her. Though there was still some wariness in Neverwinter, it was far less pronounced, and in the Witch Union, rejection simply didn't exist and a new sister was always welcomed with open arms. Thunder chimed in with his own thoughts, saying that humanity's greatest fear was the unknown. When he first set out as an explorer, his plan had been to strike it rich, but now he just wanted to see as much of the world as he could in his lifetime. There were countless mysteries waiting to be uncovered, and he believed that if people didn't venture out, they'd remain forever trapped on a small piece of land, shackled by their own fears. Roland raised his glass in wholehearted agreement. In fact, he believed that if Thunder continued thinking this way, he would undoubtedly go down in history as the greatest explorer. Thunder clinked his glass with a grin, thanking Roland for the high praise and promising not to let him down on this journey. Meanwhile, Margaret watched the witches, lost in thought for a moment before turning to Roland with a hesitant request. Roland encouraged her to speak her mind, and Margaret explained. Originally, she had planned for Joan to settle back in the fjords after the expedition. She believed the seafaring life was lonely, and she didn't want Joan to continue being alone. But now, she had changed her mind. She wanted to leave Joan in Roland's care. Roland was a bit surprised and asked if she meant for Joan to stay in Neverwinter. Margaret nodded, explaining that if Joan stayed in the fjords, her world would remain small, with few chances to talk to anyone. In Neverwinter, Joan could make real friends. Margaret had brought Joan out from the sea, hoping she'd find a better, more welcoming place to belong, and Neverwinter was clearly the best choice. Without a moment's hesitation, Roland agreed. After all, the Witch Union was created for exactly that purpose. Margaret smiled, relieved, and bowed to him, saying his words had put her at ease. After the banquet, everyone headed back to their rooms. Lily was trying to read, but the persistent murmuring nearby was driving her to the edge. Over and over, Rem kept muttering about their loss, and finally, Lily couldn't take it anymore. She spun around and asked her to stop and just go to sleep. Rem, lying on the bed, whined about how their detective squad had lost, looking even more miserable now. She'd been so sure she'd come up with the perfect plan to recruit the new witches, but everything had gone down the drain. From what she'd observed, Lightning's team didn't even seem to understand each other half the time. How did they manage to communicate? Either way, they now had the same number of members, and even the title of the biggest squad was gone. Lily thought to herself that Rem's grand plan hadn't even come close to working, as she'd lost before the other team even tried. But she didn't want to rub it in. As Lily sat back down, Rem asked if she didn't feel at least a little sad about it. Lily sighed, telling her that she'd never agreed to join the challenge in the first place. With only 3 members, they already lost while being outnumbered, so they might as well disband. Lily picked up her book and resumed reading, but surprisingly, Rem didn't keep nagging her. The silence actually made her feel more uncomfortable, causing her to wonder to herself if she had been too harsh. Rem could be annoying at times, but her intentions were good. Without her antics, who knows how long it would have taken for Joan to start bonding with everyone. Sure, eavesdropping on His Majesty had been a huge no-no, but no real harm was done. Maybe she was being too tough on Rem? After all, Rem hadn't always been this way. She used to be incredibly timid, especially because of her abilities, and Hakura used to scold her a lot. Thinking this over, Lily suddenly felt a pang of regret. What if her words had crushed Rem's spirit all over again? She turned around, ready to apologize, only to find Rem holding out a voucher with a hopeful look on her face. Lily blinked in confusion, asking what on earth she was doing. Rem shyly pleaded with her not to leave the detective squad, even offering her stash of chaos drinks as a bribe. She was convinced that if Lily left, their squad would never have a chance to rise again. Lily couldn't help feeling a bit relieved. Turns out, Rem wasn't as fragile as she'd worried. Taking the voucher, Lily met her eyes. Rem then asked, "Does this mean you're staying?" But Lily shook her head, saying she had a lot on her plate and didn't have time for all Rem's detective games. However, she said Rem could trade the voucher for a tip from her, and if Rem didn't interrupt her work time, she might toss her a few ideas now and then. Rem listened intently as Lily advised her. If she really wanted to expand the squad, she shouldn't try to recruit witches like Lily or Soraya, who were always busy. Instead, she should focus on those who had more free time. Then, Lily reminded her, "Think about the last time we went to the school district to search for clues on that arson case. Who else was there?" she asked Rem. Rem thought of Amy but hesitated. Amy wasn't from Grey Castle, had her own group, and Rem feared rejection. But Lily pointed out that Amy was actually the perfect choice if Rem could recruit her. The rest of the Wolfheart witches would likely follow. Except for Annie, who's usually quite busy. Hero and Broken Sword didn't have much going on, and Rem could also consider asking the old Bloodfang witches to join her. Lily believed that, with a few friendly asks, they'd have no reason to turn her down, and Rem could grow the detective squad significantly. Lily added one last piece of advice, hoping Rem wouldn't cause trouble for His Majesty or randomly challenge Lightning's team again. She couldn't resist rubbing it in a little, saying she had a feeling Rem would never beat them anyway. Rem stuck her tongue out, accusing Lily of being biased, but Lily just waved her off, insisting she wasn't playing favorites. Then she told Rem to get some sleep and stop bothering her. As Lily turned away, she noticed Rem was still standing there. A hint of worry crept into Lily's voice as she softly asked if something was wrong. After a pause, Rem admitted that the voucher had actually been intended as Lily's recruitment fee, so now that she wasn't joining, could she, have it back? Lily froze, then burst out looking annoyed and said, "Not a chance," and shooed her away. The next day arrived quickly, and Neverwinter was bustling as usual. After a long day's work, the tavern was even more packed than normal. Someone asked curiously, "What exactly is a train?" Another patron shrugged, guessing it had to be something amazing if His Majesty had designed it, saying about how every invention of His Majesty's seemed to blow everyone's minds. Just then, a blond man entered the tavern, and the barkeep quickly greeted him, leading him to a reserved window seat on the 3rd floor. The man tipped generously and settled in, noticing how crowded the room was, with everyone leaning out the windows. Word had spread that the narrow street outside would soon be the train's route, though he couldn't figure out why it was set so far from the residential area. Another patron explained that the tracks weren't meant for people, so they kept them away from crowded places. The blond man grew curious and soon learned that the mines were lined with these metal tracks, powered by something called a steam engine. He'd heard of steam engines hauling carts and thought they worked well in rough terrain. But if it were on flat ground, couldn't mules or horses do the same job? So why was the city council calling this train a revolutionary transportation tool? Some patrons thought the train was just hype, but most had faith in His Majesty's word, knowing he never exaggerated. Just then, a loud whistle echoed from afar. Everyone craned their necks, leaning out the windows. They saw something massive, entirely made of steel, emerging from the tunnel at an impressive speed. The blond man's eyes widened in disbelief as thick gray smoke billowed around it. Next to the train, a four-wheeled horse-drawn carriage sped along, with two horses pushing themselves to the limit. But compared to the train, the carriage was clearly struggling. The horses were panting heavily after just a few strides. Meanwhile, the fully loaded train seemed unaffected by its weight. People speculated that the train could probably haul as much as a cargo ship. They counted the cars, reaching 6, then 7, all packed with stones and minerals. The blond man thought to himself that a steam engine fixed at a mine entrance to pull carts was one thing, but a steam engine that could move on its own was an entirely different beast. He thought about other kingdoms, where lords were still traveling the old-fashioned way over cobblestone or muddy roads by carriages. But this train, this was the future of transportation, unlocking a whole new realm of possibilities. Maybe the future has arrived, but it has not happened for everyone yet. 3 days later, Barav reported to Roland that settlement applications had spiked by 60% compared to the usual rate, with half coming from people who had moved in within the last 2 months. Barav explained that the average time it took newcomers to submit their applications had dropped from 5 months to just 3.5. Since the demon attacks, there had been a slight dip in applications, but not only there's no decline, in fact, the numbers were now soaring. Clearly, people weren't as concerned about the demon threat anymore. As for the train demonstration, it was a huge success. City Hall even received multiple requests from merchants, all eager to meet Roland, likely to discuss the train. Roland instructed Barav to decline the meetings. For now, the train wasn't a product for sale, and even if it were, the price would be far beyond what they could afford. Instead, he told Barav to offer them other goods, like the old first and second generation steam engines that had been replaced. Thinking about it, we all know trains were revolutionary, but they would certainly bring pollution. Maybe one day Roland could find a witch with the power to clean the air. Anyway, let's not lose track here. Back to the story, he decided it was a good time to push forward with army reserves. Barav agreed, though he was curious if Roland really thought things would escalate that far. Roland explained it was just a precaution. After all, this was a battle for humanity's survival, and they had to take it seriously. There was much to prepare, and troop numbers were crucial since they'd need a steady flow of reinforcements from the rear. Along with building the reserve army, Roland felt it was time to start recruiting a new round of soldiers. He wanted to see the combat units' numbers exceed 10,000 by the end of the month of demons and reminded Barav to ensure they had the resources to support this expansion. Barav readily agreed, then took his leave. Just then, Nightingale's voice whispered in Roland's ear, relaying news from Sylvie. There was activity on the demon side, the flying monsters seemed to be expanding their patrol range, and a possible new encampment was under construction. Roland's expression turned serious. He instructed Nightingale to bring Sylvie and the others back immediately, then called Barav back and instructed him to summon all department ministers to the castle for an urgent meeting. The castle's meeting hall quickly filled up. Sylvie began her briefing, detailing the new intel. The flying monsters had been spotted within what was previously considered a safe zone. Roland's face was serious as he asked for everyone's thoughts on the matter. Alethea scoffed, calling it the same old demon tactics. She claimed that when intimidation didn't work, demons turned to brute force, which was a tactic they'd used before against human lords. Roland reminded her that her last prediction had estimated it would take the demons 6 months to advance. Alethea looked a bit embarrassed, explaining that she'd based her estimate on the usual time needed to build a large encampment. Maybe they're just rushing things, she muttered, adding that battles were always unpredictable. Roland was unimpressed. Surveillance was necessary, but all their defense plans had been based on that 6-month timeline. If the enemy took that long to establish themselves, he figured he could extend the railway right to their front door. By then, he'd be ready to send armored trains and rail-mounted cannons to prevent the demons from setting up outposts. Agatha spoke up in support of Alethea, assuring everyone that she hadn't intentionally withheld information. She had agreed with Alethea's timeline, as the Federation's expansion schedule had always shown that 6 months was the demons' absolute limit. At least it was accurate until the fall of Takira. But now, the demons were pushing past this limit, rendering the timeline unreliable. After reviewing the intel, Edith remarked that it wasn't too surprising if intel from 4 centuries ago had finally become outdated. Alethea looked irritated but had no grounds to argue. Roland noted that Edith was likely the only one in the room, besides himself, willing to stand up to the Takira witches. Pasha urged Alethea to calm down, suggesting that the massive bone creatures might be accelerating the demons' expansion or that they had other motives. If their goal wasn't an immediate assault, setting up outposts ahead of time would make sense, especially as red mist supplies dictated their outpost scale. She added that they should avoid bickering and focus on the king's orders. Roland appreciated her response, noting that Pasha had not only diffused the tension but had also shown consideration for him as well. Standing up, Roland ordered the First Army to prepare for deployment, to which Axe promptly replied, "Yes, Your Majesty." Pasha expressed relief at Roland's decisive approach, noting that ignoring the enemy's movements would be suicidal with war on the horizon. Turning to Edith, Roland instructed her staff department to present at least one viable plan by sunset the following day, complete with detailed simulations. Ferlin then voiced his concern, noting that with the flying monsters occupying the region, the First Army's movement would likely be exposed. Roland acknowledged this but said they needed to see a plan before diving into specifics. The next day, Edith returned with the plan, looking visibly exhausted. Seeing the dark circles under her eyes, Roland asked if she stayed up all night. She yawned, admitting that with everyone racing against the clock, she can't be the only one resting. Telling Roland to just see it as her way to make up for her mistake from last time. Roland mused to himself that Edith was still holding a grudge from her last mistake. Either way, he reviewed the plan briefly before asking her to summarize it. Edith explained that if the army advanced with standard marching methods, they would almost certainly be noticed, and success would heavily depend on the commander. Without specific intel on enemy tactics, the staff department had prepared for the worst-case scenario. In the simulation, the First Army might reach its objective but could be overwhelmed by demons in the process. Out of 5,000 soldiers, only about half would likely make it back. However, the witches would be safer as long as they avoided reckless actions. They could all return. Roland found the scenario surprisingly harsh and asked if logistics were the issue. Edith nodded. In the simulation, the supply route was constantly attacked, forcing the First Army to divide its forces for protection. Preventing all ambushes was impossible, and the steady toll on their ranks would drain morale and weaken confidence at the front. After a week, enemy attacks would become increasingly erratic, with the main force finally launching an assault on the demon encampment. While they might succeed in destroying the demon outpost, their rearguard would come under fire. Roland asked if this rearguard referred to Neverwinter itself, but Edith clarified that it was literal fire, as she believed that if the demons detected unusual activity in the misty forest, they might resort to burning the entire forest. This would destroy the safe route created by Lady Leaf, and if their transportation routes had to triple in length, the First Army would lose their supply line. Without their firepower advantage, they'd be forced to retreat. She added that this was only a simulation and that, while they may have overestimated demon numbers, it was difficult to say for certain. As Roland reviewed the plan, he couldn't help but be baffled. Dealing with a large number of enemies was one thing, but who on earth had come up with the idea of setting the forest on fire? He looked up and asked aloud. In her usual calm manner, Edith replied that it was Ferlin's idea. Their analysis suggested that, given enough time, the demons might notice something unusual about the misty forest, so they couldn't rule out the possibility. Roland figured they hadn't spent all night coming up with just one plan. It was clear they were trying to make a point with this one. Edith chuckled and handed over a second proposal. She explained that since they couldn't guarantee the safety of the supply line, why not eliminate the need for it altogether? Roland's interest was piqued, and he urged her to continue. Edith laid it out. If the devouring worms from Takira could burrow tunnels through the impassable mountains, then the underground terrain should be manageable too. By deploying 2 devouring worm carriers to dig in tandem, they could carve out a tunnel wide enough for horse-drawn carts, and they can provide a secure route for transporting supplies. Roland nodded, prompting her to explain further. Edith sketched out the tunnel design, explaining they could camouflage the entrance with tents, dig vertical shafts that could be sealed off later, and leave vents for airflow along the route. This approach would delay their march by about 2 weeks, but since regular marching speed would be difficult under demon attacks anyway, this method would remove the First Army's biggest vulnerability, which is their lack of air power. By keeping the unit consolidated, they'd be sure to attract the demons' full attention. Roland asked if she came up with this idea, which Edith nodded, crediting it as a collaborative effort across multiple departments. Roland rubbed his chin, looking impressed. For most people, incorporating devouring worms into a logistics plan would be unthinkable, but Edith had used every available resource, even involving the newly established mathematics department. Roland praised her work and approved the plan. Edith placed a hand on her chest in salute, though she couldn't help adding that even with the second plan, their simulations still predicted casualties, as they couldn't rely on the pre-built trenches and bunkers from previous battles. Roland wondered if she was suggesting they wait for a better opportunity, but Edith shook her head, saying they must attack as soon as possible. If the Divine War was as brutal as the Takira witches described, a real battle was essential for the First Army. She hesitated before adding that Roland cared too deeply about his soldiers' lives. Against the unknown threat of demons, some things were beyond human control, and she wanted him to be prepared. Roland wasn't offended by her bluntness. After a thoughtful pause, he dismissed Edith, who saluted once more and left the room. Nightingale appeared, visibly displeased. She asked if it was wrong to care about his people's well-being, suggesting Edith had overstepped. Roland, however, shrugged it off, saying he saw no harm in differing perspectives. Still, he intended to do everything possible to minimize casualties. Just then, the communication seal lit up. Roland's expression turned serious, asking if the demons had made another move. Nightingale shook her head, saying it was good news. The third group of witches from Slumbering Isle was expected to arrive in Neverwinter by tomorrow evening, led by Lady Camilla. Roland relaxed and told Nightingale to inform Wendy to welcome them with the same hospitality as before. He suddenly remembered that Camilla was one of the witches who had traveled with Joan before. Noticing his thoughtful expression, Nightingale asked if something was on his mind. Roland nodded, realizing that the previous simulations had assumed the demons held the upper hand, but maybe he could find a way to chip away at their advantage. Nightingale didn't quite see the connection, but Roland simply smiled, admitting he wasn't entirely sure himself, but it was worth a shot. When Camilla arrived, he planned to discuss his idea with her personally. Meanwhile, on the Crimson Water River, Andrea stood on the ship, savoring a rare moment of calm. Suddenly, a curious voice behind her asked why people on shore weren't collecting the nearby debris as kindling. Surprised, she turned to find one of the Takira witches. She hadn't expected her to be interested in such matters. She assumed the Takira witches wouldn't bother with trivial things. The witch chuckled, admitting that in the Federation days, such tasks were left to mortals. However, she mentioned that back then, she herself was no different from those mortals. As a witch with weak powers, the Federation had little reason to invest in her. Toward the end of the war, she had been all but forgotten, surviving only thanks to those same mortals after the city fell. Andrea was surprised to hear this, having seen how skilled the witch was in combat. The witch smiled, saying that hundreds of years of training could transform anyone. Compared to some of her sisters, she admitted, she felt lucky to have become what she was. Not only had it made her stronger, but it also allowed her to contribute in ways she never could before. Meeting His Majesty Roland, she added, felt like a reward in itself. Curious, Andrea asked why she was sharing all this with her. The witch turned to her and said because she admired Andrea. She explained that Andrea's ability, even by Federation standards, would have made her one of the top combat witches. Since Andrea had achieved high awakening at such a young age, she would surely have risen through the ranks in Takira. The witch confessed that her own greatest wish had been to join the Holy Guard and receive Lady Natalia's blessing before heading into battle. Now, she could only envy Andrea, who still hadn't reached her limits. She told Andrea that she would face many challenges ahead but reminded her that plenty of people admired her strength. Hearing this, Andrea realized the witch was trying to comfort her. After everything that happened in the Kingdom of Dawn, it had affected Andrea more deeply than she'd let on, and clearly, the witch had noticed. Andrea smiled and thanked her. The witch simply replied that she was just speaking the truth before returning to the cabin. Just as she was leaving, Andrea called out the answer to her question about why no one was collecting the debris. It was because Neverwinter no longer relied on it for heating. The witch gave an okay gesture without looking back, signaling she understood. As the boat approached Neverwinter, Andrea's anticipation grew. Just then, she heard the distinct coo of a pigeon, and before she could react, a fat pigeon came barreling toward her, smacking right into her head. Blinking in disbelief, she realized it was none other than Maisie. Holding the bird in her hands, Andrea chuckled, commenting that Maisie seemed to have gotten heavier. She asked if Maisie had been slacking off again, but Maisie quickly shook her head, saying His Majesty Roland had sent her to fetch Andrea back. Transforming back to her larger form, Maisie invited Andrea to hop on, explaining that Camilla, Spear, and the others were already waiting. A short while later, Maisie flew her past the border walls, where Roland and a few others had gathered to meet her. Andrea soon realized that Roland had called her back to test a new weapon. Even without Maisie's help, she would have reached the docks within half a day, but Roland informed her there was no time to waste. The First Army would be setting out tomorrow. He recapped the recent demon developments, explaining that the weapon designed specifically for her needed to be in working condition before they reached the tunnel entrance. Andrea couldn't help but think the demons were getting restless, eager to make their move even though the Red Moon's descent was still some time away. Andrea slowly opened the case, revealing a weapon she'd never seen before. Roland started to say it was an anti-material rifle, then quickly corrected himself, calling it an anti-monster sniper rifle. Andrea raised an eyebrow, pointing out that it didn't have a scope, so hitting a target she couldn't see would be impossible. Roland then explained that Camilla, Spear, and Sylvie were there specifically to help. The plan was simple. Camilla would link Sylvie and Andrea together, and Spear would provide the magical power to keep the connection going. Spear, who'd been called in at the last minute, let out a sigh, saying she'd appreciate more notice next time instead of being flown in at top speed by Maisie. She told Roland she wasn't as young as she used to be. Roland couldn't help but roll his eyes as he recalled how Spear had drunk plenty of purified water from Lily and even asked for extra recruits from the next batch of City Hall trainees. Yet here she was, acting as if she were performing a thankless favor, such typical of an old politician. Andrea, meanwhile, wasn't certain if her abilities would still work with Sylvie's ability, which was exactly why Roland had called her to test it out. She glanced at the sniper rifle, and they began the trials. Meanwhile, across town, Carter was pacing nervously outside his room, trying to reassure himself, saying everything would be fine, and that it was just a baby being born. He tells himself that Manhwa and Miss Lily were both there so nothing could go wrong. Roland had even prepared a backup plan, ensuring both mother and child's safety. Still, the idea of a C-section made him uneasy. But if His Majesty said it would be okay, then surely it would be. Eileen approached, trying to comfort him, saying she was sure May would pull through, saying May was the strongest person Eileen had ever known. Carter nodded, thanking her, though his worry still lingered. Suddenly, loud cheers erupted from outside. He realized it was the day of the army's departure. Eileen smiled, gazing at the soldiers, mentioning that her own husband was among them. He had long looked forward to exacting revenge on the demons. Carter asked why she called it revenge, and Eileen explained that it was her husband's way of honoring those who had fallen to the demons. Fighting for their memory gave him strength. Carter couldn't help but admire how even former noble knights like Ferlin now fought on behalf of commoners. Perhaps His Majesty's dream of a utopian kingdom was gradually becoming a reality. As Roland's former personal knight and bodyguard, Carter would have been among the first to fight for His Majesty, yet somehow, he drifted further from that path. Just then, the sound of a baby's first cry snapped him back to the present. Carter hurried into the room, where Manhwa let out a relieved sigh and pointed to a tiny newborn lying beside May. Carter rushed over and was told it was a boy. He looked at May, exhausted and drenched in sweat, momentarily lost for words. Weakly, she managed to say, "You're a father now." Overwhelmed, Carter hugged them both tightly, tears slipping down his cheeks. Meanwhile, on the northwest outskirts of Neverwinter, deep within the misty forest, Snake Fong stepped out of his tent. He had been with the railway construction crew for a while now. Passing by the train, he noticed a peculiar movement from one of the cargo carts. Curious, he hid in the bushes to watch as the tarp covering it was removed, revealing two massive creatures wriggling inside, which shocked him. One of the creatures even spoke, saying it was hungry and asking if there was anything to eat. For a split second, Snake Fong's mind raced, imagining a possible response from one of the soldiers along the lines of, "Oh, sure, this whole camp of workers is your feast, help yourselves." But thankfully, none of that happened. Instead, each soldier carefully carried over a large wooden barrel filled with food and handed it to the creatures, who devoured it ravenously before disappearing back into the forest. He held his breath, ensuring they had actually left before stepping out. Reflecting on recent days, Snake Fong recalled the strange sights he'd witnessed, those two massive creatures, the enormous wolves that, oddly, Lady Leaf wasn't attacking, and a mysterious man who came to prey on certain days. It felt like he was glimpsing a hidden side of Neverwinter, a side that both thrilled him and made him feel more connected to the city. This, he thought, was what life was truly about. Back at the castle, Nightingale received word through the communications seal that the first army camps had completed the first phase of the plan. Roland marked their positions on the map and then asked if the demons had responded. Nightingale replied that, according to Sylvie, there was no reaction yet as the demons seemed focused on constructing their outposts. Several black stone pillars had been erected, and a red line now appeared behind their watchtowers. The staff department estimated that the number of those long-legged creatures was likely limited too. For Roland, this was good news. He instructed them to continue surveillance and report any updates immediately. Looking at the map, Roland estimated that, barring any surprises, the First Army would enter the demons' reconnaissance zone in about 6 days. Nightingale noticed he still seemed concerned, so she reminded him that the new weapons test had gone well. Roland explained that it was just a test and that anything could happen in actual combat. Nightingale reassured him that a weapon capable of hitting a target 5 kilometers away was already extraordinary, and she had faith Andrea wouldn't let the weapon go to waste. Roland hoped so too, then mentioned he was going to take a nap and asked not to be disturbed unless it was an emergency. Understanding what he meant, Nightingale asked if he wanted the Takira witches to join him. Roland shook his head and said it wasn't necessary. Nightingale slipped into the mist, promising that no one would get close to his light pillar. Shortly after, Roland fell asleep and slipped once again into the dream world. Checking the calendar, he recalled that today was the day Garcia would return from headquarters. She'd promised to bring him a book that mentioned the Divine War. Picking up the phone, he dialed Garcia's number, and she picked up quickly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. She teased, asking if he would throw his phone in frustration if she hadn't brought the book, reminding him that he'd already nudged her about it 3 days prior and that she wasn't like him as she kept her promises. Ignoring her sarcasm, Roland asked if she had the book. When she replied it was at her place, he headed over. When Garcia opened the door, she looked freshly showered, dressed in a red and white martial fighter outfit. She poured him a glass of water, and Roland asked if she had a match later. Garcia explained she was dressed like that to leverage her influence as a martial fighter for something later. Roland assumed it was for an ad, but she was actually going to protest. She scoffed, asking if he didn't read the newspaper. It turned out that the corporation was scheduled to demolish the wall surrounding their street today. Roland had nearly forgotten about it and scratched his head, wishing her smooth sailing. Garcia bristled, but before she could snap, Roland explained that he was just a nobody and his lack of fame wouldn't help the cause much. Garcia then took out a list with the names of residents from her building who were willing to protest with her. She insisted that if people stayed quiet just because they weren't well known, their voices would be ignored entirely. Looking at Garcia's determined expression, Roland felt a pang of reluctance to treat her as merely an illusion of his dream world. Even though he knew she was technically a figment, seeing her like this made it hard to dismiss her as a mere shadow. Since she'd brought the book as promised, he decided he'd join her for the protest. Scanning the list, Roland's eyes landed on a familiar name and he saw the demon who lived on the 5th floor. This was intriguing. If the demon was attending the protest, it could give Roland a chance to glimpse fragments of its memory. He quickly came up with an excuse, mentioning he had another appointment that afternoon. He avoided Garcia's gaze, and she didn't press him, simply turning away as if she'd expected he wouldn't join the protest. Heading into her room, Garcia retrieved a book and handed it to him. Roland noticed that the book had no author listed. Garcia explained that the writer had reportedly died before completing it, and the association could find no records of him whatsoever. Roland found this odd. By that time, record-keeping was widespread, and as a martial fighter, the author should have left at least some trace behind. Nevertheless, he thanked Garcia, and she merely scoffed in response. Back home, Roland settled in and opened the book to its first page. The opening line immediately got his attention. He read it carefully and it wrote, "We have been deceived by the gods." Roland flipped open the second page of the book and was greeted by a strange illustration of people kneeling on the ground, worshipping something shaped like an egg. Right after that, there was a text read that while natural power is known to come from erosion, most humans still treat it as a gift from the gods, all because it grants extraordinary abilities. The book then asked a question: why is it only humans who wield this power? Could it be that humans are just lucky on the evolutionary ladder? To search for the answer, the author explored ancient ruins and made a shocking discovery, which is that humans aren't the only species capable of using natural power, and revealed that Earth isn't the center of the universe either, and perhaps humanity isn't as special as they think, and there's other species also capable of using such powers. But here's the problem: if those species are long gone, why does erosion and awakening still happen? Could it mean the so-called divine war never truly ended? And what kind of world are they really living in? However, the text abruptly stopped there and Roland slammed the book shut, feeling an unsettling vibe in the air. Everything the book talked about was inside the dream world, yet everything in it felt eerily familiar to him. He suddenly wanted to call Garcia, hoping she could shed some light. As he reached for his phone, he accidentally knocked over the book, where a red slip of paper slid out. On it, 2 lines were written: "The day the divine will appears, our meeting shall take place. Rose Cafe, room 302. Roland stared at the note for a moment before finally dialing Garcia's number. She sounded annoyed, saying she was about to head out. Roland explained how the book's contents were downright creepy, but Garcia brushed it off, claiming it was all just fiction. She added that the Martial Fighter Association had already investigated the volcano ruins mentioned in the book and found that the place was buried under lava over 200 years ago. Roland thought for a moment, then asked if Garcia had read the book herself. She admitted to flipping through a few pages but didn't seem interested. Roland wanted to bring up the red note but changed his mind. Hearing that he had nothing else to say, she then rushed to end the call. With a sigh, Roland hung up, realizing if Garcia had seen the note, she wouldn't have ignored it. So this could only mean one thing, which is that the note had been placed there recently, but how? Chills ran down his spine as a thought crept up, because the dream world was basically just an illusion he created. So, someone, or perhaps something, had noticed Roland's difference. As for the cafe and everything else, he decided to let the Takira witches investigate further. For now, he packed his bag and headed to the demon's apartment. Using a key, he opened the door and headed straight to the storage room, where he found a large iron gate with chains locking it. Without hesitation, Roland cut the chains and swung the door open. What he saw took his breath away. There it was. He saw a massive, bottomless chasm, with strange spire-like structures rising from the depths. And clearly, this has to be the city of the demons. As he stood there surveillancing the place, he suddenly heard footsteps. And around the corner, a squad of demons marched into view. The demons were fully armed, weapons in hand, and their sudden appearance caught Roland completely off guard. His first instinct was to tense up, because there was no way he could avoid them. But as he braced himself to fight, something unexpected happened. The group of demons walked right past him as if he wasn't even there. Stunned, Roland froze for a moment before turning around. On impulse, he reached out toward one of the demons, trying to touch it, only to find his hand passed right through, almost like touching a hologram. Confused but curious, he crouched down and pressed his hand to the damp ground. However, the sensation was real this time. It seemed the resistance of the people who were once devoured by Zero could not only shape the fragments of memory within this world but also affect what was displayed. This got him wondering, just how strong is Zero's resistance, or maybe her hatred and unwillingness to submit after losing to him. Either way, Roland quickly walked to the edge of the cliff. Below, he saw a swirling red mist, and along the cliff's edge were sloping paths and stone stairways leading downward. The place was bustling with demons, some of which he had never seen before. Their appearance reminded him of what Pasha had once mentioned, which is that the Federation had once captured some demons in the past that were weak and lacked magic. Back in the day, no one was sure whether they were a subspecies of demons or simply enslaved creatures serving the demons. Looking around, Roland noticed there wasn't any demon watching them. They also seemed to fit in with the other demons, which suggested they were not slaves but rather a type of demon as well. But here's the question, were these demons from the same origins as the others, and if they have genders? Or was their method of reproduction so different from humans that it couldn't be compared? For now, there were no answers. Eventually, Roland made his way to the bottom of the cliff. At the center of the area was a large bridge. A crowd of demons had already gathered, growling and snarling in low tones. It dawned on Roland that he was witnessing some kind of ceremony. As a horn sounded, a demon stepped forward, accompanied by a strange, weird-looking creature. They walked to the center of the bridge, where the crowd seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Roland had no idea what was about to happen, wondering if it was perhaps a duel. Then, a figure appeared at the center. To Roland's shock, it was a female demon, or at least, that's what it looked like, but he quickly dismissed the idea. While the figure had features that closely resembled a human girl, but the resemblance made no sense to Roland because how could a species so vastly different from humanity produce something so similar? The two demons bowed to her before stepping to the edges of the platform. The female demon began to chant. Almost immediately, the red mist below started to churn and boil. Moments later, two massive tentacles shot out of the mist, each one going towards one of the demons. The tentacles twitched for a few moments before revealing a gem. The demons then tore open their chest, allowing the gems to fuse into their body, followed by a blinding light. Roland recognized these must be magic stones. Could this be how the demons create their warriors, granting them power through these rituals? But something felt off. These demons were the lowest-tier soldiers. There are often tens of thousands of them in any major battles. If every single transformation required such an elaborate ritual, wouldn't this city be doing nothing but ceremonies all day? Minutes passed, and the blinding light slowly faded. So Roland stepped forward towards the center of the platform. Meanwhile, the massive creature after fusing the gem looked terrible. The scene reminded him of the God Punishment Army's transformation ritual. In contrast, the demon was still standing, and he could sense powerful energy from it. Thinking to himself, he wondered if perhaps demons have to gamble with their lives to become warriors and be able to use magic. However, the next second, the creature let out an ear-splitting shriek. Without warning, it charged at the female demon with incredible speed and slammed hard onto the ground. When the dust settled, there was a deep crater, but the female demon was already gone. All of a sudden, the creature then turned its attention to the other demon. By now, Roland had a clearer picture of what was happening. So, failing to fuse with the magic stone doesn't kill them, it just makes them completely out of control. The demon reacted quickly and leaped into the air, grabbed the creature's tail, and with one powerful yank, it tore the creature's tail right off. Right after, the demon then extracted the bone from the severed tail and drove it straight into the creature's head. After killing it, the demon ripped the magic stone from the creature's body and swallowed it. Moments later, a surge of purple energy burst from the demon, swirling around it like a storm. Roland's eyes narrowed as he observed the transformation carefully. However, he noticed the demon's arm didn't wither as it was supposed to. As he kept watching, the demon's body began transforming. It started with its body shrinking, then the skin began peeling away. When the transformation was complete, Roland felt a chill run down his spine. The demon's face now resembles that of a human. Cheers erupted from the crowd of demons, who began chanting the word Sharita over and over again. Roland had no idea what it meant, but he couldn't help but recall what Pasha had once said before the First Divine War, or perhaps even earlier. Back then, demons were more like beasts. However, it was said that a human came in contact with them and taught them knowledge, and that influence eventually led high-ranking demons to evolve into humanoid forms. It was all so surreal, too much to take in. Deciding he'd seen enough, Roland exited the dream world. When he woke up, he found himself gasping for air, and his body was already drenched in sweat. Nightingale rushed to his side and asked him what was wrong and if something had happened over there. Roland exhaled deeply, trying to steady himself, and assured her there was no issue, explaining he had simply made some new discoveries. Nightingale frowned and told him he didn't look fine, brushing her fingers across his face as she pointed out that he was drenched in sweat, even his clothes. Roland let out a light chuckle, trying to ease her worry, and reminded her that she could tell he wasn't lying, insisting it was just an illusion after all. She turned away, crossing her arms, and replied that she wouldn't know. Roland blinked in surprise and asked what she meant. She sighed and explained that she can only detect lies only when she uses her ability. She reasoned that, in the future, Roland would likely hold more secrets, and it simply wouldn't feel right if she knew everything. Then, it'd be uncomfortable for both of them. Her face turned red slightly as she added that she knew he probably wouldn't like someone constantly seeing through him anyway. Roland was surprised to see her like this and let out a soft chuckle. His earlier discomfort had completely disappeared, replaced by a sense of ease. Watching Roland laughing at her, she crossed her arms tightly, and with a huff, she complained, thinking how she was so worried something might have gone wrong for him. Roland restrained his laughter, then turned more serious as he remarked, "It's true that no one likes having everything seen through by others, especially those in power." He deliberately paused for a moment, then turned to Nightingale and continued, "But you're not just anyone, are you?" Hearing this, Nightingale froze, her face turning as red as a ripe tomato. Telling her to sit beside him, he calmly explained that if she hadn't come to Border Town, he would likely have already fallen victim to the head maid sent by Garcia. He reasoned that with the divine war on the horizon, the dangers ahead would only increase, not to mention they hadn't completely unified the kingdom yet. He tells her she'd have plenty to deal with in the future. Simply put, Nightingale was never an outsider. To Roland, the worst kind of lie wasn't deceiving others but lying to oneself. With Nightingale by his side, he didn't have to worry about that. Nightingale tilted her head and muttered that her ability couldn't stop Roland from deceiving himself. Roland disagreed, reasoning that her power could sense when someone wasn't speaking sincerely, whether it was slight hesitation or a partial lie. Nightingale nodded and added that the feedback from magic made the distinctions clear. Roland smiled, saying that was exactly why she could help. If he ever feigned confidence while uncertain, she could step in and save him from making a grave mistake. He then asked her if she now realized how important she was to him. Blushing slightly, Nightingale fell silent before saying if he really meant it then she'd like to ask something again. Roland gestured for her to go ahead. Using her ability this time, she wanted to know if everything was truly okay. Roland was slightly surprised. After all this, she was still most concerned about his safety. Smiling, he reassured her that there was no problem this time. Hearing that, Nightingale relaxed, letting out a sigh of relief, before asking what new discovery he had just mentioned. Walking over to his desk, Roland explained that he had seen the memories of the demons, and he was about to share with everyone what he saw. As the scene shifts to the meeting room, he recounts the events and then invites the others to share their thoughts. Pasha spoke first, saying the information was incredibly significant, because no one had ever entered a demon city and lived to tell the tale, making Roland the first even if it was in a dream world. From Roland's account, they learned that demons gained power by merging magic stones, which cleared up many previous mysteries. If even the weakest demons could undergo such transformations, they could also assume that high-ranking demons likely ascended through a similar process. By successfully merging enough magic stones, they can evolve and gain more power. It also explained why high-ranking demons exhibited such a wide variety of abilities. Tilly then raised a question. She asked if was there a limit to their evolution. Celine thought for a moment and suggested that there might not be a limit. Wendy frowned and asked if that meant the demons could surpass even transcendent witches. Celine clarified that it wasn't a direct comparison. Instead, she reminded everyone of the prophecy left behind by the underground civilization, how they mentioned that the path of magic is the path to godhood. One day, they shall be no different from the gods. In other words, as long as they become more proficient and their understanding of magic continues to grow, so will their power. Because of that, maybe there is no limit. However, she added, such growth was far from easy to achieve, whether for witches or demons. Celine believed that the situation worked in their favor. Since high-ranking demons weren't born through bloodlines, their growth wasn't guaranteed. If it had been, 400 years of time would have resulted in a terrifying number of powerful demons. But now they knew the demons relied heavily on chances. Although there's still not enough evidence, she reasoned that the likelihood of success couldn't be high, otherwise, the demons wouldn't have reacted so strongly in the dream world as Roland described. Roland couldn't help but admire how much insight Celine could give from such limited info. At this point, what made Pasha more concerned was that perhaps the divine war might not be as straightforward as they expected. Roland shared the same thought but noted that dwelling on it wouldn't change anything. All they could do was fight until the end. Pasha paused, seemingly surprised by his unwavering resolve, before commenting that his determination was admirable. 6 days later, the First Army's vanguard had entered the demon's surveillance zone. Sylvie spotted a group of beasts flying toward them in the distance. Nightingale, receiving the report, informed Roland, who nodded and told them to proceed with the plan. Meanwhile, Maggie prepared her ark, gathering the witches inside. Sylvie noted that the demons were still 30 kilometers away from being within range, prompting Maggie to ascend. Maggie then gave the group a 5-second countdown to brace for impact. Lightning cheerfully praised her commanding tone and said she was improving quickly, which flustered Maggie as she muttered her thanks. Andrea, however, couldn't help but shake her head. Turned out, there was barely any turbulence at all. She even thought to herself that Ash's shouting would have been more jarring. Either way, Lightning was the first to leap out, enthusiastically announcing that the runway was clear, the green light was on, and Lightning was taking off. Maisie followed closely behind, yelling out her own catchphrase too. Amy had no idea what she meant by the runway and green light but thought everyone's catchphrases were so cool and made up one for herself too. Andrea sighed at the lively mood, thinking, this is supposed to be a perilous battle, so why does it feel so carefree? Iffy patted Andrea on the shoulder, telling her to get used to it, and pointed at Spear, saying Lady Spear is the only composed person here. Meanwhile, Spear, holding her head, admitted she was actually experiencing seasick. Andrea chuckled, then quickly assembled her anti-beast sniper rifle and reminded everyone to prepare, the demons were closing in. After she loaded the first bullet, Camilla activated her ability and extended her hand. Andrea gripped it, followed by Sylvie. Suddenly Andrea gained her ability and could now clearly see 3 beasts in the distance. On the other side, Lightning reported that they had reached the designated location and asked if everyone was ready. Andrea raised her rifle, aiming at one of the beasts. Her thoughts then drifted back to a conversation she had with Roland earlier. She had asked him why her targeting path seemed like a zigzag. Roland explained that she isn't actually aiming while using her ability. He reasoned aiming couldn't predict things that had already happened but hadn't yet arrived. He compared her ability to flipping a coin, and Andrea, however, could somehow pre-select the coin that would land upright without seeing the outcome. Roland handed her a book on probability theory, saying that once she understood it, she would know how to make better use of her ability. Over the past few days, Andrea had studied it diligently, all preparing for this very moment. In case you are not sure what's going on here, in simpler terms, her ability is basically a complicated version of aimbot using probability where all possible outcomes have been automatically calculated for her. Anyway, let's get back to the story. The next second, Andrea pulled the trigger. The powerful recoil slammed against her chest like a hammer. The others anxiously asked if she was okay and whether she had hit the target. Andrea calmly replied just let the bullet fly for a bit, but she was certain it had already found its mark. Although she couldn't see the bullet, she knew the projectile was currently below the demon's flying height, but a strong upward draft would carry it higher, like a bird soaring in the wind. Moments later, the bullet found its mark, splitting its body cleanly in two. With a smile, she whispered, "Your Majesty, I did it." Picking up her sniper rifle again, she prepared to take down a few more. She always aimed for the demons at the back of the group. Some had their torsos pierced, others were headshots, and a few were torn apart. Eventually, the demons seemed to realize something was wrong, but by the time they tried to retreat, it was already too late. A few more shots finished them off. As sunset approached, the Ark landed in a rocky cave, marking the end of their mission for the day. They cleaned out the area and built a campsite. Opening a supply crate, Amy was surprised to find dried mushrooms inside. Maisie proudly declared that she had gathered them herself. She pointed to another box and added that she had even brought all types of spices for roasting. Before long, everyone was gathered around, enjoying their dinner. Amy remarked that back in the wild, her meals consisted of nothing but flatbread and dried meat, but this is so much better. After dinner, Ashes encouraged everyone to get some rest, saying she and Phyllis would take the night watch. The girls cheered and quickly settled in for the night. As the others dozed off, Ashes turned to Phyllis, offering to take the first half of the watch. She explained that Tilly had told her even in their God's punishment warrior body, the lack of proper rest could have severe consequences for them. Phyllis smiled and added that in extreme cases, they might completely lose control of the body. However, she reassured Ashes that it was still early and that she could rest a little later. Ashes nodded, then turned towards the girls. Lightning lay on the grass with Maisie curled up on her stomach. Phyllis, watching them, commented on how close they were, reflecting that back in the era of Takira, it would have been rare to find such genuine companionship. Ashes chuckled and said that Maisie hadn't always been like this. Before they found her, Maisie had lived alone for years, almost losing her ability to speak. She'd viewed herself more as a pigeon than a person, and she would flinch at every sound. It took countless shared experiences for them to become so close. Phyllis grew quiet for a moment, then said she wasn't sure if she would ever witness such a close bond again in the future. All she can hope is after this divine war there might finally be some meaningful changes. Ashes couldn't understand what she meant by that. She reasoned that a common enemy should bring everyone closer together. Phyllis, however, sighed and asked if Ashes hadn't noticed how magic affected more than just their abilities. She then told her that it could also influence their emotions and even their personalities. Surprised, Ashes asked what she meant. Phyllis picked up a stick and began drawing on the sand as she explained. If someone deeply desires to use magic for a particular purpose, the magic itself may guide them toward that goal, but sometimes there's a cost. For example, it might lead them to become something less than a human. Ashes suddenly fell silent, her thoughts drifting to years ago. Back then, she only had one goal in mind, which was to kill members of the church, stopping at nothing to hunt them down. That was when she was at her strongest. That murderous intent seemed to grant her boundless power. But beyond that, she had nothing else. If not for meeting Tilly by chance, she might have completely lost herself, becoming no different from a wild animal. Phyllis broke the silence, asking Ashes why she had decided to fight against the demons. Ashes suddenly thought of Tilly. She replied that she simply wanted to protect Tilly and help achieve her goal. Since Tilly wanted to drive the demons from the continent, so she would fight on her behalf. Phyllis remarked that Ashes was living for someone else's dream, but did she truly understand what Tilly wanted? Ashes instinctively wanted to argue but then hesitated. She remembered that Tilly had said many times that she didn't want her on the front lines. It was Ashes herself who had decided to join Roland's forces in hopes of elevating Tilly's position in Neverwinter. Phyllis didn't press further. She smiled and expressed hope that Ashes could find her own purpose. She reminded Ashes that, as an extraordinary witch, her potential was unimaginable. Only with a clear goal and unwavering resolve during battle could she have the chance to become transcendent. So, Phyllis would hate to see Ashes falling to the demons. Although she hadn't witnessed a transcendent witch in over 400 years, she sincerely hoped Ashes could be the one to achieve it again. As Phyllis walked away, Ashes replayed her words in her mind. She stood up slowly, gazing at the moonlit sky. For the first time, it felt like she might have found something. Meanwhile, back with Roland, the operation had been underway for 22 days. He marked new waypoints on the map, noting how the patrolling demons had increased in number and extended their range beyond the First Army's planned route. Despite this, everything remained under control. Nightingale mentioned that there are only 3 more days left. Roland nodded, checking the map. He knew that in 3 days, the First Army would reach the designated attack position, a strategically advantageous spot that was easy to defend and ideal for setting up bunkers and fortifications. What worried him was the sniper squad. The demons could potentially deduce their location by tracking the positions of their fallen demons. For the team to complete their mission without exposing themselves, they would need to exercise sharp judgment and know exactly when to pull back. Nightingale picked up a piece of dried fish, casually remarking that they should trust the team. She reasoned that the Takira witches are good at calculating risks. Also, with Maggie's magic arc at their disposal, they had a reliable escape option. Roland agreed with her, noting that there were more important things to focus on than needless worry. Looking out the window, he decided that the good weather made it a perfect day to test the glider Model 1. Excited, Nightingale insisted on joining. Before long, the group headed east to the testing grounds. Everyone was brimming with excitement, though some couldn't help but comment on the glider's unusual appearance. It resembled a bird but seemed frail compared to the bulky steam engines they were used to. Roland chuckled and turned to Margaret for her opinion. Margaret admitted that if Roland hadn't personally invited her, she might have thought someone was probably using his name to scam people. She then revealed that 2 years ago someone had also attempted a similar invention. Curious, Wendy asked what happened next. Margaret explained that the inventor had strapped wooden wings to himself and jumped from a tower, but the wings quickly flipped, and he tragically fell to his death. Wendy was shocked, but Roland reassured her that she had nothing to worry about. This is why the prototype included 2 seats for safety purposes. Soon, Wendy and Tilly climbed onto the glider, though Wendy seemed nervous. As she reviewed the procedures in her mind, Tilly gently reminded her of the first steps, urging her not to worry and assuring her that she would step in if anything went wrong. Wendy relaxed, taking a deep breath as she ran through the pre-flight checklist. Elevators, check. Rudder, check. Ailerons, check. Everything appeared normal, so she signaled her readiness to take off. Sitting in the pilot's seat, Wendy instructed the soldiers to release the clamps. With a faint jolt, the glider rolled onto the track. As the wheels gained speed, Wendy's heart raced and she suddenly forgot the next step. Tilly quickly tells her to give it the wind. Realizing the glider's current speed wasn't enough to lift their combined weight, Wendy quickly used her ability. An invisible current of air formed beneath the wings, gently lifting the glider off the ground. In the next moment, the glider soared into the sky. A slight upward tilt confirmed that they were actually flying. Surrounded by seabirds, she finally understood what Roland had meant when he said this was the type of freedom that they couldn't get from the hot air balloon. But her exhilaration didn't last long. The glider stopped ascending, and Wendy instinctively pulled the control stick several times, trying to correct it. But this also caused the glider to start wobbling. Tilly quickly warned her that she had overcorrected, but before Wendy could process what went wrong, the glider began dipping downwards. Everyone saw the glider's sudden fall and Roland was startled. Moments later, the glider crashed, but thankfully, no one was hurt. Wendy, however, looked disheartened, apologizing as she thought she had ruined something Roland had worked so hard to create. Roland reassured her that as long as they were safe, the rest didn't matter. Relieved, Wendy promised to give it another try. The second test quickly began but failed just as quickly. Roland realized that flying this thing was indeed proving to be much harder than anticipated. When Wendy and Tilly returned, Tilly explained that this time they had encountered a persistent wind, and their speed had been insufficient to counter it. Wendy blamed herself, admitting that in her panic, she had lost control of her magic. If she had stayed calm and focused on the controls, they might not have crashed. Roland began to understand the issue. Witches needed intense concentration when using their abilities. In chaotic situations, maintaining composure and focus seemed to be a challenge. All of a sudden, Tilly volunteered to give it a shot, saying that she had attended the theory lessons and believed she had a pretty good chance. Roland agreed, somewhat amused, thinking to himself that there was only one prototype left. He thought that it might as well be treated as a toy. If it crashed, it wouldn't be a big deal. However, Roland quickly realized he had underestimated Tilly. Unlike Wendy, Tilly relied less on magical assistance and instead used the glider's control surfaces to maneuver. Her movements were smooth and precise. It was astonishing because only after watching Wendy's attempts for less than 30 minutes, Tilly had already figured out how to fly. She appeared completely at ease, even extending her hand to let a passing seabird perch on her arms. Roland remembered that Tilly was an extraordinary witch who had her brain enhanced, granting her insane coordination and reflexes. It's a shame that he can't just build some Gundam. Just imagine how easy will it be to fight the demons. Anyway, an hour later, the glider landed gracefully on the grass, and cheers began erupting from the group. That evening, Anna heard about the successful flight and Roland's decision to have Tilly draft the flight manual. She commented that Wendy might feel disheartened by the decision. Roland adjusted his position to lean back more comfortably, mentioning that Nightingale had already dipped into her next month's ration of chaos drinks and ice cream sandwiches to console Wendy. He doubted she'd stay upset for long. It had been a while since Roland and Anna had spent time together like this. Lately, Anna had been busy welding railway tracks, crafting critical components, and working on the glider's construction. Roland couldn't help but express his concern, thinking she was working too hard. Anna smiled gently, stroking his cheek, and told him that as long as she could help him achieve his dreams, she was happy. Roland gazed at her for a long moment, causing Anna to blush, and asked him how long he planned to look. Without saying a word, Roland leaned in, letting his actions speak for him. Well, I'm sure none of you care about the details, so let's just fast forward. 3 rounds later, Roland held Anna tightly. She teased him, saying that if she had known he would be like this, she would have made her move much earlier. Roland laughed and asked what she had initially thought of him. Anna admitted that at first, she assumed that no matter how kind he seemed, he was still royalty and fundamentally different from her and everyone else. Roland playfully says that must have been a letdown since he was just an ordinary person. Anna chuckled, replying that it was better that way because she, too, was just an ordinary person. By now, the First Army had already set up in their designated artillery positions. Axe had initially expected to advance past enemy corpses, but for the past 6 days, not even a single demon had appeared. Since things seemed a little strange, Axe decided to call a meeting with the officers and the staff department. During the meeting, Axe asked everyone for their thoughts. Agatha thought it was definitely unusual since the only thing that could restrict the demons' movements was the red mist. But Sylvie confirmed the enemy's supply line is perfectly fine, so that shouldn't be the reason. Ferlin suggested 2 possibilities: either there was trouble on the demons' end, or they were reluctant to risk using their scouts. Axe then asked if anyone had heard anything about the movements near the Takira ruins, which he was told that the area was too far away. The sniper team had already abandoned the idea of luring the enemy and was on its way back. Suddenly, Edith spoke up. She believed they didn't need to waste time guessing the demons' plans. Since there were no obstacles on the ground or underground, they could just bring out the fortress cannons and flatten the demons' outposts. Axe agreed with her plan. They just had to wait for everyone to regroup, and the official assault was set for the next evening. The next day, Ferlin climbed to the top of a hill to survey the bustling but orderly preparations. Soldiers were calibrating the cannons and polishing their weapons. It reminded him of his first day on the battlefield many years ago. Behind him, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts, asking if he'd figured out the answer to that particular question on his mind. Ferlin chuckled and said that with these weapons and soldiers, hardly anyone on the continent could challenge King Roland now. But what made him feel a little disappointed was the king's order forbidding nobles from joining the combat units. Ferlin admitted he'd rather fight shoulder to shoulder with the troops than sit in the back all day. His father, Sir Eltek, shook his head and told him the age of personal valor and knighthood was long over. He believed the staff department was where Ferlin truly belonged. By then, the sun was almost setting, and the battle was about to begin. The two decided to head back to the camp. When night fell, Vaynor checked his watch at the artillery position and gave the order to fire. A deafening boom followed as a shell was launched from the fortress cannon. In the distance, explosions lit up the dark horizon. The soldiers couldn't see the targets clearly, so they just kept repeating the same steps. Sylvie stepped in, telling the soldiers to adjust the cannon's angle by 5 degrees and fire every 2 minutes. Several more explosions later, the demons' outposts were hit dead on. They all knew that the beasts wouldn't come out at night, which meant the demons were sitting ducks. As buildings crumbled one by one, Sylvie knew it was only a matter of time before the entire outpost was leveled to the ground. As the sun slowly rose, Vaynor ordered everyone to cease fire. We see a bead of cold sweat slide down Sylvie's cheek and something felt off. They'd been bombing the place all night, yet she hadn't spotted a single demon. Could it be that the demons had abandoned this place long ago? But just as that thought crossed her mind, everything changed. The ground began to shake, and through the lingering smoke, figures started to appear. Sylvie's eyes widened in shock and she spotted demons, and there were thousands of them. Seems like shit is going down. In the central command tent, the mood was heavy. Axe slammed the table in frustration. There hadn't been any signs, no red mist, no warnings, so where had all these demons come from? Agatha said it was impossible since the red mist was vital for the demons' survival. Without supply lines, they couldn't even make the journey, let alone fight. Axe pointed out that this outpost could only support about 1,000 demons at most. Could there be another supply point nearby? Agatha nodded. It seemed like the only explanation. But Edith interrupted with a different theory. This made Agatha suddenly think of something. What if the demons had dug a tunnel from the Takira ruins? But she quickly dismissed the idea, and she reasoned such large-scale digging would have surely been noticed by Sylvie. Edith pressed on, asking, what if the tunnel started right under the outpost itself? She pointed at the map, explaining that logically, to destroy the outpost, their forces had to get closer, which left their rear vulnerable. Now, with the demons suddenly showing up, it looked like they'd walked right into a trap. The demons had deliberately avoided ambushing them midway, shrinking their scouting range just to set up this moment. Their goal was obviously to trap and eliminate all of the combat witches who had left the city. Sir Eltek asked the big question, how did the demons manage to avoid Lady Sylvie's detection? Edith explained that Sylvie had been too focused on their scouts and the flying beasts. She could only observe at the edge of her range and might have overlooked a large area underground. Edith didn't mean blaming Sylvie. Instead, she admitted that they'd become too reliant on her. Every witch's ability had limits, and for Sylvie, scanning the entire plane was just too much. Using the communication seal, Agatha asked Sylvie if she could check for the demon army beneath the ground. Sylvie hesitated, worried it would consume too much of her magic, but Agatha encouraged her to go all out as this was no time to hold back. As Sylvie activated her ability, she frowned. She reported that something was blocking her sight. Hearing this, the entire room fell silent. This unexpected result seemed to confirm Edith's theory. Axe was the first to break the silence, telling everyone not to lose hope. Who ends up as prey, he said, will depend on how we fight this battle. Edith smiled and agreed, saying that the artillery barrage last night had prevented the demons from launching a sneak attack. Now, not only had the demons lost their element of surprise, but they also faced a fully prepared army. No matter how you looked at it, this was shaping up to be a promising start. Axe nodded, stood up, and told everyone, no matter what the demons are planning, all they have to do is to take them all down. Not long after, the demons launched their attack, and the first army immediately began their counteroffensive. Agatha and Zoe stood, ready to head out. But before they left, Axe called out to them. He admitted this might not be his place to say, but he was sure it was what His Majesty would have wanted, so he reminded Agatha and the others to protect themselves. The two smiled, reassuring him that they'd be fine. At the front line, the First Army soldiers were already armed with high-caliber rifles and heavy machine guns. As soon as the demons entered range, several of them were hit. Zoe muttered that these creatures disgusted her, and if any of them hit the ground, she'd rip them apart herself. Agatha, curious, wondered why the demons weren't throwing their spears yet. Up above, the demons flew over their positions, ignoring the soldiers entirely and charging toward the rear where the artillery team was stationed. Realizing what was happening, Agatha and Zoe bolted toward the back. At the heavy machine gun crew, a young spotter nervously asked his squad leader why they weren't firing yet. The demons were already within 900 meters. The squad leader told him to hold off until they closed to 300 meters. He understood that heavy machine guns had a range of over 1500 meters, but it was difficult to hit flying targets accurately in real combat. If they wasted a whole box of ammo without landing any hits, it'd crush the morale of the new recruits. Soon, the demons were clearly visible, and the squad leader shouted the order to open fire. Everyone pulled their triggers, and the bullets tore through the leading demons, dropping them instantly. Cheers erupted among the soldiers and they thought they were in the clear. But just then, the squad leader looked up, his expression darkened. Just then, the sky dimmed, and countless spears rained down from above. He screamed at everyone to take cover, but the spears weren't aimed at them. One soldier glanced back just in time to hear a series of explosions. The artillery positions were in shambles. Flames burned, soldiers lay motionless, some dead, some injured, and many cannons were destroyed. The soldiers trembled, but the squad leader gritted his teeth and barked at them to stop freezing up and get back to their positions. They had to take down as many demons as possible before the artillery teams recovered. More demons swooped down toward them, with one landing right in front of them. Zoe arrived just in time, effortlessly blocking the demon. With a single, precise thrust, her iron rod pierced straight through its body. She smirked, marveling at His Majesty's new weapons. If they'd had these weapons 400 years ago, maybe Takira wouldn't have fallen, and the top 3 seats wouldn't have turned against each other. With a swift stomp, Zoe crushed the demon's skull under her boot. She wasn't just fighting, she was here to make them pay. Meanwhile, Vayner slowly got back on his feet, coughing a couple of times as medics rushed to his side. While they bandaged his wounds, he asked what the situation was. The medic explained that the demons had made it to their position, but the machine gun crews were holding them back. Vayner was surprised the demons came down to the ground after throwing their spears. That meant the reinforcements coming to the rescue were from the reserves stationed in the middle, while the front line was still intact. Once the medics finished patching him up, Vayner told them to save as many injured as they could. As for him, he had work to do since those cannons weren't going to fix themselves. Rushing to a cannon that hadn't been destroyed, he reached for a shell, but before he could load it, a demon swung a massive axe at him. Luckily, he barely dodged the attack. The demon raised its axe for another swing, and this time Vayner knew he couldn't escape in time. Just then, an ice wall appeared between him and the demon, stopping the attack. Turning around, he saw Agatha, and he was safe for now. She tells him to stay behind her as the demon pounded furiously at the ice wall, eventually shattering it. The demon raised its axe again, but Agatha acted fast, shooting a barrage of ice shards that pierced and froze the creature solid. Vayner stood up and thanked her, but Agatha cut him off, warning that the second wave of spears was incoming. She turned and called out to Molly. Curious, Vayner looked over and saw Molly standing with a massive slime forming above her head. The slime extended tendrils, gently pulling the wounded into its protective barrier. At that moment, the demons launched their spears. Agatha froze one in midair, once again saving Vayner's life. She suggested he and his men retreat while they could. But Vayner wasn't ready to leave just yet, he wanted to make the demons pay. Heading to another cannon, he aimed carefully, grabbed the firing rope, and yanked it hard. The shell soared through the air, striking one of the demons in the sky with pinpoint accuracy. He let out a smile, saying the witches were the main force against the demons, but mortals had their own ways of fighting too. By now, the entire area was littered with the shattered remains of demon corpses. Agatha couldn't help but marvel at how unstoppable the Takira witches were in close combat. His Majesty's firearms were like the cherry on top, enhancing their already overwhelming power. Still, the Takira witches seemed to prefer traditional fighting styles. Cutting down demons with their own hands seemed to bring them a sense of solace. By now, most of the demons had been wiped out. Agatha estimated that nearly 70% of the flying beasts had been taken down, but the enemy still wasn't retreating. Zoe suspected the demons were preparing one final, desperate attack. Looking up at the sky, Zoe reasoned that there must be a commander or perhaps a high-ranking demon. For them, failing to achieve their goal was worse than death. They'd rather die in battle than retreat. Breeze asked why the commander hadn't come down from the start. Zoe explained that it was waiting for a worthy opponent. If there had been an extraordinary witch on their side, the commander would have shown itself already. Agatha noticed how well Zoe understood the demons and grew curious about her past. She asked about her role back in the Federation. It turned out that Zoe had once been one of Lady Natalia's shadow guards, known in the Sacred Army as the Crimson Lotus. Before Agatha could ask more, the remaining demons regrouped and charged again. Zoe told everyone to focus on protecting the mortals. She would handle these enemies herself. But just as she prepared to fight, Sylvie's voice came through the communication seal, warning them there were multiple magic reactions among the enemies. Suddenly, more demons burst out from the clouds, moving so fast that some were just a blur. Their target shifted to the heavy machine gun teams. The soldiers tried to retreat after receiving the warning, but it was already too late. The ground shook violently as a massive creature landed with a thunderous impact. From its mouth emerged a towering demon clad in black armor. Agatha's eyes widened in shock as she stared at it. And she wondered, what the hell is this thing? However, the monster wasn't much of a problem. She used her ability and quickly got rid of it. Zoe and another Takira witch rushed in to shield her. The high-ranking demon roared, its magic forming into a weapon that sliced through a nearby cannon as if it were paper. The steel barrel split in two, the edges glowing as though scorched by intense heat. Instead of being intimidated, Zoe smirked and began mocking the demon, taunting it by saying that mere mortals had already beaten them. The demon turned its furious gaze toward her, and Zoe simply sneered, saying it was time for it to feel the rage of 400 years of suffering. The demon's next attack was blocked by the combined efforts of the Takira witches, who formed a god punishment field to neutralize its magic. The demon's weapon shattered under the force, and nearby Takira witches aimed their rifles at it. Blue magic barriers flickered as the bullet connected, but the barriers dimmed and faded almost immediately. Another volley of gunfire followed, forcing the demon stumbling backward. Its seemingly indestructible armor was pierced, and it fell heavily to the ground. Zoe approached slowly. Agatha asked if she wasn't going to finish the demon. Zoe explained that even demons had limits to their regeneration. Once their magic was depleted, they'd die on their own. The demon lay trembling, blood pouring from its armor. Though its purple healing magic was still active, it was no longer enough to fully heal it. but Zoe had no intention of letting it die just yet. She planned to treat its wounds and provide it with some red mist to prolong its life for a few more days. Agatha was shocked and asked what Zoe was planning. Zoe revealed her intention to have Camilla use her abilities to connect with the demon's mind. It was risky, but the knowledge in the brain of a high-ranking demon commander was worth the gamble. Agatha admitted that in the Takira era, such an opportunity would have been irresistible to the leadership. But now, under Roland's rule and with Tilly on his side, no one would force a witch to take such a risk unless she volunteered. Suddenly, a massive explosion sounded in the distance. To know what was going on, we had to rewind back a few minutes. Back at the front lines, Sylvie had detected a large cluster of magic reactions. She immediately sounded the alarm, spotting something that looked strangely similar to one of His Majesty's inventions. Without hesitation, she ordered the soldiers to focus their fire on its limbs. Under heavy fire, they managed to take down some demons, but the mysterious machine-like thing remained unscathed. More demons took to the skies as Sylvie continued directing the soldiers. Finally, they succeeded in severing one of its limbs. But she still had no idea what were the demons trying to do. Suddenly, the strange creatures came to a halt. From their bodies, pillars grew out of them, and the next second, these pillars were launched with incredible force. Sylvie quickly ordered Shavy to deploy her shield. The pillars crashed heavily against the shield, and one even managed to pierce through it. Through the communication seal, Agatha's voice came through, asking about the situation at the front. Sylvie, clearly anxious, explained that they were dealing with some kind of monster they'd never encountered before and desperately needed support from the fortress cannons. The enemy launched another round of attacks, and while Sylvie noticed their reload time was slower than the cannons, they still suffered heavy casualties. What Sylvie didn't know was that the artillery units in the rear had taken a serious hit. Agatha quickly asked Vaynor to speak with Sylvie. Vaynor told her that while most of their cannons had been destroyed, one was still operational and they were working to fix on the other. He needed shooting parameters to provide support. Sylvie immediately checked her compass and relayed the angle and distance. Vaynor repeated the information to confirm, then ordered the cannon crew to fire. Moments later, a shell hit one of the creatures dead on. Before Sylvie could celebrate, she quickly reported the next target's parameters. The artillery team reloaded swiftly and, even from 2 kilometers away, landed another direct hit. But then, several demons emerged from behind the creatures, using them as cover to charge the front line. Fortunately, the First Army had barbed wire in place, and the machine gun squads reacted immediately. Under a barrage of bullets, the demons were killed in mere seconds. Without the cover of the creatures, the tide of battle turned completely. The demons couldn't even throw their spears before being mowed down by gunfire. Soon, the remaining demons began to retreat. The machine gunners kept firing, and just then, a few more artillery units joined the fight. Sylvie provided the final set of coordinates, and they managed to destroy the rest of the creatures. Cheers erupted from the soldiers as the battle came to an end. They quickly began clearing the battlefield, gathering piles of demon corpses and setting them on fire while recovering all the magic stones. The final count showed that over 6,000 demons had been killed. Half of them were taken out by artillery and machine guns, while the rest died due to the lack of red mist. Zoe, visibly thrilled, declared the battle a massive success. Everyone finally breathed a sigh of relief. After 400 years, they had stepped foot into this forgotten land once again, and this time, humanity had claimed a hard-earned victory against the demons. At this moment, Roland finally established contact with the front line. The battle had yielded incredible results. Not only had they eliminated thousands of demons, but they also discovered over a dozen siege beasts that had been modified into transport vehicles. Roland remembered these creatures could also be used by the witches. Zoe confirmed this, explaining that the beasts were powered by magic stones and could be operated with minimal training. Though they were slow, they could carry heavy loads. Roland thought for a moment and decided they would be perfect for the construction department. The engineering teams were in desperate need of transport vehicles, and the slow speed would actually be an advantage in the city. Switching gears, Roland asked how the demons had managed to evade Sylvie's detection. Agatha explained that they had discovered an underground tunnel at the outpost, leading to a cave 2 kilometers away. Inside that cave, they found a massive stone of God's punishment pillar. In fact, she believed this was the demon's real outpost. Hearing this, Roland was shocked. It was unheard of a stone of God's punishment large enough to cover the entire camp. Agatha described it as nearly 5 meters in diameter and 10 meters tall, with a smooth, polished surface. Even in the height of the Federation era, such a massive stone pillar had never been seen. Roland understood the immense difficulty of crafting such a pillar. He recalled the very stone at the base of the North Slope mine back then. Even a point-blank shot from a musket would leave only faint marks on their surface. The only way to extract and shape them was to slowly erode them with magic blood, followed by meticulous cutting and polishing. However, the thought of this left Roland feeling uneasy. If the demons had developed new processing techniques or gained deeper knowledge of magic, it meant the Third Divine War might be even harder than he had anticipated. Zoe didn't want to admit it, but it was clear the demons were evolving way faster than they were. Just thinking about those creepy crawling monsters they encountered earlier made her wonder, just what other kinds of war machines might these demons have up their sleeves? And how were they supposed to fight against them? These were the burning questions Neverwinter needed answers to, and fast. After reporting the battle results, it was time to go over the First Army's casualties. Even with Manhwa, Lily, and the medical unit working tirelessly, over 190 soldiers were injured, and 75 had lost their lives. Roland paused for a moment before telling Axe to bring back the ashes of the fallen soldiers. With a heavy voice, he declared, "Grey Castle will never forget them." Roland hoped the entire army could return to Neverwinter once the wounded had recovered. He gazed out the window at the falling leaves, knowing that winter was just around the corner. Agatha had something else to share. Apparently, the high-ranking demon that had been defeated by the Takira witches was still alive. However, when Agatha explained the Takira witches' latest plan, Roland wasn't sure how to feel about it. Agatha admitted the plan was risky, but after some serious brainstorming, they came up with a more workable idea. Her proposal was that if it was risky for humans to connect their minds to a demon, why not turn the demon into a human instead? That's when Roland quickly thought of the soul transfer method. As he expected, their plan was to first transfer the demon's soul into the body of a god's punishment warrior. This way, any risks tied to perception or connection would fall entirely on the demon. Roland asked if Camilla had been told about this. Agatha assured him that they had spoken with her. At first, Camilla was firmly against the idea, but Zoe managed to convince her. This surprised Roland since Zoe wasn't exactly known for being persuasive. Zoe simply smiled and said she'd told Camilla that the person who would link their mind to the demon was none other than herself. As the one who came up with the plan, she believed it was her responsibility to take all the risks. After thinking it over, Roland gave the green light to the plan. Once the call ended, he sat quietly, lost in thought. He couldn't help but wonder if humans and demons really have souls. If they didn't, how could the Takira witches casually switch bodies throughout the years? And if they did, why couldn't a soul exist on its own, separate from a body? After all, if souls could be easily removed or transferred, wouldn't that mean immortality was within reach? Then there was the dream world. How did that even work? And what about the records of the underground civilization that spoke of a light beam leading to the divine realm? Staring out the window, Roland realized that only by understanding the true nature of magic and the divine war could these mysteries ever be unraveled. In the following days, Neverwinter's major industrial projects made some incredible progress. Tilly had already finished the flight manual, and the new generation of gliders was moving along smoothly. She even reminded Roland to make sure the cover design looked good. Meanwhile, the new generation steel warship, after several upgrades, was finally stable enough to sail the seas. The Mage Tower built specifically for Agatha was also complete. A month and a half later, the First Army finally returned to Neverwinter. The townspeople formed groups and came out to greet them. Roland, along with the city hall officials, personally welcomed the soldiers back. And on that very day, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall. The high-ranking demon was brought by the Takira witches to a hidden chamber deep underground. Before leaving, Zoe casually told the group that they just needed to make sure the demon didn't die. As the heavy stone doors closed, Alethea suddenly appeared and asked Zoe if she believed they had a real chance of winning. Zoe smiled and replied that they'd already won, hadn't they? Alethea rolled her eyes and tapped Zoe's forehead with a tentacle, saying she knew exactly what she was trying to ask. Soon after, Pasha and Celine joined them. Pasha noted that Zoe seemed so relaxed, and she felt that was already a pretty good answer. Zoe stayed quiet for a moment before admitting she wasn't completely certain. The demons were nothing like they were 400 years ago. She explained that while Lady Akali's plan wasn't entirely wrong, but following it would almost guarantee humanity's defeat. Pasha sighed, saying it was a relief they had chosen the right person to follow, and Lady Natalia's decision back then had been the right call. She reflected on how things had turned out and she remembered how many years ago, their differing beliefs had led them to side with Lady Natalia, breaking apart the Federation. That fateful ambush, which wasn't exactly fair, had destroyed the very foundation of the Federation. Even now, she could still picture their old comrades, who died believing they had made the wrong choice and it was them who destroyed the witch's best chance of survival. Celine began to cry, admitting that even after 400 years, she was still terrified she might have made a mistake. Zoe walked over and comforted her, saying while they couldn't be sure who would ultimately win, at least there was some hope now. Pasha stepped closer and looked at the group, asking if this meant they could finally fulfill Lady Natalia's wishes. Alethea hesitated and pointed out that they still hadn't found the true chosen one. Zoe shrugged and reasoned that the ancient underground texts never mentioned if the chosen one had to be male or female. While this particular chosen one couldn't activate the device, they were just as capable of dealing with the demons. Celine agreed, saying there was no rule stating there could only be one chosen one, and if they found a new witch who fit better, they could always switch later. Zoe nodded but brought up something else. Camilla had only agreed to the plan of connecting with the demon after learning that Zoe would personally put herself at risk. However, Zoe added with a wry smile, saying this meant Camilla's concern for Witch's safety didn't include monsters like herself. What Zoe said made the mood grow heavy. It was exactly what they had worried about. Despite they still see themselves as witches, perhaps the new generation didn't necessarily think of them the same way. Roland was the only one who had accepted them so quickly. But Pasha said she didn't regret anything. She couldn't control what the future might bring, but they could at least plan ahead and carve out their own path. Aletheia smirked and asked if their grand plan was to hide in the mountains, disappear quietly, or dig a hole and bury themselves. Pasha raised a tentacle and declared, with all seriousness, that they wouldn't do any of that. Instead, she said, they were going to become an indispensable force for the human kingdoms. Celine gently patted Zoe and asked if Pasha was referring to the kind of strength the gods' punishment witches had. She reasoned, however, that no king would likely see it that way. She then explained that their power wasn't just about physical strength, it was also about knowledge. In His Majesty's dream world, there were books, libraries, and scholars. If they dedicated some time to learning even the most basic knowledge, over a decade or so, they could become invaluable allies who fully understood the king's vision. Since mortals would age and grow weaker over time, they can work hard to become true inheritors of His Majesty's vision. Pasha chuckled and gave Celine's head a playful pat, saying the plan would only matter if they first defeated the demons. For now, she added, they should focus on fine-tuning the soul instrument. Celine laughed too and joked that their king probably wouldn't have the patience to wait until tomorrow. Once the celebrations outside ended, their side should be ready as well. While the celebration continued outside, Roland had already arrived at the third border town. As soon as he stepped in, he was greeted by the Takira witches standing in a perfectly arranged line before him. Before he could ask what was going on, Pasha began thanking him and pledging Takira's eternal loyalty to him. Roland was taken aback, feeling their attitude had suddenly become much more respectful. Their formal salute even made him wonder if they now saw him in one of the Federation's top 3 seats. Quickly clearing his throat, Roland told them there was no need for such formality and insisted the victory belonged to everyone. He then asked about the preparations for the soul transfer. Pasha informed him everything was ready to begin. They moved to a massive magic stone, under which lay 3 stone beds. One held a male god's punishment warrior body, while another had the high-ranking demon, its limbs chopped off and pinned down to the bed. Zoe explained that they had already asked Lady Manhwa to heal the demon during the journey but still needed to make certain adjustments. Wendy, curious, asked what kind of adjustments they needed. Zoe, visibly excited, replied that it was simple, they just needed to wait for the demon to recover slightly, then stab it again to force it to burn more magic and self-healing. Her tone and expression startled both Wendy and Roland. Zoe added, almost casually, that when she was new to this, she had stabbed the demon multiple times too quickly, almost causing the demon to die outright. Roland coughed awkwardly and suggested they could begin now. Celine extended her tentacle to activate the magic stone, while Pasha assisted her. The stone began to glow brightly. Celine announced that core number 3 had been tuned into the soul instrument magic stone, and they could proceed. In the next instant, the light engulfed the 2 bodies. Celine mentioned that luck was on their side and they had successfully captured the soul. Now, they just had to wait. Suddenly, the previously motionless god's punishment warrior jolted to life, his eyes snapping open. His face contorted in pain, and his body trembled uncontrollably. Zoe calmly explained that this was expected since being stuffed into an unfamiliar body would always cause this kind of reaction. She added that when they first transformed, they had experienced something similar. Without help, even basic tasks like eating were impossible. Zoe walked up to one of the stone beds and said that when demons are mentally overwhelmed, this is their best chance. She explained that Camilla would handle things from here, and if anyone had questions, they could ask directly. But before they started, she had one request, which was that no matter what happened, as long as she didn't signal to stop, they shouldn't break the connection. Camilla was surprised, then for the first time looked concerned and worried. Roland nodded, saying he understood. Taking a deep breath, Camilla began to use her ability. Zoe's face immediately twisted in pain. Suddenly, her voice changed, and he asked what they had done to him. Roland knew it wasn't Zoe speaking but the demon. The demon grinned wickedly, calling them lowly crawling creatures and demanding they release him, or else he'd make this female body suffer. Wendy gasped and quickly grabbed Roland's arm, retreating in fear. The group looked at Zoe, unsure what was happening to her. Anna stepped in front of everyone and calmly pointed out that the demon was bluffing. She observed Zoe's hands and noted that the demon hadn't taken control of her body. Roland caught on to Zoe's strategy. Perhaps this direct form of communication left the demon little time to think or resist. With a cold smirk, Roland asked, since the demon called them lowly crawling creatures, then what would that make him, given he had been defeated so thoroughly? The demon froze for a moment before Roland continued, mocking him by pointing out how his army was completely destroyed, and he himself ended up like a pincushion. He added that they had turned thousands of demons into dust. Pointing at the demon, he asked who the real lowly species was now. The demon shook his head repeatedly, refusing to believe it. In a shocked voice, he muttered that unless Roland had obtained a legacy fragment and elevated his race, it was impossible. He speculated whether their weapons had been created using knowledge from such a fragment. Roland quickly latched onto the term and demanded to know what the legacy fragments were. The demon ignored him, mumbling that it didn't make sense. He said humans were nothing but insects who had never set foot in the Sky-Sea realm. How could they have gotten their hands on a legacy fragment? But if that wasn't the case, why had they failed so miserably? His voice grew louder, calling it all lies. He declared that he, Kabratabai, would never accept it. Roland sneered, telling the demon that denial wouldn't change their crushing defeat. He mocked the demon's so-called impossibilities as nothing more than a joke. Furious, the demon roared that Roland dared to call the foundation of their species' survival and ascension a joke. He believed the key to their race's continuation and evolution was no laughing matter. Pasha suddenly chimed in, asking if the demon was referring to a red cone-shaped crystals that upon close contact, transported someone to a place with 4 paintings. Tilly added that it sounded like the demon was talking about divine relics. The demon scoffed, dismissing their term divine relics and claiming it had nothing to do with the gods. He explained that consuming the fragments would elevate their species while losing them would turn them into prey for others. But the demon also asked how they could have possibly got their hands on the fragment. Roland realized the demon must have thought there was no way they could obtain the relic, since to gain a relic, a race must annihilate another, and during the First Divine War, humans were too occupied fighting the demons, meaning there was no chance for them to destroy another civilization during this time. But at the same time, it seems that these relics dictated the survival and advancement of entire civilizations, so this would also mean the Divine War was an endless, brutal competition with no hope for peace. He asked if this was all part of the gods' design, which was why they also called it the Divine War. The demon chuckled, suddenly much calmer, and replied that the war had nothing to do with gods. It was about the species themselves. The final ascendant would open the path to the source of magic and gain unlimited power. They believed in the face of that power, they themselves will then become the divine will. He added that none of this matters for lowly creatures like humans, who were destined for extinction. Roland tried to ask more questions, but something felt wrong. He suddenly called out Zoe's name. He heard the demon laugh maniacally. The demon announced that the female wouldn't hear them anymore and mocked their use of magic against him, calling it suicidal. He admitted he couldn't control the body, but that didn't mean he couldn't use magic. Roland glanced anxiously at Camilla, who looked equally alarmed. The demon snarled, declaring it was too late, and tells them to say goodbye to the female. A moment later, everything went silent. Camilla, in a panic, announced that both souls had vanished. Everyone froze. Was the soul in Zoe's body still hers? Alethea reacted quickly, wrapping her tentacles tightly around Zoe to prevent any sudden attack. Roland asked Camilla if the demon's soul had truly transferred into Zoe's body. Camilla admitted she'd never encountered such a situation before but theorized it was possible. Tilly asked if there was a way to confirm this. Alethea, regaining composure, said the only way would be if the demon spoke again, but for now, they had to prepare for the worst. After a moment of silence, Roland suddenly thought of an idea. Out of the blue, Roland announced that he might have a solution. But before he could finish explaining how he wanted to bring Zoe's light pillar into the dream world, both Wendy and Nightingale jumped in, cutting him off mid-sentence. The two of them immediately thought this was a terrible idea. Wendy argued that Roland should avoid any risk, while Nightingale made it clear she was terrified of what might happen if the demon possessed Roland's body. After all, they weren't dealing with a defeated soul from the soul battlefield but an actual high-ranking demon. Roland, however, calmly pointed out that the risks were manageable. He suggested taking along an army of Takira witches to ensure they would kill the demon before it could react. This didn't sit well with Nightingale, who was visibly upset. She spun around and begged Anna to back her up, but to everyone's surprise, Anna didn't take Nightingale's side. Instead, she tells them she isn't against the plan. Nightingale stared at Anna, utterly shocked. Anna, however, looked at Roland with a soft, unwavering gaze and explained that this was how he had saved her in the very beginning. She reminded them that if someone had stopped Roland back then using similar arguments, she would have been long dead on the gallows. At that moment, Alethea joined in, adding that regardless of how things turned out, she wanted to thank Roland on Zoe's behalf. Roland simply smiled and replied that he'd wait to hear it from Zoe herself once she was back. Soon after, Phyllis started organizing witches for the mission. Meanwhile, Roland instructed Camilla to continue using her ability. He believes that when it's about the battle between sheer will, Zoe might not necessarily lose. The scene then shifted to a space of nothingness. Two chairs faced each other, one occupied by a smug high-ranking demon and the other by Zoe. The demon sneered at Zoe, clearly amused, and teased her about what her allies were up to. He guessed that they were already pinning her down and ready to attack her. Zoe didn't answer. She glanced at him briefly before looking elsewhere. The demon laughed louder, assuming her silence meant fear. He held up 3 fingers and mockingly estimated that there was a 30% chance she'd be restrained and imprisoned, but a far greater chance Zoe would be outright executed. Still, Zoe remained unfazed, her attention wandering as if she were inspecting the place. Annoyed, the demon interpreted her quietness as shock and coldly warned her that silence wouldn't save her. Suddenly, he sprang to his feet and charged towards her. He even suggested that if she could entertain him somehow, she might suffer less in the end. But to his surprise, Zoe broke into a smile. She remarked that she hadn't expected a demon to be this yapping. The demon scowled, turning his back on her, thinking her smile as mere defiance, confident she'd be screaming soon enough. Then, without warning, Zoe lunged herself straight at the demon. Time dragged on, and the demon's armor was now cracked all over. Using magic, he formed a weapon and managed to slice off one of Zoe's arms. He smirked and told her she'd done well, but she was still just an insect in his eyes. Zoe held her arm stump but didn't look bothered at all. Instead, she spit out a chunk of the demon's flesh, wrinkling her nose as she told him his flesh tasted awful. Deep down she knew this wasn't a fair fight. The demon could whip up magical weapons like swords, while she only had her fists, feet, and, if needed, her teeth. But that didn't matter. In this strange place, lost limbs could grow back, and no amount of damage could knock her out. Pain, however, was constant, and you didn't always need a weapon to make someone feel it. The demon pressed a hand to his wounded shoulder. He warned her not to get cocky or try biting him again. If she did, he'd break her teeth and shove them down her throat. Zoe's arm started to regrow, and she calmly pointed out that, despite everything, he could still feel pain. She asked if the feeling was familiar. The demon froze for a moment, glaring at her, and demanded to know what she was talking about. Zoe smiled and reminded him of the time he used to feel that kind of pain all the time. She added that it was she who made sure he got special treatment back then. That was enough to make the demon snap. He roared and charged at her, throwing everything he had. It was hard to tell how long they'd been fighting, maybe days, maybe weeks. Blood and body parts were scattered everywhere. Now, the demon was lying on the ground looking quite pathetic. Zoe walked toward him slowly, grinning like a cat that caught a mouse. She leaned down and sweetly told him he could take a break if he was feeling tired. Then, licking some blood off her lips, she joked that he'd need to save his strength, he still had plenty of self-torture to go through. This time, the demon didn't retort. For the first time, he actually looked a little scared. Zoe tilted her head and asked if the demon created this place. The demon, finally speaking, explained that it was part of the consciousness, a mix of magic and soul. He threw in a jab about how someone like her could never understand how it worked. Instead of being offended, Zoe laughed. Her mocking laughter only made the demon angrier. She tells him she'd seen something much bigger and better, a whole world with people, trees, skies, and land. Unlike this empty place, that place had everything. The demon snorted and called her a liar. He said she had no idea how much magic it took to create even a small object here, let alone an entire world. He then followed up saying only the source of magic could do that. Zoe crouched down and picked up one of his broken bones, shaking her head like she was disappointed. She told him the source of magic was just some theoretical idea, nothing better than the divine will. If he was so sure, maybe he should show some proof. The demon wasn't dumb, he saw through her little trick immediately. But before he could react, Zoe rammed the bone straight into his shoulder. She grinned as she twisted it deeper, watching his face twist in pain. The demon trembled all over, his earlier confidence completely gone. He couldn't understand how could Zoe not fear pain. However, to Zoe, mere physical pain was nothing compared to the hatred she'd been carrying for 400 years. Right now, all she wanted was to torment him for her own satisfaction. Before she could continue, the scene around her began to shift. A bright light pierced through the void, and she realized it was over. It had to be His Majesty, she thought. He always found a way to save people. When Zoe opened her eyes again, the first thing she heard was Alethia's voice. Alethia's tentacles were tightly holding her in place, clearly trying to confirm who was inside this body. Alethia instructed her to stay still for the time being. Zoe nodded in response. Looking to the side, she spotted Roland lying on a stone bed. It didn't take long for her to realize they were trying to use His Majesty's dream world to confirm who was in her body. But Zoe immediately felt this was far too risky. She quickly tried to stop them, insisting that she was Zoe. However, her protests were ignored. Alethia warned Camilla that the demon had the ability to tamper with the effects of magic to some extent. If the demon enters the dream world, who knew what would happen? If anything happened, she urged her to wake Roland up immediately. Roland, seeing Zoe waking up, said even the person right now is a demon. He could have said the same thing. Seeing that Roland hadn't activated the dream world, Zoe finally felt a bit relieved. Zoe then suggested a solution. What if they have Camilla reconnect her and the demon? If they forced the demon to admit the truth, everything would be clear. The group exchanged glances, until Pasha spoke up, saying it wouldn't hurt to try. After all, if the other side was the real Zoe, she would surely know how to expose the imposter. Roland agreed, and Camilla activated her power again. The god's punishment soldier's body suddenly twitched as the demon realized what was happening. He snarled, saying only an idiot would admit to being a demon in this situation. Zoe let out a chilling smile while reminding him that if he refused to speak, she'd happily re-enter his consciousness and make him relive the pain of those endless days. That was enough to break him. The demon, his face twisted in anger, finally growled that it was enough. He admitted defeat, saying they just got lucky this time. But Zoe wasn't done yet. She casually told the demon to spill some insider information about the demons. Surprisingly, the demon didn't seem to mind. He began sharing details, convinced that humans wouldn't win in the long run. To him, this war was nothing more than a minor setback for his race. The demon sneered and said humans had no idea what lay on the other side of the continent. He explained that the armies of the Sky Sea realm were slowly devouring the land, trying to turn the entire world into an abyss. If they hadn't been busy holding them back, humans would have been wiped out 400 years ago. Roland didn't care much about the demon's grand storytelling but focused on the important part. He figured that the demons were actually fighting two wars at once, and their main battlefield wasn't even here. If what the demon said was true, the situation was far more complicated than it had seemed. Pointing at the demon, Roland asked if they could now confirm this really was a demon. Alethea admitted she didn't know what Zoe had done, but she was confident this was the real deal. Roland found that answer satisfying enough. He told Zoe to indulge herself in the dream world tonight and eat whatever she wanted, as a reward for all her trouble. Zoe's eyes lit up at the offer, and she thanked him. Still, she added with a sigh that it was a pity the demon had gotten used to its borrowed body. The same method wouldn't work to dig out its true thoughts again. The demon suddenly chuckled, unable to contain himself, and mocked how ridiculous it was to call them demons. He said humans always labeled anything different from themselves as terrifying and evil. He added that when the source of magic reappeared, that would be the end of humanity. Roland immediately realized the demon was referring to the red moon. Agatha, however, disagreed. She'd seen the red moon herself, and whatever it was incredibly far from their world. She wondered aloud if the demons had a way to reach that far. But this time, the demon turned his head away without answering. Roland then asked him what exactly was the Sky Sea realm. However, the demon stayed silent again. Roland pressed further, asking if it was the demons who had wiped out the underground civilization. Once again, there's no response. He switched tactics, asking if the monsters that launched black pillars were some sort of inheritance from the underground civilization. The demon scoffed and told them not to waste their time. He had said all he could, and no amount of effort would make him spill more. Instead, he urged them to finish him off, warning that their kind would soon be exterminated by Lord Hexod. As for him, he would simply be reborn through the source of magic. Roland ignored the demon's theatrics. If he wasn't going to talk, Roland figured they might as well change the subject. He asked the demon how powerful his kind really was if this loss was so insignificant to them. Roland knew this was bait, and he was confident the demon wouldn't resist the chance to boast given his personality. And just as Roland predicted, the demon grinned and began bragging. He claimed they were unimaginably strong. Their armies stretched endlessly across the sky at the border of the Sky Sea realm. As for humanity's so-called transcendent witches who had once been able to stand against their lords. But now, the Sky Lord Hexod had taken command claiming he could crush every last one of them single-handedly. Roland cut him off mid-rant, telling him it was him that didn't quite understand what true strength was. Before the demon could respond, Roland turned his back on him and calmly explained. True strength, he said, wasn't about plunging the world into darkness. It was about those who, at the brink of collapse, were willing to burn their very souls to bring light and warmth to all. As he walked away, Roland threw one last remark over his shoulder, sarcastically asking why, if the demons were so mighty, they should just light the fire. The demon looked confused, but before he could react, the group had already left. Outside, Anna noticed that Roland seemed quite happy after his chat with the demon. When she asked him about it, Roland admitted he wasn't exactly happy but felt they had learned a lot. For starters, he pointed out, the sea monsters could hold off the demon army, which meant they weren't as simple as they seemed. More importantly, the demons hadn't referred to their Sky Sea realm enemies as insects, which meant the enemy had also evolved, or what the demons called ascended. Anna, however, quickly pointed out only one species had been eliminated, yet two species had ascended. The math didn't add up. She then realized something important. Perhaps the demon never actually said they destroyed the eliminated civilization. It only mentioned that reaching the Sky Sea realm was a requirement for gaining inheritance. Roland nodded, thinking there must be more to the story, something they didn't know yet. The scene shifted to the meeting hall in Neverwinter Castle. Everyone was deep in thought. The idea of a species as strong as demons on the other side of the continent weighed heavily on the group. Wendy, trying to lighten the mood, suggested that the demons might have made all this up to scare them. She said they should stay optimistic until they had solid proof. After a pause, Phyllis admitted they'd underestimated the demons. She said they didn't just lack knowledge about the Sky-Sea realm, they didn't even know much about the far side of the Dawn region. Roland asked if she knew anything specific. Phyllis shared she had once heard the other side of the Dawn region was a wasteland with towering mountains and cliffs. Most of the time, the mountains were underwater, only fully revealed during low tide. That caught Roland's attention. It sounded a lot like what Thunder had described in the Shadow Isle. Could the explorers have seen the continent opposite the Dawn region? But that shouldn't be happening because the Dawn region was northwest of Neverwinter, while the Shadow Isle was on the east side. How could the explorers have seen the other continent from there? Roland frowned, thinking about the geography. If the world was round, the planet's curvature should have made such a sight impossible. Something didn't feel right. Tilly seemed to have the same thought. Roland noticed her looking at him and realized she was also remembering the underwater ruins the expedition team had found. If those ruins weren't built by the Federation but were watching the demon continent, then who built them? Roland decided he would need Thunder to investigate the ruins further. Agatha noticed Roland had gone quiet and asked if he was okay. He told her he was just thinking. She guessed the news was stressing him out and reassured him they'd find a way to deal with it. Phyllis chimed in, saying Roland was already doing better than the top 3 seats and should give himself some credit. Roland looked around and noticed everyone seemed worried about him. He realized his deep thinking had made him look too serious. Smiling, he told them his plan wasn't to hide in some remote corner and leave the demon problem for the people 400 years later. Instead, he wanted to face everything head-on, take down the competition and solve the mystery of the divine will. That, he added with a grin, sounded way more fun. Anna smiled at him as he stood up. Roland declared that in the face of the sun, all things, including demons, would turn to mere dust. With a determined look, he told them they'd stand together and witness that moment. Can anyone guess what our boy is trying to build this time? On the other side of town, Akima sat by the fire while Doris brought out a pot of soup and placed it on the table. That was dinner for the night. Akima stared at her reflection in the soup and hesitated. Doris noticed and asked what was on her mind. Akima admitted she was wondering if her decision back then had been a mistake. She thought maybe if they had stayed under the sleeping curse, life would have been easier. At least they wouldn't all be crammed into this tiny house. Doris tried to comfort her, saying that no matter the size of the house, it was still a roof over their heads. Sure, it wasn't as good as before, but it was better than wandering the streets like they used to. Akima cut her off, saying things weren't like they used to be. She had applied for several jobs at the city hall but hadn't been accepted for any of them. Now, all 6 of them were depending on Doris and White Pear to cover the expenses. Regret crept in as she wondered if things would have been different had she accepted Wendy's help. Realizing her tone was harsh, she apologized and buried her face in her hands. Doris reassured her, reminding her that everyone had agreed to leave together because they believed in her, saying it wasn't her fault. Holding Akima's hand, Doris added that covering expenses was no big deal. Akima had done so much for them in the past, now, it was their turn to give back. Akima didn't know how to respond, but before she could think, a knock came at the door. Startled, she stood up and asked who it was. To her surprise, it was Wendy. She explained that Roland wanted to talk to them. Through the heavy snow, they made their way to the castle. The guards at the gate were now replaced by Takira witches. Wendy asked Akima if she was cold, pointing out that they'd be stripping down soon enough once inside. Hearing this, Akima suddenly had some weird thoughts popping up. When they reached the castle, a maid greeted Wendy with a bow and informed her that His Majesty was in the study. Wendy thanked her and grabbed Akima's hand, leading her inside. Warmth washed over them as soon as they entered. Following the maid into the main hall, Akima noticed the heating pipes. Wendy removed her coat and told Akima she should do the same. Otherwise, she'd end up sweating, and going back out into the cold like that would surely make her catch a cold. Akima couldn't help glancing at Wendy's chest for a moment, her face turning slightly red. Comparing herself to Wendy, she wondered if His Majesty had those kinds of intentions, he probably wouldn't choose her anyway. Soon, Wendy brought her to the study. Nervously, Akima bowed to Roland, who put down his book and told her there was no need for formalities. He explained that he'd wanted to meet her for a long time because her ability was of great importance to the kingdom. It clicked for Akima, this wasn't about anything suspicious. Roland wanted to recruit her. He offered her a fixed contract, 2 gold per month, with an additional 50 for each completed task. Akima's heart skipped a beat. With that income, not only could she cover their expenses, but she could even help her friends. It was almost too good to be true. Still cautious, she asked what he wanted her to do before agreeing. Roland explained it was quite simple and she needed to help him find a specific type of stone. He pulled a thumb-sized stone out of a drawer and handed it to her. Akima examined it carefully and said it would be hard to trace its source. She recalled a time when she was tasked to locate a gemstone source but ended up leading the client to a place full of gravel. Roland guessed those were probably bauxite, technically a gemstone source by composition, then encouraged her to give it a try. Akima activated her ability, and suddenly, a beam of light shot out. Even she was startled, it was the strongest light she'd ever seen. Roland smiled and asked if something was wrong. Akima replied that there must be another matching stone in the drawer. Wendy pulled it out, and Roland confirmed she was absolutely right. Then he asked if she could locate a third matching stone. Akima tried again, using her ability to trace the source of the stone. She could pinpoint the direction but couldn't tell how far it was. Roland asked her to try different directions, which only made her more curious. She finally asked what these stones were. Could they be more valuable than gold? Roland smiled and explained that these stones were their future. That answer left Akima a little uneasy. She wasn't a combat witch, and if the stones were truly that valuable, she worried that news could leak, putting both the mission and her life in danger. Hearing her concern, Roland then reassured her, saying that if anyone who didn't understand them, these stones were just ordinary rocks. But to him, they were worth far more than gold and were the key to unlocking what he called the Radiant Radiation quest line. Akima didn't quite understand the last part, but Roland had already planned ahead. He tells her that she wouldn't be searching alone. Just then, Sean walked in. In addition to Sean, a team of engineers and soldiers would be accompanying her. The mission's priority was to find the source of the stones, and any help needed from officials in other territories would go through Sean. Akima was stunned at the idea of local lords assisting her. Roland chuckled and reminded her that those people were no longer the same as before. Feeling a bit more at ease, Akima made one last request. She wanted her salary to go to Doris instead, which Roland agreed. Bowing deeply, Akima accepted the job, saying she would get ready and head out tomorrow. Roland nodded, confident in her abilities and looking forward to good news. After everyone left, Roland gazed out the window and let out a sigh of relief, whispering to himself, "It's finally starting." Nightingale appeared silently, watching him with curiosity. She mentioned that whenever Roland talked about creating a sun, he seemed especially motivated. Roland sighed and said it was because this path was all about chasing fire. From this moment on, humanity was stepping into a new era, no longer just looking up at the sun but striving to shine alongside it. Nightingale wasn't sure what to say. What she didn't know was that since Lucia's evolution on her coming-of-age day, Roland had secretly tasked Kyle with isolating an element from a mass of materials to find uranium. With the critical samples in hand, Roland now had what he needed to work toward the power of nuclear energy. From the information they had gathered from the demons, humanity was at a life-or-death crossroads. If their enemies could strengthen themselves in ways beyond logic, then humans needed a weapon just as extraordinary, and that very weapon would be nuclear energy. Nightingale watched Roland in silence, his face serious and his mind clearly elsewhere. After a moment, she patted his shoulder and told him she believed in whatever he said. Still, she admitted it was hard to imagine that such a small thing could reduce demons to ashes. Roland admitted even he wouldn't have believed it without seeing it for himself. He added that if it weren't for Soraya wrapping it in a protective membrane, he wouldn't dare touch it with his bare hands. Roland unfolded a blueprint and spread it across the table. Nightingale, seeing this, asked if he was planning another late night. Roland smiled and said that now that everyone had a glimmer of hope, he couldn't let his laziness ruin everything. Nightingale didn't argue. Instead, she quietly went to prepare some tea and a midnight snack. Naturally, most of the snacks were things she liked, and she made sure to bring along a cup of her favorite energy-boosting chaos drink, which left Roland to chuckle helplessly at her choices. The next day was a cause for celebration because the oil distillation tower project officially kicked off. Inside the tower, the heat built up quickly, and soon, thick smoke was billowing out of the top. From a distance, Edith watched the scene and murmured to herself, "How beautiful." Cole, standing beside her, gave her a puzzled look and said it was just a smokestack. So what was so beautiful about that? Edith smiled and asked if he remembered what their hometown looked like during winter. Cole thought about it but could only recall indoor scenes. He realized he didn't have many clear memories of the city itself. If he had to put it into words, then maybe quiet best explains it. Edith shook her head and said it wasn't just quiet, it was actually lifeless, like the entire land was frozen solid. She admitted she used to think that was what winter was supposed to look like. Down below, cheers erupted as the first drops of oil were extracted. Edith turned back to Cole and asked him what he saw. Cole was confused by the question. Edith explained that the land was breathing, and the mist rising from the tower was proof of its activity. Nature, she said, could be changed by humanity. And when humans became strong enough, they could even change the world itself. She then asked again, "Isn't that kind of power beautiful?" The next morning, in the witch's building, Lorca woke up while yawning and rubbing her eyes. Her head still throbbed from all that drinking last night, which she said was all thanks to the great chieftain, who had generously handed out post-war rewards to everyone. She got dressed and gave her cheeks a few light slaps, reminding herself she couldn't afford to slack off, because otherwise, her skills would get rusty if she didn't stay disciplined. With a small fist raised in determination, she decided to head to the third border town to spar with the other witches. As she exited her room, she saw a piece of paper sticking out from under the door. Picking it up only to find it's a letter from her father. He started off by asking how she was doing in Neverwinter and whether anyone was giving her trouble. Lorca couldn't help but mumble that no one would dare, but the thought still made her smile. Her father still treated her like a little kid. He went on to say that as the third princess of their clan, it was unthinkable for anyone to bully her. But more importantly, he was curious about how much she had improved in her skills. That part made Lorca blush. She was part of the war against demons recently but barely made an impact. The only thing she managed was getting herself covered in dirt thanks to some strange stone pillar. In the end, she didn't even get to see the enemies. The letter also mentioned the issues in Iron Sand City. Some of the major clans who stayed behind seemed unhappy about the mass migration. However, he didn't know the details. After reading the letter, Lorca decided to find Wendy right away, hoping she could arrange a meeting with His Majesty. Wendy seemed surprised but said it was perfect timing since the king wanted to see her too. In the meeting room, Lorca found Roland sitting with a red-haired woman. She and Wendy greeted him, and Roland invited them to sit down, mentioning he had a new task for Lorca. Before that, Lorca shared the contents of her father's letter. Roland looked intrigued and urged her to continue. She reported that her father suspected some unrest among the major clans in Iron Sand City. While she didn't believe they could pose a threat to Green Waterport, but it was worth keeping an eye on them. Roland stroked his chin thoughtfully, noting that the staff department had considered this when drafting the relocation plan. However, he believed such regional issues were best handled by local forces. Lorca quickly offered to write to her father to address the situation. Roland, however, pointed out that this fell under political diplomacy and should be handled by him instead. He then introduced her to May, who smiled warmly and introduced herself. She added that she looked forward to working with Lorca. Lorca blinked in surprise and she wasn't sure what she meant by working with her. Roland reminded them that to help more people accept witches with abilities like hers. Plays, he explained, were one of the quickest ways to achieve that. Realizing Roland wanted her to act in a play, Lorca immediately panicked. Hugging her tail tightly, she protested that acting wasn't her thing and suggested finding someone else. Roland reassured her, saying she wouldn't have to perform live in front of an audience. He then picked up a peculiar object, explaining that this would be more of an experiment. He originally wanted to call it a movie, but after some thought, he settled on naming it Magic Shadow instead. Curious, Lorca peered at the item in his hand. It turned out to be a time seal, a magical device that could record a scene and replay it repeatedly. And with this, she can be less nervous. May chimed in, saying this device was typically used for recording significant events like grand meetings and rituals. She couldn't help but shower Roland with praise, calling his idea a stroke of genius. Her compliments flustered Roland slightly, but he soon turned to Lorca and asked for her opinion. After all, the story was tailored specifically for her, and he'd spent half a month writing it. Lorca blinked in surprise, before reluctantly agreeing to give it a try. Once she and May left the room, Nightingale emerged behind Roland. She raised an eyebrow and pointed out that there was no way Roland had spent half a month on this since he'd only decided to do it 2 days ago. Roland coughed awkwardly, telling her not to sweat the details. If he hadn't said that, Lorca wouldn't have agreed so quickly. Besides, no one else was better suited for this role, and persuasion was part of his job. Nightingale scoffed and took a seat, nibbling on a piece of dried fish. While she didn't dispute his reasoning, she didn't think Lorca's agreeing to do this had much to do with his storytelling finesse. So Roland asked what she thought the real reason was. Nightingale hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words, but ultimately kept her thoughts to herself. With a huff, she turned away and continued chewing on her dried fish. 3 days later, the film crew was ready to roll. Lightning hovered in the sky, holding the time seal. Then she called out, Act 1, Scene 3, action. The scene wrapped up smoothly, and May seemed satisfied. Next up was the climactic battle between the princess and the demon lord. Lorca, in her elegant dress, charged forward, declaring that the demon lord would meet his end. May watched as everyone immersed themselves in their roles, signaling the effects team to prepare. Lorca launched her attack at Carter, who was playing the demon lord, while Agatha and Wendy used their powers to add more effects. Carter, as the demon lord, blocked her strike, and in the next moment, a terrifying beast who was played by Maisie appeared behind him. And with that, May directed the crew to enhance the effects further. From atop the castle walls, Roland felt so much pride. He hadn't expected something as simple as a movie shoot could bring everyone so much closer together. Turning to Anna, who stood beside him, he asked if she wanted to join them and relax a little. Anna shook her head, explaining that she still had work to do, saying the internal combustion engine's parts needed further adjustments. Looping her arm around Roland's, she smiled, saying that being with him was the best kind of relaxation for her. As they stood together, Anna remarked that the future Roland had promised her was finally becoming a reality. Roland gently corrected her, saying there was still one part left to fulfill. Anna assumed he was referring to uniting the other Grey Castle territories and reassured him that those cities wouldn't take long to bring under control. But he shook his head, saying that wasn't what he meant. Looking into her eyes, he then said, I still need to ascend the throne and marry you as my queen. The next day, Barav stormed into Roland's study, sweating profusely and urging him to reconsider. Roland, sipping his drink leisurely, asked if he was referring to the coronation. Barav, flustered, clarified that he was talking about Roland's plan to publicly announce his intention to marry a witch as his queen. Roland wasn't surprised by the reaction and calmly tapped the table, inviting Barav to explain his concerns. Barav pointed out the matter of succession, emphasizing that it was no secret that witches couldn't bear children. If something happened to Roland, the lack of an heir would lead to unrest among the nobles and anxiety among the citizens. Roland listened with a smile and encouraged Barav to continue. So he clarified that he wasn't opposed to Roland being with Anna, and he respected Anna very much, but he suggested marrying a noblewoman to appease the aristocracy. What Roland did with this noblewoman afterward, Barav implied, didn't matter to him. Before Roland could respond, Nightingale materialized, and she was really mad. She demanded to know why Anna couldn't hold the title of queen. Was it simply because she was a witch? Barav was startled, his voice trembling as he insisted that Lady Anna, for the sake of the kingdom's stability, wouldn't mind such superficial matters. Nightingale sharply countered, asking how he could be so sure. She was certain Anna would never accept a puppet being inserted into their relationship. Despite his fear, Barav stood his ground, emphasizing that this was not about feelings but about succession. Roland raised his hand and interrupted their argument, calmly pointing out that Barav's true intention was simply to provide a rational outlet for potential dissenters. Barav froze for a moment, and Roland decisively stated that after defeating Zero, he had taken all her lifespan for himself. As such, he didn't need a successor. However, he acknowledged that the common folk would have a rough time believing this, so they'd require a symbolic figure for their peace of mind. He asked Barav if that was correct. Barav affirmed that this was exactly his point. A nominal heir would naturally quiet any opposition. Roland then proposed a simpler solution. During the battles of Hermes, he discovered Gerald Wimbledon and fathered a child with a tavern maid. This surprised Barav and he started walking back and forth. He hadn't heard about this before but quickly realized the child, while technically a bastard, could be elevated to a higher status. Controlling the mother would also be far easier than dealing with nobility, and he had already begun formulating a plan. Smiling, Roland instructed Barav to draft a detailed proposal, including arrangements for his coronation, and present it to him once ready. After Barav bowed and left, Roland turned to Nightingale, surprised at how she defended Anna. Nightingale apologized, admitting she simply couldn't hold back. Roland stroked his chin. However, before he could finish, Nightingale cut him off, rolling her eyes, asked if he thought she would wallow in sorrow and heartbreak. But honestly, she even thought he should have brought this up much sooner, though if it hadn't been for Anna, she wouldn't have stepped aside so easily. Roland suddenly recalled Nightingale's attitude when she returned after mysteriously disappearing for 2 days. The relief on her face then likely stemmed from some kind of agreement she had reached with Anna. While his curiosity burned, but sometimes it's not always a good idea to pry into everything. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Grey Castle, a woman carrying a bag of bread strolled down a quiet street. As she approached her home, she noticed a cluster of footprints near her door. She began panicking and thought maybe her secret had been exposed. Rushing back, she saw soldiers standing by her house. Recognizing the emblem on their uniforms, she panicked, dropping the bread as she bolted inside. Just then, she tripped over and fell onto the floor. Looking up, she saw a woman sitting by the baby's cradle, with a maid standing nearby. The woman introduced herself as Edith, confident she would recognize her name. The panicked woman quickly bowed, nervously asking why she was there. Edith gestured toward the door, and the maid calmly locked it. The mother immediately realized they had uncovered her child's secret. Even the nanny she had hired turned out to be a plant from the Kant family. Edith wasted no time. She explained that the king had sent her to bring the Wimbledon bloodline back to Neverwinter. Hearing this, the woman went pale and asked if they planned to execute her child in secret. Edith shook her head, lifting the cloth covering the child slightly, then said if the goal were simply to make the child disappear, they wouldn't have gone to such lengths. She clarified that His Majesty needed a plausible distraction for the public, which was why the child was necessary. The woman, confused, asked what she meant. Edith explained that their king had decided to marry a witch, and the child was meant to pacify any dissent by serving as a convenient public heir. Hearing this, the woman stood abruptly, summoning all her courage to say she couldn't believe it. Perhaps the king had such intentions now, but what about the future? She feared for her child Shiloh. Edith finally knew the boy's name for the first time. She shook her head and told the woman she didn't seem to understand her position. Stepping closer, Edith explained that she had only 2 options: either take a sum of money and flee far away, or go to Neverwinter with her child. However, if she chose the second option, she couldn't appear as Shiloh's mother but would instead take the role of a servant from a noble family. The woman understood that this was already a generous offer from the king but hesitated. She asked who would take care of Shiloh in her place. Edith replied, saying nobody. The woman was shocked, only to see Edith's gentle expression as she explained the king was not as heartless as she might think. If she chose to go to Neverwinter, she could stay by Shiloh's side and watch him grow. The noble family she would serve no longer existed, having been destroyed in a church attack. Before her death, the eldest prince Gerald's fiancée had entrusted the child to the maid. The woman stared at Edith in disbelief, wondering if the king had done all this just to ease her concerns. She took a deep breath and asked whether Shiloh had any chance of becoming king. Edith shook her head firmly and told her not to entertain such fantasies. Desperate for her son's safety, the woman pushed for a better answer. What would happen if the king changed his mind in the future and named a true heir? Wouldn't that heir see Shiloh as a threat and try to kill him? If Edith couldn't give her a reasonable answer, she declared, she'd rather die here than hand over her child. Edith's eyes narrowed, locking onto the woman. Though terrified, the woman refused to back down. She was almost certain Edith would kill her now, and in her heart, she apologized to Gerald, regretting that she wouldn't be able to raise their child. Edith lifted the woman's chin. She said something but didn't make a sound. However, the woman read her lips, which said immortality. And then, Edith informed her that they would depart in 3 days. The woman cradled her child, remembering how His Majesty had once helped her escape the clutches of the troublesome tavern owner. She told Edith that besides the tavern owner, one of Gerald's personal guards might also know about the child. Edith reassured her not to worry, promising to take care of it. Taking one last look at the woman, Edith mused that her swift decision to reveal potential threats to her and her child showed she had some decisiveness after all. Back at the castle, the Duke greeted Edith, noting she would only stay for 3 days. He questioned why, if this task required time to brew, she could have stayed longer. Edith's expression darkened, and she asked if her father had sent someone to spy on her conversations. The Duke avoided answering directly, knowing she wouldn't divulge much if he just asked. With a sigh, Edith remarked that her father had improved somewhat, making her less worried about him these days. The Duke, slightly annoyed, brought up the real reason why he was upset. He couldn't understand what was so captivating about this king that Edith would even consider taking Lance to Neverwinter. He sounded bitter as he mentioned that Roland would rather marry a witch than form a marriage alliance with their family. She could tell he was upset that she wouldn't ascend to the queen's position. She admitted that the current nobility was so lackluster that it was no surprise His Majesty wanted to dismantle the system. Still, she had her own reasons for wanting to return to Neverwinter quickly, which was remaining at the center of power. The Duke, however, worried that if Lance left, the northern region would lose its heir. Edith tells him that noble titles had become honorary, and taking Lance to Neverwinter would ensure the Kant family remained relevant. The world was evolving, and those who didn't adapt would be left behind. Despite all this, the Duke raised a final concern. Neverwinter's power might be growing, but what if the city failed to defend against the demons? Edith patted his shoulder with a calm smile, telling him that if Neverwinter fell, having heirs for him wouldn't matter. Leaving the conversation at that, she headed off for some much-needed rest. However, the Duke wanted to know what Edith had said to the woman. Edith, with a sly grin, thought to herself that she had deliberately spoken in silence, knowing her father would send someone to eavesdrop. But right now, she wouldn't reveal His Majesty's secrets to anyone, not even her father. Back in Neverwinter, Roland was juggling multiple tasks, including working with Anna on the internal combustion engine. Fortunately, he had wrapped up the day's work. Just as he was about to relax, Nightingale suddenly appeared behind him, telling him to stay still. He glanced back cautiously, thinking there might be enemies around. Nightingale, however, plucked a single gray hair from his head and smugly declared that he must not be getting enough rest if he was already graying before 30. Roland chuckled, recalling his past life. He reassured her that he hadn't reached his limit yet. If he ever did, there would be heart problems, and eventually even coughing up blood, but before he could finish, he began coughing violently. Startled, Nightingale asked if he was okay and if she should fetch Nanoa to check on him. Roland waved her off, explaining it was just a case of swallowing the wrong way. However, she still looked concerned. Turning to reassure her, he suddenly realized how close they were and froze for a moment. He gulped nervously, but the tension was abruptly broken when Wendy walked in. Nightingale vanished in an instant, leaving Roland to awkwardly face Wendy's puzzled expression. She asked if something was wrong. Nightingale reappeared nonchalantly on a nearby chair, munching on dried fish, and quipped that His Majesty was practicing gymnastics. Roland meanwhile awkwardly rotated his body a few times. Wendy proceeded to report that today was Lightning's coming-of-age day and everything had been arranged. Roland nodded in approval, reminding her to ensure everyone's safety and notify Margaret and of course Sandbirdman as well. As evening fell, everyone gathered. In her room, Lightning lay on her bed, clutching the divine seal in her hand. She wondered what kind of branch ability she might awaken. If it allowed her to solve her weight limit problem, then she'd be able to fly across the continent with all of her gear. Rem mumbled skeptically that awakening a branch ability wasn't that easy, only to receive a sharp glare from Lily. Scroll took the opportunity to ask Wendy about the analysis of coming-of-age evolutions. Wendy explained that it was only a reference and lacked sufficient data for verification, but noted that Lightning had scored impressively high on the evaluation. Phyllis shook her head in disbelief, remarking how unthinkable such discussions would have been during the Takira era. High-level evolution was considered sacred, and openly discussing it would not be allowed. She quickly added that she wasn't against it, but Roland understood where she was coming from. It's a different time now, and it's still a bit hard for her to process. Phyllis looked towards Agatha, who was sitting next to the bed, and admitted she wasn't as adaptable as her. Roland assured her that as they kept moving forward, such scenes would become more common, and he believed that was the essence of hope. Phyllis smiled and nodded. Leaving the room, Roland found Thunder standing in the hallway. He asked why he didn't go inside to check on Lightning. Thunder replied that he couldn't focus on pretending to be Sandbirdman right now. If he went in, she would notice something was off. Roland asked if he intended to keep hiding the truth. Lightning, after all, was destined to follow the path of a great explorer. Thunder didn't answer directly. Instead, he said that someone had once told him exceptional people often fell victim to their extraordinary talents, while those with average abilities tended to live longer. When Roland asked who had said that, Thunder revealed it was Sand, the man who had introduced him to the path of exploration. Roland was surprised to hear there was actually a person named Sand in the fjords and worried that Lightning might have heard of him. Thunder explained that Sand was pretty much unknown and died saving him from a sea monster attack. Sand had said his only gift was kindness, and it was that very kindness that led to his death. That memory was why Thunder had resolved to map the unknown lands before Lightning officially embraced the explorer's life. If there were no more uncharted places, there would be no dangers for her to face. Roland finally understood that Thunder believed that eliminating the need for exploration would keep Lightning safe. Roland promised that after the Divine War, he would ensure Lightning returned to him unharmed. Thunder bowed deeply, expressing his gratitude. Just then, Wendy announced that Lightning's magic had condensed. Roland rushed back inside and asked if she felt any discomfort. The seal in her hands began to glow, and a surge of power radiated through her body. Though she didn't fully activate it, she did manage to light up the fourth magic stone. Roland wanted her to rest, but Lightning suddenly sat up, saying she couldn't wait to test it, saying she could hear something calling for her. Reluctantly, Roland allowed her to try but insisted she take Maisie and not fly too far. Lightning flew out, while Wendy and Roland wondered what Lightning's ability could be. Suddenly, the sky erupted with a thunderous boom. A blinding light illuminated the entire castle, followed by a powerful shockwave that shattered the windows. The next morning, Roland learned that some residents had been injured the previous night. A group of concerned citizens arrived at City Hall early, anxiously asking if Neverwinter had been attacked by demons. The entire city was abuzz, with a large crowd gathering in the square, waiting for an announcement. Roland sighed as Berev explained everything, saying that next time they should give him a heads up before any surprises. Trying to calm the situation, Roland directed that the announcement should state he was conducting experiments on a new weapon and that medical expenses for the injured would be covered by City Hall. After hanging up, he turned his attention to the girl, who stood by his desk with her head drooping in guilt. He asked if she had overheard the call. Trembling, Lightning admitted her mistake and said she should receive her punishment. Roland then glanced at Maisie perched on her head, who awkwardly turned away, pretending it had nothing to do with her. The room fell into silence for a moment before Roland chuckled, saying Lightning couldn't have anticipated such an outcome. Thankfully, the injuries were minor, and the damages weren't too severe, and he had no plan to punish her. Lightning, overjoyed, lunged toward Roland in gratitude. Roland, however, stopped her midair, reminding her she only lasted a few minutes while on her high-speed flight. It turned out Lightning had been testing her limits with the new ability, but her magic quickly ran out, causing her to pass out and plummet. Agatha and Wendy joined the conversation, jotting down observations and asking Lightning questions. Roland inquired about her new branch ability and whether there were any records of it in the Federation era. Agatha speculated it might be magic resonance, a branch ability often appearing in witches whose primary abilities carried inherent risks to their own bodies. Lightning excitedly asked if her magic could continue growing through practice, with no ceiling to her potential. Just thinking about pushing her limits thrilled her. Wendy chuckled and reminded her not to speed up suddenly over the castle next time and to save her magic as they still needed to conduct some tests. Lightning cheekily hugged Wendy, promising to behave. Looking at her, Roland suddenly asked her what would she do if there were no unexplored places left to adventure. Lightning hadn't considered the idea but quickly replied that if every continent and ocean had been mapped, she would still have the skies to explore. To her, this was a place only she could reach. Roland smiled and mused in his heart that her adventurous spirit clearly ran in the family. With everything that was happening today, Roland decided it was time to establish a new department in City Hall dedicated to giving out information. Announcements would no longer be limited to the Central Square Bulletin Board, and the department would handle news across all regions of the kingdom. Nightingale asked how citizens would stay informed without the square's announcements. Roland grinned and introduced the concept of a newspaper, pulling out a sample. With education spreading, and paper, printing, and ink issues resolved thanks to the witches, reliable communication was now possible. He noted that if rumors were allowed to spread unchecked, reining them in later would be a challenge. Wendy grasped the importance of the initiative, pointing out that witches could play a vital role. They could quickly detect events and report them faster than anyone else. And all Roland needed was someone that could run really fast. Roland clarified that he needed reporters who could identify newsworthy incidents and deploy others to cover them. Not necessarily someone who can run really fast. Wendy immediately suggested Honey for the job. Honey arrived shortly and was happy to be called over. However, the first thing she did was to inspect Roland's desk, running her fingers over it, and was a bit upset seeing it was just an ordinary desk after all. Roland, confused, asked what she meant. Honey explained that while training her owls, one of them mentioned that Nightingale spent long hours leaning against this desk every night. Nightingale, blushing furiously, rushed over to deny it, claiming the owl must have been mistaken in the dark. Honey persisted, saying owls had excellent night vision and couldn't possibly be wrong, but before she could continue, Nightingale flashed across the room and clamped her hand over Honey's mouth. Roland laughed at the exchange and, seeing Honey's enthusiasm, entrusted her with the new department. He then chuckled to himself, confident that with her around, the gossip column would never run out of stories. Meanwhile, inside a tavern, Victor sat at his own booth, looking deep in thought. Apparently, the Western territories will no longer sell raw gemstones to outsiders. This meant his jewelry business would have no market in Neverwinter, and if a jeweler couldn't sell jewelry, what was he supposed to do since opportunities weren't exactly falling from the sky? Just then, a commotion outside caught his attention. People were shouting, urging someone to read something out loud. Curious, Victor rang the bell on the wall, and a maid walked in. When he asked what was going on, she explained that everyone was talking about a newspaper, something the king had introduced to replace the public announcement boards. She even apologized if the noise was bothering him. Victor had never heard of such a thing before. Without wasting a second, he sent the girl to buy a copy. Minutes later, he was holding one in his hands. The paper felt cheap, made from rough, grayish straw pulp. He learned these were usually published weekly, which meant news would spread faster. It had all sorts of content and was affordable, no wonder it's selling so well. Flipping through the pages, he came across an advertisement for something called Magic Shadow. He wondered if it was a new kind of play. When he asked, the girl mentioned that it was a fresh type of performance, apparently so unique that a special venue had to be built just to showcase it. That was enough to get Victor moving. Throwing on his coat, he tells the girl to take him there immediately. By the time they arrived at the theater, a long line had already formed. People were anxiously waiting to buy tickets, clearly afraid they'd sell out. A colorful poster stood beside the entrance, catching everyone's attention. May and Carter were also among the crowd. May suddenly nudged Carter, pointing excitedly at someone, and asked if that was Master Karjan. Carter took a look and said it was definitely him. Without hesitation, they rushed toward him, dragging Eileen and the rest of the group along. Hearing that this was the famous playwright behind the prince's search for love, which made everyone excited. But when May called out to him, Karjan didn't even turn his head. Instead, the man beside him shot a glance their way before attempting to leave. Before they could process what was happening, someone in the crowd recognized May and the rest of their troupe. It was then the man spoke up and said he apologized, but Master Karjan wasn't interested in talking to them nor had any intention of meeting them, saying it was best if they just left. May quickly tried to explain that she had once received Karjan's guidance back in the old royal capital, but the man replied that's exactly why Karjan didn't want to see her, because he was disappointed. Everyone including May was stunned, wondering what was going on. May herself hadn't expected this, but something felt off. Maybe there was a misunderstanding? She then insisted she wanted to talk to Karjan face to face. The man looked like he was about to refuse again, but then Karjan finally spoke, saying he agreed to talk. Following the man upstairs, she stepped into a room where Karjan and several others stood. The atmosphere was tense. A group of girls cold looks her way, and for some reason, they are all looking annoyed. Suddenly, Karjan picked up a script and went straight to the point. Lady Lannis, he said, flipping through the pages. Could I ask you and your troupe to cancel your next performance? That caught May completely off guard. Magic Shadow was already finished, it didn't even require live actors on stage. Why was he asking this? One of the girls smirked as if already guessing May's answer. She muttered that their teacher was wasting his time and she believed there was no way May would back down. After all, wasn't she the one who had made this whole thing happen? Another chimed in, saying their teacher had clearly misjudged her. They had once thought she had simply lost her way and abandoned the pursuit of true theater. But now she had gone too far. And then, someone else took it a step further. With a sharp tone, she sneered that as the wife of the kingdom's chief knight, May had all the power she needed to shut down her competitors. Otherwise, why would King Roland himself refuse to give them a single chance to perform? Karjan held up his hand, saying he didn't want them arguing over this. However, May could tell where this was going and quickly spoke up, assuring him she hadn't done anything to undermine him or make the officials push his troop out. Karjan walked over to her, and with a sigh said that the reason he wanted to speak with her was because he believed she hadn't done that. But his disappointment in her wasn't about that. He paused for a moment and then asked how many plays she had performed in over the last 2 years. May thought for a second, guessing around 7 or 8. Karjan corrected her, saying it was 12. He then named each one of them, one by one. He went on to remind her that it took her 8 months and practiced diligently to get the prince's search for love ready, yet she had done 12 plays in 2 years. Was she really happy with how she performed them? May had no idea Karjan knew so much about her work. But Karjan wasn't done yet and he continued, telling her he didn't understand why she had left Changji stronghold to come to the border town and start doing these mixed performances. In his eyes, it looked like she had chosen to cater to the masses instead of striving for better acting. And it's because of all this, he was disappointed. For a moment, May didn't know how to respond. She understood that Karjan had a pure, unwavering love for theater. People say he lived and breathed the craft, believing every detail should be flawless. But as she thought back to her time in Changji, and compared it to now in the border town, something felt different. Was it the plays? Or was it the people she was performing in front of? Then, she remembered the genuine smiles and laughter from the town folk and that one girl who had handed her the salted fish whose father passed away during battle. That moment hit her, and everything clicked. She looked at Karjan and asked if he prepared his performance just for the king. Karjan nodded, adding that it was also for the visiting nobles, ministers, and lords. He believed that without the right audience, even the most brilliant performance was pointless. By then, May is more determined than ever. She shook her head and said if that was the case, then she would not agree with his request, because Karjan wasn't performing for the love of the theater anymore and his play would certainly not be as brilliant as he claimed. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at May in disbelief. How could she dismiss Karjan's work without even seeing it? May simply said she didn't need to see it because she already knew exactly what kind of performance they had created. Looking at everyone in the room, she firmly told them that a perfect play shouldn't exist only for nobles to enjoy. It had the power to carry so much more. She tells them the witch's diary had given people a chance to understand witches beyond fear and superstition. Dawn had inspired commoners to take their fate into their own hands. New City helped new residents of Neverwinter connect and integrate. And a hero's life gave hope to those who had lost loved ones in war. Karjan had once told her that the greatest plays allow audiences to immerse themselves in the lives of their characters. But May had realized something more. She wanted people to see their own futures, not just someone else's story. Maybe Karjan's play, which she had spent 2 years preparing, would be brilliant in a way. But the upcoming Wolfheart's Tale would be just as extraordinary. She was certain that if Karjan watched it, he would change his mind. And if he didn't, then she would personally recommend his play to the king. With that, she turned and left. Karjan stood there in silence for a moment before instructing his steward to buy tickets for Wolfheart's Tale. A few days later, they entered the theater. Many in the audience recognized members of Karjan's troupe. One of the girls turned to Karjan and asked if they really going to watch this. They suspected May was just trying to use their teacher's reputation to boost her own fame. Another asked if, after the show, would May actually recommend Karjan's play to the king. The first girl scoffed, saying there's no way that's happening. Karjan told them to stop talking. Although he didn't agree with May's views, and he doubted that a group of amateurs could produce anything truly great, but he needed to judge it for himself. By now, the theater was packed. The lights dimmed, and a large screen stood before them. Then, a voice echoed through the hall, welcoming them to Greycastle's Magic Shadow Theater. It assured the audience that they were about to witness something never seen before and urged them not to panic, no matter what happened next. One of the girls rolled her eyes, but before she could scoff again, the room plunged into total darkness. Karjan tensed up because it was pitch black, so dark that he couldn't even see the chair he was sitting on. A murmur of unease spread through the audience. Then, suddenly, a soft glow appeared above them, and with it came the sound of wind. A gust swept through the theater, and tiny snowflakes began to fall. Karjan wondered if this was a play or if it was real. His grip tightened on the armrest. Shortly after, the screen lit up. A voice rang out, narrating, "In the distant north, there lies a city in the mountains, home to 2 lively young princesses. And our story begins here." With every new scene, the audience gasped. The transitions, the visuals, the sound, it was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. Karjan found himself completely absorbed. At that moment, he knew this was more than just a play. This was something that surpassed the art of their time. He had no idea how much time had passed when the light suddenly came back on. By now even the girl who had been skeptical at first had tears in her eyes. She turned to look at Karjan, but he just sat there. After a long silence, he let out a sigh and admitted the truth, saying they had lost. Everything he had learned, everything he had built over the decades, it had all been overturned in a single night. Magic theater had broken every rule of traditional theater and left them in the dust. Tears streamed down the girl's face, and although she didn't want to accept it, she had no choice because their teacher was totally right. Karjan, however, told her not to cry, saying they hadn't chosen the wrong path. The greatest flaw in live theater had always been distance, referring to the space between the audience and the stage. That gap often prevented people from seeing the actors' subtle expressions, losing the depth of their performances. But magic theater had erased that flaw entirely. And now, acting skills have become even more important than before. He believed this was only a temporary defeat and their efforts hadn't been wasted. If they could understand the true nature of how this worked, they could still compete. Then, suddenly, Karjan stood up. He turned to his troupe and told them to stop crying. Instead, they should stand tall and applaud for this magnificent performance. One by one, his students followed suit, clapping. Soon, the entire theater erupted in thunderous applause. Back at the castle, the buzz around magic theater was exactly what Roland had expected. The show had caused a massive stir, though a few incidents had popped up. Some audience got so scared they bolted mid-performance that a few even fainted. Thank goodness there's no stampede. Meanwhile, Barav stood in front of him, holding a thick stack of merchant applications. Roland barely glanced up, casually mentioning they weren't looking for sponsors just yet. But Barav shook his head, saying they were after popcorn and also the milk packaging. Roland was surprised, thinking those merchants certainly had sharp eyes. Too bad there wasn't enough milk packaging to sell yet. These were just the first results of the rubber bug farming project, but once production ramped up, then they could really start doing something. Just then, Edith walked in, bringing Olivia, who looked a little nervous. Roland gave her a reassuring smile, telling her this place was much warmer than Coldwind Ridge and far more peaceful. No one would bother her here, and he was sure she'd eventually like the place. He told her to rest for now and someone would show her to her quarters. Olivia gave a small nod before following Edith out. Roland turned back to work, but before he could get anything done, Barav interrupted again. Now that the matter of succession was settled, it was time to take care of something else. Roland asked what is he talking about, in which Barav reminded him about his coronation. Fast forward, a week later, the castle courtyard was packed. Nobles, ministers, and honored guests gathered below, waiting for Roland to appear. Inside, Roland stood in front of a mirror, dressed in full ceremonial attire. He adjusted his cuffs before turning to Anna, who was standing nearby in a flowing white gown. However, she looked nervous. Glancing out the window at the red carpet and the massive crowd, she hesitated, saying witches had never been part of a coronation before, and asked Roland if he was really okay bringing her up there with him. Roland took her hand, grinning, saying if that was the case, then he'd be the first to break the rule. With a playful look, he asked, "Or, do you want me to crown myself alone?" Anna froze for a second before quickly shaking her head. Still holding her hand, Roland took a step back. Then, before she could react, he dropped to one knee. "Miss Anna," he said with a smile, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Anna, of course, happily agreed. Moments later, they walked down the grand staircase together, and immediately the room fell silent. On one side stood the witches. On the other, the nobles and ministers. Familiar faces filled the hall and memories flooded in, and it had taken them 3 years to reach this moment. At the center of the hall, 2 golden crowns rested on a round table. Normally, a coronation was long and quite complicated, but Roland had no patience for all that, so he kept it simple. Anna picked up the oversized king's crown and gently placed it on Roland's head. Then, our boy lifted the second crown and carefully set it upon her head. When they turned to face the crowd, the entire room dropped to one knee. A powerful voice echoed through the hall, all of them chanting, "Long live the king." Hand in hand, Roland and Anna stepped forward, walking past the kneeling crowd toward the staircase that led to the castle's balcony. Beyond the grand arches, the people of Neverwinter had gathered, filling the city square. As Roland and Anna stepped out, the crowd erupted, all screaming at the top of their lungs, "Long live King Roland." The cheers were deafening, rising to the skies. Roland and Anna raised their hands, greeting their people as the news quickly spread through the kingdom. The whole city of Neverwinter burst into celebration as Roland officially took the throne. The streets were filled with free food, and the festive energy was impossible to miss. Up on the castle, our boy and Anna stood together. With a gentle touch, Roland removed the ceremonial crown from her head, his fingers brushing through her hair as their eyes met. Anna wanted to hear him say her name. Roland obliged, calling her Anna, but she shook her head, clearly expecting more. Amused, he repeated, this time with her full name, Anna Wimbledon. She still wasn't satisfied. With a playful pout, she insisted he say it again, then again, even wanting him to say it 10 times in a row. Roland chuckled, saying he'd call her name as many times as she wanted. With that, he pulled her into his arm, sealing the moment with a kiss. After a while, Anna then said she wanted to take charge of the Ministry of Industry. Roland had no objections, but he was curious about the sudden decision. She told him she didn't want to just stand in his shadow, lost in her own world of inventions. She wanted to prove she could stand on her own. Roland smiled, then swept her into his arms. "As you wish, my dear," he said, then carried her onto the bed. Then Anna suddenly asked if hadn't he always been curious about what she and Nightingale had talked about that night. Roland was intrigued but never pushed her for answers. Anna simply smiled and said she and Nightingale had made a promise. And now, that promise had been fulfilled. As the lights in the room dimmed, "Well, I know y'all aren't interested in what happens next, so let's just fast forward." A few days later in the city of Dawn, a young boy weaved through the streets selling newspapers. And the Grey Castle King's latest invention had caught the attention of curious passers-by. Meanwhile, in the castle, Quinn, who's now the king, leaned back in his chair while reading the newspaper. He was astonished at how quickly things had changed. Just 3 years ago, Roland had been nothing more than a lord ruling over a remote border town. Now, he was a king with undeniable influence. But men like him only rose to power in times of chaos, and perhaps the world was on the brink of a major change. A minister entered, handing him a letter from Hill. It seemed a Grey Castle mining team had crossed into Dawn's territory, requesting their assistance. Without hesitation, Quinn ordered the message to be sent to Count Rossi and instructed the Night Order to meet the team. He also gave orders to every lord along the way to offer them whatever help they needed. Meanwhile, in an open-air tavern, the locals gathered, listening to the owner's wild tales. He swore he had seen flying demons and normal demons that looked almost human. Their spears could pierce armor like it was nothing. Most people laughed, dismissing his stories, saying he probably couldn't tell the difference between a demonic beast and a real demon. And if these creatures were as terrifying as he claimed, how had Grey Castle managed to hold them off? Nearby, 2 cloaked figures passing by caught snippets of the conversation. The tavern owner, eager to convince his audience, began describing how the city walls had lit up with fire and lightning, blasting the demons to pieces. The crowd, initially skeptical, began to believe him. Someone even commented that if this was true, then the prince must be as powerful as a god. Another chimed in, saying it made sense after all. The prince had even managed to take down the church. At that moment, one of the cloaked girls, Farina, clenched her fists. Ever since the acting pope had died, she had been leading the remaining judgment army, trying to rebuild the church from the shadows. But once they arrived here, the bishop had betrayed them upon hearing Hermes had fallen. He had seized power for himself, declared himself a noble, and even executed their messengers. Now, they were forced into hiding, but she wasn't about to give up, believing they can one day turn things around. With a quiet sigh, she and her companion continued walking. Behind them, the tavern owner began talking about the massive iron warships, towering buildings, and the latest newspaper announcing that the Prince of Grey Castle had officially become king. The people in the tavern raised their mugs in celebration of the new Grey Castle king. Only Farina, her face dark with frustration, muttered under her breath, "King of Grey Castle? So what? The Battle of Divine Will is coming, and this world will be nothing but ruins. Sooner or later, we'll meet again, this time, in the depths of true hell." Farina clasped her hands together, silently waiting for the day Roland would fall into hell. My goodness, does she even know what she's talking about? Man, I'm sure when the time comes, they will end up begging Roland to save them. But that was a thought for another time. Back to Grey Castle. In the grand meeting hall, Roland looked over the gathered officials and offered his congratulations. Everyone in the room had been personally invited, which meant they were now part of the kingdom's ruling elite. For the next few decades, they would govern Grey Castle alongside him. Barav was the first to rise, declaring that serving Roland was an honor. Roland nodded with a smile but made it clear that he had something important to say before they moved forward. The reason he had abolished the noble status was to ensure that capable individuals took charge, not to replace one aristocracy with another. He didn't want to see those present turning into a new class of the same old nobles. Scanning the room, he reminded them that no one could guarantee a person would always be fit for their role. Simply gaining entry into the central administration wasn't the end, rather just the beginning. Every year, their performance would be evaluated. Whether they climbed higher or stagnated would depend entirely on their performance and what the people think of them. Barav was quick to ask who would be responsible for these evaluations. Roland said he would personally evaluate everyone. He gave everyone one last chance. Before the new appointments were announced, they could still walk away. Anyone who chose to leave would receive a generous sum of gold as compensation. But for those who stayed, he expected them to shoulder the weight of responsibility and duty. Silence fell over the hall, but no one left. Roland was satisfied. Without wasting time, he began issuing the official appointments. Barav was named Hand of the King, responsible for overseeing the treasury while coordinating the various departments. A new department, the General Staff, was placed under the command of Edith, who would be in charge of all strategic planning. And soon every position was assigned. Back in his office, Nightingale poured him a cup of hot tea. The fragrant steam curled into the air as Roland lifted the cup, suddenly lost in thought. His gaze lingered on Nightingale for a moment longer than usual, which didn't go unnoticed. She raised an eyebrow, then smirked. Was there something particularly dazzling about her today? Roland caught off guard and awkwardly said yes, but also no. His words tangled, making him sound even more flustered. Nightingale chuckled and teased him. Stepping closer, she playfully pressed him for an answer. Was it yes or no? Before he could say another word, she disappeared into the mist, vanishing from sight. Once again, she had tricked him. But this also made him happy because that was the exact Nightingale he knew from the very beginning. Meanwhile, deep in the wilderness, lightning carried Maisie as they soared through the sky. They were now less than 100 kilometers from the ruins of Takira, and they were about to give the demons a little surprise. Once they got near, right below them were demonic beasts and demons locked in a ferocious battle. Both girls exchanged puzzled glances. No wonder Neverwinter had been so peaceful this month of the demon. Clearly whatever was happening here was keeping the enemy busy. Lightning found the situation strange. Demonic beasts always followed the scent of the divine relics. It didn't make sense for the demons to carry relics into this barren wasteland. There had to be another reason. Too bad Sylvie wasn't around to help figure it out. Maisie, flapping beside her, asked if they were still going to give the demon their surprise. Lightning grinned and said of course. A crackling sound filled the sky as electricity surged around her. Then, with a sonic boom, she vanished. The demons instinctively looked up, searching for the source, but before they could react, lightning had already taken down one of them. In the blink of an eye, the second one fell. But then, she froze. Because not far from her stood a tall demon. Other than the blue skin, everything else about him looked unsettlingly human. For some reason, he could keep up with her speed, and the moment their eyes met, an overwhelming sense of dread gripped her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. It was as if something had taken control of her, locking her in place. The demon slowly raised a hand, dark energy swirling at his fingertips, aiming directly at her. Maisie, acting fast, pecked Lightning hard on the chest, so hard it stung a little. But it worked. The pain snapped Lightning out of it, and she instantly pulled back. She didn't know what that thing was, but one thing was certain: His Majesty had to know about it. Without wasting another second, she turned and bolted, flying at full speed toward Neverwinter. Meanwhile, in Neverwinter, Roland sat in his office, looking over 2 letters sent to the city hall. The first was from Karjan, a renowned playwright from the old royal capital. Barav explained that Karjan had arrived in Neverwinter with his theater troupe, hoping to present a special performance for Roland's coronation. But Roland had already declined his request earlier. And this time, Karjan wanted to learn how magic shadow was made. Roland skimmed through the letter before telling Barav he would reply to Karjan personally. The second letter came from a merchant named Victor, who was looking to purchase cotton. Roland raised an eyebrow and said Neverwinter doesn't produce cotton. Barav replied Victor was fully aware of that, but what he wanted was to ask to work with Lady Leaf from the Witch Union. Roland wasn't surprised Victor had heard of Leaf. After all, her story had been published in the Witch's Diaries series as a comic strip, so it wasn't unusual for an outsider to know about her. But this was the first time a merchant had directly reached out to partner with a witch. Curious, Roland ordered Victor to be brought to the castle for a private discussion. Victor wasted no time. Dressed formally, he introduced himself with a respectful bow before Roland nodded and got straight to the point. Victor wanted to work with Leaf to develop high-yield cotton seeds. His ultimate plan was to establish a brand new clothing industry, one that could expand across the entire kingdom. Roland listened with interest as Victor eagerly explained himself. If Lady Leaf could triple the wheat yield, creating the second-generation golden wheat, then she could surely do the same for cotton. With more cotton yield, fabric production costs would drop, making clothes much more affordable. And that wasn't all. Victor went on to explain that his plan would save Roland a fortune in upfront investment, and his factory would create jobs for over 2,000 workers, and require zero effort from the kingdom's administration since he would handle everything himself. Roland was a little surprised because Victor had pieced all of this new vocabulary together just from reading newspapers and public announcements. Now genuinely interested, he asked Victor to elaborate. Victor enthusiastically laid out his entire business model, how efficient spinning tools could handle the increase in cotton, how his family already had a network of skilled tailors, and how they had the experience to make this work. Roland stayed quiet, thinking it over. Victor mistook the silence for hesitation and quickly offered to explain it all again, just in case something wasn't clear. Roland waved a hand, signaling that wasn't necessary. Instead, he leaned back, a smirk forming at the corner of his lips. This was actually a very interesting proposal. Then, getting to the heart of the matter, he asked, "How long will it take to secure the necessary funds?" Victor could barely hide his excitement. He bowed deeply, before saying with all due respect, if Roland had been a merchant, he would have stood at the top of any merchant guild. Either way, Roland hadn't even started using investment strategies, yet opportunities were already arriving at his doorstep. This might just be the perfect chance to push for a thriving economy. Their discussion stretched until sunset, with Roland personally walking Victor to the gates and shaking his hand. Before parting, he made one thing clear: if other merchants wanted to follow Victor's model, the city hall would sell them the same seeds at the same price. A competitive market meant lower prices, and he expected Victor to understand that better than anyone. Rather than looking worried, Victor's confidence only grew. He made it clear, saying Dawn's merchants had never feared competition. Roland liked the response, thinking this man was definitely interesting. As he stretched his shoulders and made his way back inside, he couldn't shake the thought that, with people like Victor around, the rise of private enterprise was just beginning. Just then, Nightingale appeared, looking nervous. Sylvie's urgent message had just come through saying Lightning had returned, brought back by Maisie, and had been taken straight to the medical center. Without hesitation, Roland rushed over. Inside, Lightning lay on the bed, not in the best shape. Nanawa had already tried healing her, but the injury just won't heal. Maisie stood beside the bed, looking distraught, while Nightingale carefully pulled back Lightning's shirt. The injury was barely more than a small mark on her chest, something that should have been easily healed. Yet no matter how much magic Nanawa used, the wound just won't heal. It was as if her power had been rendered useless. One statement from Nanawa made Roland freeze on the spot. After comforting Nanawa, he turned his attention to Maisie, wondering if they were attacked by high-ranking demons. However, Maisie looked like she was blaming herself and revealed it was she who pecked Lightning. With some encouragement, Maisie hesitantly recounted the entire incident. She started off with the strange battle between demonic beasts and demons. Then Lightning used her ability to get rid of some demons. However, they encountered a demon looking entirely human except for his deep blue skin. The weirdest part was the demon able to keep up with Lightning's every move. And in the instant they locked gazes, Lightning had completely frozen in place. Maisie did the only thing she could, so she pecked Lightning to wake her up. After hearing the whole story, Roland can no longer bring himself to blame the girls for putting themselves in danger. He quickly asked Nightingale to call Wendy, Lily, Agatha, and Nightfall over. He believed it wasn't Maisie's fault for the wound to not heal. Thus they need to figure out what happened with Lightning. As everyone gathered, all eyes turned to Lightning. She had finally woken up, looking a little dazed but otherwise fine. After a thorough checkup, Agatha confirmed that she was physically fine but suffered extreme fatigue from the prolonged flight. Even Nightfall's abilities backed up the same conclusion. But what about the wound? Agatha explained that the problem wasn't the injury but something more complicated. Somehow, Lightning's magic had been tainted or perhaps corrupted, even without any direct contact. Nightingale found that hard to believe. If Lightning had been affected by demonic energy, she would have noticed immediately. Agatha, however, pointed out that the corruption was subtle, almost microscopic, compared to Lightning's own magic. It's too small to detect at a glance. It was the balance magic stone that had sensed something was off. Whether it was true corruption or something else was still uncertain. Roland took a moment to process this. Demons had never shown this kind of ability before. Agatha explained that while magic affecting others existed, however, preventing a wound from healing was unheard of. But if that's the case, then things would make sense. Normally, the power of the God Punishment Stone would cleanse such corruption, but clearly, this wasn't a simple case. Roland wanted a solution. Unfortunately, there is none, at least for now. The best course of action was to take Lightning to the third border town for observation. Perhaps Pasha might have more insight. With a sigh, Roland nodded. Walking over to Lightning, he saw her lower her head, looking quite guilty. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. She almost broke into tears as she apologized. Roland simply reached out, resting a hand on her head. He offered her reassurance and then tells her that she would be fine, he would make sure of it. Lightning looked at Roland for a moment before giving a small smile and nodding. After arriving at the third border town, Roland wasted no time checking on her condition. Pasha reassured him, saying Lightning had recovered significantly. With Eleanor by her side these past few days, she had been distracted enough to momentarily forget about her encounter with the high-ranking demon. But there was still the bigger question: what exactly had affected her? Wendy asked if they had found anything, but the answer was disappointing. No records in their archives matched this phenomenon, but Pasha had a theory. If it wasn't documented, then perhaps it was something entirely new, maybe an ability that demons had only recently developed. That said, similar effects did exist, and the consequences were concerning. Pasha's expression darkened, and she believed this might actually be a curse. Leading the group deeper into a cave stacked with books and old scrolls, she pulled one out, dusting it off before handing it to Roland. He scanned the pages: descriptions of wounds that refused to heal, victims weakened by gradual blood loss, and traces of foreign magic lingering in their bodies. If this case followed the same pattern, conventional treatments wouldn't work, and removing it through external means would be nearly impossible. But Nightingale believed there gotta be a way to remove the curse. Pasha turned the page and continued explaining. The records told the story of a witch named Samanja, who had faced a similar predicament. In a desperate final stand, she became a transcendent witch and split the high-ranking demon in half. While her allies had succumbed to the curse, she, against all odds, somehow survived. Seems like if lightning had truly been afflicted by such a curse, there was only one solution, which was to kill the demon responsible. Pasha acknowledged the difficulty of such a task. Nightingale, silent until now, clenched her fists. Roland took a deep breath, then snapped the book shut. It wouldn't be easy, but there was no way he was giving up. Then another thought crossed his mind. If this demon could inflict such a curse without direct contact, what would happen to ordinary people who got caught by it? Pasha believed it would only be much worse. Since mortals are much more fragile, not only will their wounds not heal, but they will likely get worse over time. The inevitable result would just be death. Roland then asked if the god punishment stone countered this ability. Pasha hesitated before answering, saying it could, however, only to an extent. But if they are talking about a magic slayer, the stone's effect might be far less reliable. Meanwhile, in the other room, Lightning slowly opened her eyes. She curled up in a corner, hugging her knees tightly. She was scared and uncertain about her future. In a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke to the silence. "Father, what should I do?" As the scene shifts, a royal guard approaches and reports that everything is ready. But instead of stepping forward himself, Roland gestured toward Anna. Today, he announced, the person in charge would be the Minister of Engineering. The guard hesitated for a moment, then addressed Anna formally as Her Majesty, the Queen. Anna stepped forward, her voice steady as she gave the order to begin the test. On the tracks stood not only a train but also the new artillery piece. The sound of gears grinding against each other filled the air as the mechanism activated. Watching all this, Axe gulped. To him, this very weapon looked so much like the demon they saw the other day. Just then everyone heard a loud explosion. The cannon roared, sending a shell hurtling through the air. The shockwave rippled across the gathered crowd, leaving them momentarily stunned. Roland and Anna, however, looked pleased, seeing the test going very well. Edith, on the other hand, was practically beaming. With this, she pointed out, the biggest missing piece of their plan to attack Takira ruins was now complete. The only thing left was the name. Roland then smiled, calling it Black River. Edith caught on to the name, saying it mirrored the red mist that fueled their enemies. Roland confirmed it with a nod. The red mist was the demon's lifeline, but now, they would have a lifeline of their own. The scene then shifts to Neverwinter. A voice called out, telling Buggy and Good it was time to head out. Buggy quickly wiped his mouth, set down his plate, and hurried to get ready. Good meanwhile pulled on his coat, and the girl in the room asked him if he really didn't need her to come along. Good tells her that she's too young and they have already had this conversation countless times. She pouted, but Good cut her off. He knew she was about to bring up her time in Wolfheart again. And no, he wasn't about to let her keep doing what she had done before. Before leaving, he warned her not to wander off. Then, with a grin, he promised to bring back some crispy egg pancakes for her. With that, he rushed downstairs, joining Buggy and another boy. The three set off together, discussing what job they'd be looking to today, maybe clearing snow, breaking ice, or really anything to keep busy. The boy turned to Buggy, asking what he was planning to do. Buggy said he wasn't here to work, just tagging along. But that wasn't entirely true. He had actually caught the attention of the foreman from Engineering Team 6. In just a few days, he'd be signing a contract. Formal recruitment meant double pay, meaning it was more than enough to start saving for a down payment. After he got his ID, he'd officially become a resident of Neverwinter. Excitement was building as they made their way into the city center. That's when they noticed a large crowd gathered around a tent. It looked like some sort of recruitment. A man with a loudspeaker was calling out to the crowd, explaining that they were looking for able-bodied men. Since literacy and ID were not required, all they need is to pass the physical test to get in. The crowd fell silent for a moment. This was unexpected because army requirements had always been limited to official residents. So why had that rule suddenly changed? Good's heart skipped a beat. Joining the First Army meant a lifetime of security, food, clothing, shelter, everything taken care of. Even in death, his family would be greatly compensated. To him, this was a guaranteed future. But Buggy had already made a promise to the foreman. Good nodded in understanding, then pushed his way into the crowd. The younger boy hesitated, unsure of what to do. Buggy gave him a firm pat on the shoulder, telling him this wasn't his time anymore, this was for the younger generation. He told the boy to go. The boy clenched his fists, made up his mind, and followed. After registering, they got in line. Neither had any idea what the test would be, but Good was confident, and if it was a physical test, he had nothing to worry about. Then they heard the scream. A sharp, gut-wrenching wail from inside the tent sent a shiver down their spines. The boy froze, wondering if they were testing pain tolerance. Good quickly shook his head. If it were torture, the screams would have been more spaced out. Then they heard people throwing up. The two looked at each other, neither of them wanted to go inside anymore. When the first batch of recruits stumbled out, hardly any of them could stand properly. Good then did a quick count. It seemed like 9 out of 10 had failed. But what stood out the most was how weak they looked. Their legs shook, and their balance was gone, yet these were strong and healthy men just minutes ago. Soon their names were called. A military officer stood before them, barely sparing a glance as he introduced himself, not by name, but simply as the examiner. No point in names, he explained, because most of them wouldn't make it past today, anyway. Even for those who passed, this was only the first step. By now, most of them had realized this wasn't recruitment for the First Army but probably the Second Army or possibly a new reserve force. But Good didn't care. As long as the pay could provide a better life for him and Rachel, he was willing to take the risk. The rules were announced, and they were quite simple. They had to place both feet on a pedal and sit still for 5 minutes. No matter what happened, no matter what they saw, they weren't allowed to fall off the chair. It sounded too easy. Then the curtains closed, the room went black, and soon they saw a flash. The next thing Good knew, he was floating. Or at least, that's what it felt like. His stomach dropped, and his limbs flailed for balance. Panic surged through his body before his mind caught up. He quickly realized he was still sitting, and this was an illusion. But damn if it didn't feel real. He gritted his teeth, repeating to himself, "Stay calm, stay seated." Then, Rachel's face flashed in his mind. That moment when she had looked at him with trust. He latched onto that thought like a lifeline, anchoring himself against the overwhelming sensation of weightlessness. He vowed to himself that he would never allow Rachel to return to her old life. Minutes later, the illusion disappeared. Applause broke through the silence. When the first test was over, those who remained were congratulated, but they were also warned that there was a long way to go. He exhaled shakily, only now realizing he was drenched in sweat. His hands trembled, thinking that was just the first test. He could barely believe he had made it through, because sitting here was already a blessing. Good glanced around, but his buddy was already gone. Did he fall off in fear, or had someone knocked him over? The remaining recruits were led into another room, where they were instructed to take their seats. The only requirement this time was to stay put. Then the button was pressed. The moment the machine activated, Good felt himself spinning. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. Soon, the world blurred, the faces of the examiners vanishing into streaks of motion. His stomach churned and his head felt like it was being tossed in all directions. This made him wonder if they were trying to recruit monsters for the army. Just as he reached the verge of blacking out, the machine came to a stop. Once again, he heard people clapping. After a few more tests, it was finally over. Apparently, they had passed the initial selection. But there was still something the examiner wanted to tell them. Good fought back the overwhelming nausea, forcing himself to look up. The man's voice was calm, almost amused. Many recruits, he said, joined the military dreaming of a comfortable life, high pay, and security. But those weren't the things that actually kept people here. Over time, they would realize there was something far greater worth pursuing. When that moment came, their original motivations would seem insignificant. With a smirk, the examiner turned to leave. Good watched him go, realizing the officer was much nicer than he expected. Standing up on shaky legs, he called out, asking if they could at least know the man's name. The examiner turned around, striking a dramatic pose before grinning over his shoulder, telling them his name was Vanner. Then, laughing, he added, "You're welcome to seek revenge on me anytime." And just like that, he was gone. Good stood there, dumbfounded, because that was not what he had meant at all. They were soon brought to the next room. Wade stood at the center, surveying the recruits with a look of interest. He muttered something about these being the knight candidates. That caught Good off guard, and he wondered if the First Army was actually recruiting knights. Usually, the title was reserved for noble-born warriors, the kind of role he'd never even dreamed of. Before he could dwell on it, Tilly strode into the room, smiling, and said it's actually called Sky Knights. The name alone made it clear who had come up with it. Of course, it was her brother. But she was quick to add that they were far from that stage. For now, they were merely recruits. As she got closer to the men, the royal guard hesitated, unsure whether they should step aside, but Tilly waved them off, saying she had protection. As she greeted the recruits, Good felt his face heat up, but he wasn't alone. The entire group turned red before finally recognizing who stood before them, and they hurriedly knelt. Tilly motioned for them to rise. She knew they had questions. The unusual recruitment, the strange selection process, there was a lot to explain. But for now, she kept it simple. First, they weren't joining the First Army or the Second Army. This was something entirely new. Her brother had plans for a completely different kind of military force, unlike anything the world had seen before, and that's why the tests had been so unconventional. Excitement surged through the room until she delivered the next blow. She tells them they weren't even close to being called soldiers yet. At best, they were reserve candidates, starting from the absolute bottom. The trials ahead would be far more grueling than what they had just endured. Compared to what was coming, these tests were nothing but child's play. She then became more serious and said out of the 16 people standing there, maybe, just maybe 1 or 2 would make it as Sky Knights. Or possibly none for that matter. Good's heart pounded. So it really was knighthood. He didn't know what separated a sky knight from a traditional knight. But that didn't matter because for the first time, a commoner with no noble ties was being given the chance, and of course, it would be hard. But when had anything in his life ever been easy? Tilly continued, explaining that right now, only she and her brother fully understood what this new force would become. However, since her brother had other responsibilities, the training and leadership would fall to her instead. Good finally realized this wasn't just about joining a new army. If they succeeded, they might actually become knights personally appointed by the princess herself. That realization spread through the group like wildfire. Excitement bubbled up, and the atmosphere shifted. Tilly noticed the sudden change but was not entirely sure why, but she pressed on anyway. All successful recruits would be moving to a designated training site. There, they would receive new housing, official identification, and a place within the new royal capital. But there was a catch. Even as reserve members, they were now under military jurisdiction. Dropping out midway wouldn't be as simple as walking away, it would be considered desertion. Any act of defying military orders would also have consequences. The recruits straightened immediately, voicing their commitment. Satisfied, Tilly nodded and handed things over to Wade for the final step. Wade stepped forward, holding a piece of paper, and instructed them to repeat after him. And so, they swore their oaths to the King of Grey Castle. By evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The streets were quiet, most people were already gone. Without wasting another second, he sprinted home. Back home, Rachel was cooking dinner. Before he could say anything, she glanced over saying he was late. Good scratched his head, apologizing. But she already heard from the neighbor that Good had landed a great job. But she wasn't interested in the details. Instead, she held out her hand expectantly. Good looked confused. Rachel frowned, pointing at him saying he promised her egg pancakes. As it turned out, Good had completely forgotten about it. He scrambled to make up for it, swearing he'd bring some next time. Actually, every week, and as much as she wants. But Rachel looked unconvinced. Hoping to distract her, he quickly pulled something from his bag and asked her to look at it. It was a package from the princess. Inside were several books, but Good doesn't know how to read. Rachel took one, glancing at the cover, and read a few words such as Flight and Operations. The full name turned out to be Flight Principles and Operations Manual. Back in Roland's study, Tilly handed over the final roster to Roland. He took it with a nod, passing her a cup of tea and asking how the recruitment was going. Tilly replied not as many as they hoped, but the ones they got were fine. In the end, only 200 recruits made the cut. She wasn't satisfied with the numbers because against demons, that number was barely a drop in the ocean. Roland, however, believed the first step was always the hardest. Once they had real examples like true pioneers leading the way, the second wave of recruitment would go much smoother. And when that time came, it wouldn't just be limited to Neverwinter. Tilly and Nightingale exchanged glances, both wondering what he was planning. Roland closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting somewhere else. He knew people had different ambitions and different perspectives. But one thing had always been true: the fact humans always had an innate longing for the vast, open skies. And if they were to claim their place in the air, the first step was building an army that could fly. Of course, he didn't get ahead of himself. Training pilots wasn't like training foot soldiers. With flight control systems still in their infancy, natural talent was everything. Basic endurance, coordination, and resistance to vertigo were just entry-level requirements. Spatial awareness, quick reflexes, and an instinctive grasp of aircraft mechanics, those were what truly determined the best pilots. While the First Army's veterans were disciplined and reliable, they weren't necessarily suited for this new force. Handpicking a few outstanding officers was possible, but forming an entire air corps from existing soldiers was pushing it. That was why he had widened the selection criteria, bringing in fresh recruits from the new residents. Just then, something caught his attention. 6 recruits had failed to complete the oath ceremony. Nightingale leaned in and tells him those 6 hadn't simply been hesitant, they were actually lying. Wade had taken them aside for questioning, and 2 of them were even official residents of Neverwinter. Roland sighed. It wasn't exactly surprising. People change, and loyalty wavers. He had never expected everyone to be unwaveringly devoted. But even so, seeing this firsthand left a bitter taste. The investigation wasn't over yet, but Nightingale had pieced together the basics. These people had been bribed by foreign merchants, trying to infiltrate the military for firearms technology. The authorities had already moved in. So far, only one low-level assistant had been caught in a local hotel. But thanks to Summer's abilities, they managed to uncover a letter from the old royal capital. The mastermind behind it turned out to be a noble. They now had names and faces, and thanks to Soroya's sketches, those faces had already been sent to Tassa through messenger animals, so catching them is just a matter of time. Roland said nothing at first. Nightingale looked at him for a moment, then tilted her head asking if something was bothering him. He chuckled, shook his head, and said she had done well. But if these nobles wanted to play games, he had just the place for them. The mines at North Slope could always use extra hands. Seems like some people are still clinging to the past, refusing to accept that the world has changed. He wasn't surprised. After all, feudal rule had lasted for over 1,000 years. No one could expect it to disappear overnight. Tilly brought the conversation back on track. The issue with the people was solved, but what about the planes? Roland cleared his throat awkwardly, quickly shifting the topic to something else, mentioning that Evelyn had recently crafted a batch of chaos drinks with an incredible taste and asking if Tilly wanted to try some. Instinctively, Tilly agreed, but the moment the words left her mouth, she realized what had just happened. They were talking about planes. Was Roland seriously telling her he hadn't even built one yet? Roland explained that most people still needed to start with basic literacy and theoretical knowledge and that gliders could serve as a demonstration. But before he could finish, Tilly slammed her hand on the table, firmly pointing out that even gliders, once modified, flew completely differently from an actual plane. If she hadn't personally operated a real plane, how could she possibly teach others? Roland cast a worried glance at his poor, abused table as Tilly continued, making it clear that even if things went as he suggested, she would still need at least a month to fully understand the aircraft's capabilities and adjust the flight manual accordingly. That also took time. Since Roland had entrusted this responsibility to her, she had no choice but to push him to complete his part of the job. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Roland quickly promised that within 2 weeks, he would deliver a fully operational plane. Only then did Tilly seem satisfied. And, of course, since the matter was settled, it was finally time to try that amazing chaos drink. After the three of them enjoyed their drinks, Tilly said her goodbyes and left. Nightingale, however, seemed puzzled. When Roland asked what was wrong, she pointed out that Tilly often called him brother in public, but rarely did so when they were alone. Roland realized she had a point. He had no idea why either. Both of them rubbed their chins trying to figure out why. Meanwhile, on the other side, Akima's escort team was making their way through the mountain. It wasn't long before they came across a trap. Everyone immediately readied themselves for a potential battle, and upon triggering the mechanism, they discovered it was a tripwire linked to a barrage of spears. There were quite a few of these traps scattered around, but they didn't seem like the kind set by ordinary hunters. These traps looked meant for humans. Sean questioned where the trigger was, but the guide in the group shook his head. The vines under their feet, the branches above any part of the surroundings could be part of the mechanism. Burning the whole area down would be the only way to get rid of them. For a moment he even considered taking a detour. But before anyone could decide, the Takira witch stepped forward and pulled out her sword while signaling everyone to move back. The Baldy even tried to calm her down, warning her it was too dangerous. He could barely bring himself to watch. But in just a few seconds, every single trap was sliced in half. The entire terrain in front of them had changed. Deciding to be thorough, she went ahead and cut down all the surrounding vines as well. Satisfied with her work, she turned back to the group and casually informed them that the path was now clear. Akima's mouth hung open and she thought to herself that this Takira, which was exactly the kind of force one would expect from someone sent by His Majesty. The group pressed forward, though the Baldy was still in disbelief. He quickly praised everyone for their extraordinary skills. But the witch cut him off, uninterested in flattery. What she wanted was an explanation. Why were these kinds of traps in the mountains? They clearly weren't meant for hunting animals. He hesitated for a moment before admitting the truth. These traps were indeed designed for people. The further they climbed the mountain, the more they would find. In fact, this mountain, which is called Cage Mountain, actually had another name called Trap Mountain. These weren't recent additions either. Generations of lords had left them behind, all with one purpose: to keep out the Wolfheart Kingdom. That revelation caught the group off guard. Turned out, the mountain range stretched all the way from the coast to the ruins of Old Holy City, forming a natural border between the two kingdoms. On the other side lay the Kingdom of Dawn. But the real issue was the mountain's shape. From the south, it appeared to be a steep rise, but in reality, the slope was gentle enough that descending was much easier than it seemed. This made it a perfect route for neighboring raiders, hunters, and refugees, all of whom frequently crossed into Dawn's territory, leaving the local citizens in constant distress. For the local lords, it was an ongoing headache. But instead of strengthening defenses, they came up with what they saw as a more permanent solution, which was simply abandoning the area altogether. That surprised the group even more. Instead of defending their own land, the rulers had just given up on it. He shrugged, explaining that the nobility had no desire to attract the king's attention to the issue. After all, they weren't the desperate ones struggling to survive on the other side of the mountain. Unlike the Wolfheart refugees, they had the luxury of simply living elsewhere. So, after sealing off the region, they filled it with dense vines, wild vegetation, and an endless number of traps. Over the centuries, this practice had transformed the mountain into what it is today. As the group moved forward, Akima found herself thinking about the irony of it all. The same people who built the traps to keep outsiders away ended up trapped themselves. They had isolated their enemies, but in doing so, they had also cut themselves off. She knew, however, that His Majesty Roland would never choose such a path. She believes that Roland's eyes are always set on the horizon, always beyond what is in front of him. She can't believe she's actually thinking about him. But anyway, the mission came first. The sooner she completed it, the sooner she could return to her sisters. Activating her ability, she quickly traced what they were searching for. Excitement rippled through the group, but before they could charge ahead, the Takara witch signaled them to stop. She then tells everyone she will scout ahead alone. Beyond the trees stood an abandoned structure. This didn't make sense to Akima. His Majesty had sent her to locate a rare mineral, so why was the source coming from a ruin? However, the Takara witch found this place very interesting. When Sean asked what she meant, she explained that remnants of an underground civilization could be found scattered across the continent. But what made it even more intriguing was the script found in these ruins. However, these symbols didn't seem to be their language, nor did they resemble the characters standardized by the Federation. Considering the histories of the four great kingdoms, wasn't that interesting enough? Akima didn't quite understand what she was trying to say, but Sean on the other hand began brainstorming. He had once heard His Majesty mention that the four great kingdoms were originally nothing more than scattered villages and small towns, little more than the forgotten edges of the continent. In other words, they had no real history. But if this ruin wasn't a remnant of the Divine War, then it meant that at some point in the past, perhaps an unknown civilization had lived here. The Takara witch wasn't ready to jump to conclusions just yet. There was only one way to find out, meaning they had to go inside. Before they could move forward, someone else called attention to a stone tablet nearby. Unlike the unfamiliar symbols in the ruins, this one seemed to be written in their own language. Sean stepped closer, reading the words aloud. Land of the Divine Curse. Enter and face certain death. Beside it, they saw a pile of skeletal remains. The bald man recoiled backward, his voice shaking as he muttered, "Could this be the cursed temple?" All eyes turned to him and it seemed like he knew something. He admitted that he had only ever heard rumors and old tales passed down for generations. The story dates back nearly a century. Back then, a local lord had ordered a massive effort to block the Wolfheart invaders from bypassing the mountain. Traps had been laid across the region, and somewhere along the way, a knight-led expedition stumbled upon this place while carrying out their mission. All of a sudden the Takara witch cut him off before he could continue. She then said they probably found some treasure, smuggled it out, and then got cursed by the gods, one by one dying miserable deaths. The bald man nodded hesitantly. She then scoffed, saying, "Mortals really haven't changed much, have they? The same nonsense from centuries ago still works on them." If she had to guess, the whole story was likely a fabrication, something the lords had cooked up so they could hoard whatever wealth was hidden inside. As for the so-called cursed victims, more than likely, they were murdered to keep the secret buried. The bald man quickly shook his head, explaining that they didn't die right away. It took nearly a decade and they slowly died one by one. However, their final moments were said to be agonizing. It was said their skin peeling from their faces, features twisted in pain. That was how the legend of the curse began. Can you guess what happened and what exactly was this so-called curse was? The Takara witch scanned the area first, just to be safe, then placed a hand on the bald guy's shoulder and asked if he was really sure. One look at her ripped muscles made him nervous, but he stuck to his story, said he heard it all in the tavern, and swore he wasn't lying. If they didn't believe him, he suggested they ask around. He declared that if anything was wrong, the rumor itself was probably flawed. Meanwhile, Akima was thinking if those guys died this long after the event, then the whole cleanup job theory didn't really hold up. She figures that a knight and a lord teaming up to frame the villagers wasn't rare, but killing the knight as well seemed unlikely. Knights after all were still nobles, even minor ones, not the kind of people you could just off without a trial. She worries that maybe this really was some kind of curse. Someone in the group brings up the idea of heading back to town first, maybe digging up more info before they decide what to do next. Baldy stares at them in disbelief, wondering what they mean by the next step, then asks if they came here aiming for the cursed temple from the very beginning. The witch rubs her forehead, and admits that wasn't exactly the plan, just happened to work out that way. She then turns to Sean, reminding him that as His Majesty's trusted guard, surely he wasn't planning on backing out now? Sean, of course, isn't going anywhere. For him, the mission the king gave him always comes first. Now that the target's right in front of them, there's no reason to turn back. So the next step is obviously meeting this so-called god face to face. But Sean warns they can't just charge in unprepared. Turns out, Roland had told Sean earlier there might be danger the closer they got to the source. It was revealed the Takara witch's name was Ross, and Ross was surprised as she didn't expect Roland to be that ahead of the game. Apparently, after she left that night, Roland had a private chat with Sean. He laid out two possible situations, the first being the source is out in the open, and if that's the case, all they had to do was seal off the place and head back. The second is where it's hidden in some underground cave or abandoned mine, and the deeper it goes, the riskier it gets. So if it was the second scenario, then they must gear up. Sean doesn't think they're in a mine but says everything about this place matches one. That's when the soldiers bring over some protective gear. Ross flips through one of them looking puzzled, saying just looks like regular leather to her. Meanwhile, Sean, already putting his on, says that's true but not exactly. She watches as he digs around in his bag and pulls out a weird-looking mask and gloves and starts wrapping up every gap. He says the mask is the most important part and only now it's not just leather anymore. Ross has no words for it, but Akima finds it oddly cute. Sean decides only 5 people are going in, the rest will stay put. Besides Akima and Ross, he asks who else wants to go in. Akima's already halfway into her suit, but Ross doesn't go for it. She says they should keep a spare set just in case. Sean asks if she's sure. Ross explains that God's punishment warriors have way higher resistance and healing than normal folks. Regular poisons and curses don't really affect them. Plus, she doesn't believe some 10-year-long sickness that lingers in mortals would do much against a body like hers. Ross points out that wearing that bulky suit would actually slow her down and dull her senses. If they really ran into some no-way-out situation, she suggests it'd be smarter to have a spare set ready, remarking it's better to give the backup crew outside a shot at rescuing them. Not that she expects it to come to that, but just in case. Akima, though, can't shake the fear and worries, what if this really was a curse? Ross simply taps her chest plate. She says to forget whether a leather coat can block a god. If there's really a god involved, let him come for her instead. She declares that after seeing the millions of Takira people buried on the fertile plains, what more could the gods possibly curse them with? Sean doesn't respond. He just goes quiet for a moment, then turns to the group and says it's time to move. Inside the ruins, the team treads carefully, relying only on torchlight to see. Ross takes the lead, sword in hand, hacking away thick vines that block their path. If it weren't for her, this downhill stretch alone might have taken them most of the day to get through. The place is clearly ancient, but Sean suggests it's not exactly as Baldy described, saying it's not just some cursed site sealed away after an incident. He thinks people were coming and going here for a while. Ross asks what makes him think that. Sean explains there are torch slots carved into the walls, and the cuts are way sharper than the weathered stone around them, which are signs they were added much later. He asks, if this was just a shelter from the rain, why bother planting torches every 10 steps? Ross catches on quickly. If there was treasure here, there's no way the local lord wouldn't be interested. Maybe the Baldy wasn't lying after all, maybe the story just got twisted along the way. What really worries her, though, is the thing King Roland asked them to find. She suggests it might be the very treasure this rumor is built around. Sean shares that concern, saying if there's more than one source, who knows how many have already been taken over the last century and where they ended up. According to Roland, this thing was key to creating the sun, so they can't afford to let it fall into the wrong hands. But for now, they have no answers. All they can do is push forward. Whatever's at the root of this mystery, they'll only understand it once they find the first source. Suddenly, Ross stops. She raises a hand to halt the others, then she tells everyone they're getting close. Right in front of them is a glowing black wall. Ross tosses a rock at it and somehow it passes straight through. She doesn't hesitate and quickly walks in. Sean and a couple of First Army soldiers follow right behind. Akima stays back for a second, staring into the light. She remembers what it felt like before she accepted the king's mission, remarking how she always thought she was brave. But now, standing here, it's obvious that compared to Sean or Ross, she's still got a long way to go. She realizes that maybe the fear is what's kept her from ever truly leaving slumbering all behind. When it comes down to it, she thinks, it's not about duty or hesitation, perhaps it's just plain fear. And then, as if hearing Nightingale's voice again in her mind, she clenches her fists and steps through. But it was pitch black inside. The group kept walking for what felt like ages before they could even start to make out their surroundings. Ross figures they've reached the bottom of the ruins. It didn't look too spacious, though. Sean's a bit surprised she can see the edges in this kind of darkness, but Ross explains it's no big deal for someone like her. Spend enough time underground, she says, and your eyes either adapt or go blind. It's just that simple. Then she turns to Akima and asks how far they still are from the source. Akima activates her ability again, and a soft glow begins to spread. She starts seeing fireflies-like stuff floating through the air. The light drifts across the chamber, illuminating the entire area. Even the stone tablets start to shine. Everyone stays quiet for a while, not knowing what she saw. Then Sean finally calls out Akima's name, but she doesn't respond. Sean gets a bit worried and gives her a gentle shake. She blinks awake only to hear Sean ask if she's okay. She nods, saying she's fine. Then she tells them they've already arrived. Sean perks up and asks where exactly. Akima, still a bit dazed, says they're already inside the source. Everyone freezes, then she points around them again and repeats, this entire place is the source. Meanwhile, back in Neverwinter, a guard brought over an urgent letter from the Dawn region on Roland's desk, and as soon as he hears it's from Sean, Roland eagerly tells them to open it up. The package is oddly large. That's when Nightingale leans in and quietly mentions that the whole thing's full of paper. Roland's a little surprised, saying he didn't realize her powers had upgraded to X-ray vision. Nightingale waves it off, saying she wishes if that's the case. Turns out, when the messenger walked in, she just stuck her hand into the package for a feel. Roland can't help but think how she is always on high alert, though a thought sneaks into his head, making him wonder when Evelyn shows up with new chaos drinks or the chef rolls and snacks, did she also feel around just in case? Now that he thinks about it, the afternoon tea portions have been getting smaller lately. His musing is cut short by one of the royal guards. They confirmed the whole package really is full of papers. Some are completely covered in ink. Roland finds it strange at first but soon realizes these aren't random scribbles but rather imprints from carved surfaces. At the very bottom of the package is a letter. Roland has the guards lay out the pages across the floor. He doesn't believe Sean would have sent useless stuff over, so they must be important. As he opens the letter reads, "Your Majesty, Lady Akima has located the source you were seeking. It's in a place called Cage Mountain, positioned between the Kingdom of Dawn and Wolfheart. However, it's not in a mine, it's inside an ancient ruin. However, the place is strange as it doesn't match the known underground civilizations. It also doesn't resemble the architecture of the Takira refugees. They once suspected it might have come from the sea demon beneath the ocean, but Akima's discovery rules that out. Turned out, all of them agreed this ruin had to be the work of a completely unknown race, and perhaps a civilization they have never heard about." Reading all this gave Roland a headache. A mysterious civilization, never before recorded, and it once moved through the lands of the four great kingdoms? That was news even the Federation hadn't heard of. He reasons that if such a group did exist back then, there's no way the Takira witches would have missed them hundreds of years ago. However, this can only mean if Sean's findings are accurate, this race might have lived before even the underground civilization. But what really bugged him was why were these people so obsessed with uranium ore? He kept reading. Meanwhile, Sean had noted that the builders of the ruin left behind tons of murals on the lower stone walls. There were creatures drawn all over them, but none matched any of the other known races. From the content, both Ross and Sean believed the place might have been some sort of execution ground. The structure sat right on top of the source vine. The builders not only mined the stuff Roland was looking for, they baked it into bricks to build the floors and walls. And Akima had found elemental traces of the source in every corner, even in the murals themselves. All around the ruin were cages and piles of bones, some from strange creatures, others from beings that looked exactly like the executioners themselves. It looked like they tortured their own kind using the source's power like it was some twisted offering to please their god. Sean had managed to rub a good number of those murals onto paper, but he mentioned progress was slow since they didn't have enough protective suits for everyone. Roland figured that too, because what he got was just part of the full record. Sean guessed it'd take another 2 months to finish the rest. But he also expressed concern about Ross's remarks and how she hadn't worn any of the protective gear. And worse, he pointed out that the locals who first found the ruin had all ended up dead. He warns that the place probably still holds hidden dangers. And this is exactly what Roland was afraid of. Nightingale noticed and asked what was wrong. She thought Roland was concerned about Ross, and she reasons that if God's punishment warriors' bodies got cursed, they'd just hop into a fresh body and carry on saying it's not a big deal for them. But Roland wasn't worried about curses. He was worried about Sean, Akima, and the soldiers still in that ruin. According to his initial plan, they weren't supposed to stay in there for so long. All he wanted was to find the source, and he needed everyone to leave the place immediately if they did. But Sean, clearly trying to help, had taken it upon himself to rub down every mural in sight. Sean clearly is unaware of what uranium can do, but Roland does. Whether it was uranium or a refined uranium, the radiation it gave off was mostly alpha particles, not dangerous if they stayed on the surface. But down in a mine? That was a different story. He knew some of those radioactive elements perhaps had been sitting there for hundreds of millions of years, breaking down into even more dangerous stuff like radon. Radon was a gas, had a short half-life, and worst of all, it could be inhaled. Once inside, it could start blasting cells from within. That's why the suits he designed for the expedition were fully sealed, meant to keep out toxic elements and gases. The activated charcoal filters in the masks could trap radon and other harmful substances, but only for a while. The filters would eventually lose their ability to absorb. The longer they stayed down there, the higher the risk. Anyone helping with the wall rubbings might already be breathing in radon far past the safety limit. That thought made Roland really anxious. He immediately called for Honey, then sat down and began writing a letter and tells her to have the messenger animal deliver this letter to the team immediately. After everything settled down, Roland found himself staring at the mural rubbings again. Something about them stuck in his mind. He suddenly stepped forward and asked Nightingale if she noticed that one of the scenes looked familiar. She looked at it for a long while, then said it looked no different from the rest, just darker, maybe a bit more ink on this one. Roland sighs inwardly, thinking that, yeah, combat instinct and art appreciation really don't go hand in hand. He then asked her to fetch a map of the far southern territory. Once he had it, Roland compared it to the mural, and there it was, a perfect match. The layout, the markings, it was all identical. He wonders, could this all be just a coincidence? But Nightingale then points out that where the Sand People used to live. That's when Roland froze. He stepped closer, eyes locked on that one area. He recognized being a divine relic site, saying there's no doubt about it. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to a dimly lit dungeon. A man holding a whip kept lashing someone tied up. Another figure stepped forward, told him to stop. He stood in front of a woman and demanded she tell them where the holy book was. He declared the church was finished and there was no reason to keep it a secret. He warned her to stop being stubborn. If not for herself, then for the sake of her captured companions. But in his head, he was fuming. He cursed and called them pathetic rebels. He couldn't understand why they wouldn't just submit. Hadn't he already made an example out of those envoys he executed? He held command over a squad of God's punishment warriors. With them, he could have gone anywhere so long as he stayed clear of Grey Castle. And yet, these lunatics had tried to assassinate him. If he hadn't asked for a bunch of them back with Pope Maine, his head would probably be hanging at the castle walls by now. However, of the 20 God punishment warriors he'd worked so hard to preserve, most were either dead or badly crippled. After the fight, only 2 or 3 were still standing. He cursed again. If it weren't for that damn book, he would have had Farina carved into pieces a long time ago. But Farina didn't even flinch. She said she didn't know if the church was truly finished, but he definitely was. She didn't call him Count Lorenzo, she called him a traitor. She admitted she hadn't expected him to have so many of those warriors left, but now she knows he was running low. That's why he was this desperate for the holy book. It was obvious he wanted all of the church's secrets, like the legacy of the popes, and how to create more of God's punishment warriors, or really anything to keep his pitiful status intact. Lorenzo, enraged, slapped her hard and grabbed her by the throat, demanding she tells him what he wanted. But Farina just smiled at him. Lorenzo said he had no patience left and he wasn't here to play games, so he ordered the knights to chop her companion's legs off. Farina rolled her eyes and told him to stop acting. She then mocked him, said the fingers he sent last time, the ones he claimed were fresh, but pointed out the blood had already dried and turned dark. She asked sarcastically if he's gotten too comfortable lately and doesn't even remember the difference between the dead and the living anymore. She'd known the truth all along, saying he'd already killed all her companions. The body parts were just leftovers from corpses. Farina told him flat out she wasn't even the acting pope, so there was no way she'd ever laid hands on the holy book. Maybe Lord Thor knew something, but if he did, he never mentioned it to her. She said nobody alive now would ever figure out how to make more God's punishment warriors. But Lorenzo didn't buy it. He believed Thor sent Farina to Wolfheart for one reason, and that is to rebuild the church. Without the holy book, how could they ever stand against Grey Castle? Farina just laughed and tells him even with those warriors, they didn't stand a chance against Grey Castle. Thor only wanted to protect what was left, and let the survivors live out the rest of their days in peace. Lorenzo shook his head and he didn't believe a word of it. If that were true, then why did they try to attack this city? He claimed she was clearly after the stash, money, food, and of course the weapons. He argued that Thor handed her the God punishment warriors, so clearly, it wasn't just about survival. Farina sighed. Whether he believed her or not didn't matter anymore. But she still pointed out that all this bloodshed started with him. If he hadn't executed those envoys, they never would have attacked in the first place. And of all the options, he picked the worst one. She said she hated traitors most of all. Lorenzo had betrayed the trust of His Holiness Oberlin and didn't deserve the quiet life Thor gave him. She admitted she regretted not killing him herself, but she knew the nobles of Wolfheart would soon see through his bluff and point out that he'd never be one of them. To them, he was just a traitor waiting for the end. Oddly enough, her words didn't make him snap but rather calmed him. Complete rage gave way to cold calculation. He figured Farina was trying to provoke him into killing her, just to protect the book, but he wasn't going to fall for it. He reminded her that besides stockpiles of supplies, the castle also kept the old tools used to torture witches. Although she isn't a witch, he's curious how long can she last. Lorenzo, ever the sadist, leaned in with another round of twisted threats. Back in the castle halls, Lorenzo stormed out and smashed a teacup in frustration. He's in a bad spot since he couldn't block trade routes or seal ports because doing that would raise suspicion. But if he left things as they were, those merchants crawling around were basically spies for the nobles. His forces were thin, and he needed to rebuild his strength fast, but couldn't get what he needed. Just then, the steward approached with news he thought was worth hearing. Lorenzo wasn't in the mood, but the steward eyed the broken teacup and said this bit of news might actually help him out of his current mess. That got Lorenzo's attention. The steward reported that near the Dawn's border, people were moving toward Cage Mountain again. Lorenzo brushed it off, questioning what's it got to do with him. Nobody owned that place and there was nothing in it for him. But the steward said it wasn't about the place. It was who was moving in. According to multiple sources, it was none other than the king of Grey Castle. Lorenzo's face changed instantly and he demanded details. The steward explained the intel had already been confirmed by several channels. He started laying out Grey Castle's recent movements, troops stationed at the base of Cage Mountain, death row prisoners being gathered from across the Kingdom of Dawn. For some reason, all reportedly working for King Roland. Hearing that, Lorenzo tried to piece everything together. Cage Mountain and death row prisoner. An old rumor immediately came to mind. The steward nodded, saying he'd thought of the same thing. But Lorenzo couldn't figure it out, asking how the hell did Roland even know about any of this? The steward explained the ruins were originally found by a stroke of luck anyway. Maybe Roland got lucky too. What mattered more was Roland clearly cared a lot about the place. According to some reports, a group of villagers once left that so-called cursed temple with strange treasures, only to die off one after another. But the treasure mostly ended up in the hands of the local nobles. One of them, the Count of Cliffridge, had taken a special interest. He believed it wasn't a curse that killed those people, it was the items themselves. He bought a few pieces and started doing research. After losing over a dozen researchers in the process, he made a chilling discovery: those seemingly ordinary items gave off deadly rays, and found out they were invisible weapons capable of killing without a trace. Unfortunately, the treasure didn't live up to its terrifying promise for long. After just a few uses, the energy inside was drained. The Count, despite sending people out repeatedly and even risking the trip himself, could never figure out how to restore it. In the end, he recorded the entire affair in his family history, hoping future generations might uncover the answer. That treasure and the journal eventually changed hands again. 100 years later, when the church took over the region, both were claimed. The steward reminds Lorenzo that he himself was interested in the item when he first found it, but after getting nothing out of it, he just tossed it into storage. It was meant to be sent to the Holy City for review, but then came the disastrous defeat at Cold Wind Ridge, and the church's complete collapse. The whole thing was probably long forgotten. Only now, reminded by his steward, does Lorenzo vaguely recall any of it. He then tells the steward to go on. The steward suggests a possibility, saying what if Roland got wind of similar treasure from other ruins, maybe even learned how to reactivate them? If that were true, and they could somehow get that intel, it would be the next best thing to replace the god's punishment warriors. Lorenzo agrees and remarks that this kind of weapon is silent, invisible, and deadly, so it would be enough to scare the nobles of Wolfheart into staying quiet. It could buy them the time they desperately needed to track down the holy book. He then orders the steward to go with him to the warehouse. He had to make sure the treasure was still there, and more importantly, that it was protected. After a long search through the cluttered storage, they finally found it. At first glance, Lorenzo thought it was no different than a slab of polished granite, but in the next second, the thing began to glow. Even the steward was caught off guard. That stone had sat silent for over a century, and now, suddenly, it reacted. Lorenzo couldn't believe the timing. Just as Roland's people showed up at the cursed temple, this dormant object started to respond. He tells the steward to go to Cage Mountain himself, reasoned he doesn't trust anyone else other than the steward. As for money or supplies, he doesn't care how much it costs. All he wants is information. And one last thing he reminded him: under no circumstances can the king of Greycastle find out about this. Roland may have crushed the church, but this treasure might be the only way they could push back. The scene shifts again, this time to a cozy, bustling tavern. A hooded man walks in, and at the same table a man picks up a drink, pretending to sip while scanning the room. Once the coast is clear, he leans in and quietly asks how she is doing. The crowd keeps laughing and chatting, no one paying them any attention. The man across from him answers that Farina's still alive but not doing well. Every day, she's tortured. Her screams echo through the halls, and he worries that at this rate, she won't last. The man already expected that. Ever since their assault on the castle failed, it was obvious those who lived would suffer. And as their leader, Farina was bound to take the worst of it. The traitor wanted information and also wanted to break her. In frustration, the man clenches his teeth. He regrets ever agreeing to her plan, having her draw the enemy's attention and let God's punishment warriors flank from the side. Back then, he was also told if the battle turned, they must retreat. He says he should have stayed and died with the others. After a pause, the other person asks, what does Lorenzo even want? Why not just give it to him? But the man explains Lorenzo's after something that's not even in their possession. Whatever he wants was lost with the fall of Hermes. Hearing this, the other man bows his head for a moment in prayer. The man finds it ironic. Once, the man in front of him is just one of many regular followers who he doesn't think twice about. Now, he's depending on the loyalty of one of the plainest believers around. And yet this believer is more pious than many of the church's former higher-ups. Somehow he isn't worried about this being a trap because he knows he has nothing left. And if this man were one of the traitor's spies, it would have been obvious by now he himself simply has no value to offer. Soon after, the faithful follower gets up and says he has to get back before the overseers get suspicious. He mentions he'll be back in 3 days and asks if they'll meet here again, which the man nods. As he pulls his hood back on, he casually mentions there's another thing he should be aware of. He remarks Lorenzo's men had gathered a small force and were apparently heading toward Cage Mountain's border. He's not sure if the info is useful, but it might be. The man thanks him and watches him leave. He takes another sip of his drink, then thinks about Cage Mountain and remembers something. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. He quickly pulled out the document Lord Thor had left behind before jumping from the city walls. It mentioned the history between humans and demons, and the origins of the so-called divine war. This secret blew everyone's minds, but now it all made sense why Thor had been so insistent on evacuating Hermes. Suddenly he understood why he was so desperate to get them all out. Back in the day, Lorenzo had been tasked with collecting supplies across Wolfart, and the treasure from Cage Mountain wasn't exactly a secret. But whether or not that treasure ever made it to Hermes, he didn't know. Looking at it now, it was starting to feel like the king of Grey Castle might be chasing the same thing. He knew the nobles of Wolfheart might hesitate, but definitely not Roland, because nobody could stand against that army of his. Maybe he could use this to his advantage and let Roland deal with the traitor. And when that happens, Farina could finally be saved. He thinks of her smile again, and in that moment, makes up his mind. This time, he was going to save her. This time, he will not live with regrets. The scene then shifts to the third border town. Celine and others had been digging through records for hours but still hadn't found anything remotely close, not even from the ancient underground civilizations. She points out that the first written mention of the far southern lands appeared about 860 years ago. It was just a travel journal written by a witch, and even then, only a few lines, enough to confirm that the region was already a desert back then. Completely exhausted, the three of them finally flopped to the floor. Roland suggests them to rest for a bit. Celine said she wanted to, but her body just couldn't sit still. This discovery was massive, and she even called it earth-shaking. It didn't just flip the Federation's understanding, it perhaps threatened to rewrite the entire history of humanity. Celine felt overwhelmed, saying it was weird. She felt like she suddenly understood so much, and yet like something big had slipped through her fingers. Roland tells her it's normal and remarks, the more you learn, the more you realize how little you really know. In the end, he says, everything always boils down to three core questions. Naturally, all of them were curious, asking which three questions. Roland held up three fingers, then said, "Where am I? Who am I fighting? And who's fighting me?" The three of them blinked, frozen for a second. Then they pounced, playfully ganging up on Roland. Roland then insisted he was just trying to lighten the mood. But then he offered the real version, the one a proper response is actually, "Who am I? Where did I come from? And where am I going?" Pasha quietly repeated it, saying it sounded simple, but when you really tried to answer, it wasn't easy at all. However, Aletheia said it was easy. "I'm Aletheia," she said confidently. "I'm from Takira, and I'll return to Takira." Celine reached out and ruffled her head. She said sometimes she really did envy Aletheia. A simple mind, after all, can be a kind of blessing. Pasha gave a soft smile and thanked Roland. His little joke really had lightened the mood. But what made her a bit surprised was Roland himself. Calm, composed, even considering about how they felt. It was as if none of this came as a surprise to him. Roland explained that now that they'd confirmed both the exact location of the Divine War and the existence of an unknown race, there was no point waiting around. He suggested they hold a meeting. After all, the sooner everyone knew, the better. The three smiled and said in unison, "As you wish, Your Majesty." Soon, the officials were all gathered in the castle. Once the full story was laid out, Tilly was the first to speak. She asked, if this was the Divine War, then who was the winner? It wasn't the demons, underground civilizations, or even humans. So where were they now? Pasha then brought up the two phrases from the underground civilization records. "Magic makes us extraordinary, and to wield magic is to ascend the ladder of divine will." She asks, if all sides in the Divine War were magic wielders, could the winners have gone even further, perhaps pushed magic to a new level and simply disappeared to a place beyond what others could see? Roland stayed silent, but he was definitely thinking. The Takira witches had clearly put serious effort into their theory, even if it's not a perfect theory. But it was still better than shrugging and saying we don't know. But he thought about it more. Normally, the stronger a civilization, the longer its traces should last. Ancient people built with straw and mud, give it 1,000 years, and it all turns to dust. But concrete buildings in Neverwinter would still leave outlines centuries from now. So a civilization powerful enough to win the Divine War, and yet somehow leaves behind almost nothing? The fact only scraps were left in forgotten ruins made it hard not to imagine something quite grim. Because if even victory couldn't stop civilization from vanishing, then this might get people thinking, what's the point of fighting and breaking their belief? Edith added another detail: those murals they found were painted at least 1,400 years ago. That meant the human recorded history of Divine War might not have been the first one. Roland agreed with her, but he worried that changing the terminology might confuse things. So he gave that ancient conflict a new, temporary name, calling it the Lost War. Whether it was the first, second, or 10th didn't matter as much as understanding what happened. Barav then asked about the spring campaign and whether they should continue the upcoming military push. Roland told him to proceed as planned. Even if there were countless mysteries left in the so-called Divine War, they couldn't afford to stop. He said maybe the war itself was a path forward, a way to get closer to reveal the secrets. But if they lost to the demons, then there'd be no hope left to find out anything at all. This time, they weren't just pushing back the demons, they were going to wipe them off the fertile plains for good. Roland stood tall and told everyone that this wasn't just about securing more room for Neverwinter's growth. It was about laying the foundation for ultimate victory. With that, Neverwinter kicked into full gear. And before everything launched, Roland met with Thunder one last time. Thunder was more than ready and said he could barely wait to set sail for the Shadow Isle. He said every second spent piloting that steel giant, he imagined it slicing through ocean winds and waves. If it were up to him, he'd just steer straight toward the horizon. But Margaret interrupted and reminded him that such a move would leave them stranded halfway, out of food and fresh water. Not to mention the investors who'd poured money into him, and the fleet wouldn't exactly be thrilled if he ditched them at sea. Unless, of course, he was planning to never return to the fjord. Thunder chuckled after hearing this. He explained he was just trying to express how excited he was. But Margaret was right, this wasn't just his journey anymore. For the fjords, this was bigger than any expedition in history. New sea routes meant new fortunes, and no merchant guild could resist that kind of promise. If he wanted to do it right, he had to return soon and prepare properly. By now, Roland could tell Thunder had already mastered the ins and outs of that steel ship over the past few months. Thunder turned to Anna and thanked her for all the tweaks she'd made to the ship's structure. He admitted he hadn't thought such a massive iron vessel could outmaneuver a traditional triple-mast sailboat. Anna, in turn, had a request. The ship had only ever been tested along shallow coastal waters. If possible, she asked Thunder to bring back a deep-sea navigation report. Ideally, it should be written using Neverwinter's new waterproof ink and sealed in airtight bags, just in case it ended up overboard. Thunder was surprised but nodded quickly and said he'd make it happen. Roland also had something for him. He needed Thunder to recruit a group of explorers. This wasn't for the Shadow Isle though, and tells him it was about the Endless Cape. Margaret raised an eyebrow. She'd heard that place was just sand and black water. There's absolutely nothing else. Roland had thought the same, but now, he suspected it might be more than it seemed. It wasn't particularly dangerous, and it didn't require elite specialists. What mattered most was numbers. Thunder said the fjords had plenty of adventurers, so he asked about the selection criteria. Roland replied there weren't any. As long as they were explorers, they qualified. And the deal was simple: find anything out there, even if it's just a single stone from a ruin, and there'd be a reward, but it has to be from the Endless Cape. Thunder was surprised and asked, even a brick? Roland confirmed, saying as long as it came from Endless Cape, and yes, the offer stood as long as he remained king. Thunder nodded and said he understood. Then he turned the conversation back to the ship, asking if it had a name yet. Roland said yes, and he planned to call it the Snowwind. Thunder liked the sound of it, but asked if it might be a little too gentle for something made of steel. Roland explained that true strength lies in balance, like how blending power and softness together. And more than that, the name carried a sense of good fortune. With luck on their side, perhaps Snowwind would bring Thunder and his crew safely through whatever the sea had in store. By evening, Roland made his way to the docks. Joan was there, lingering on her goodbyes with the other members of her little team. Lightning, Lorca, and Maisie had all shown up to say their goodbye. Maisie couldn't hold back her tears. Lightning, however, wasn't her usual self and was really quiet. Lorca wrapped an arm around Maisie, offering some comfort while waving her hands to bid Joan farewell. Then, slowly but surely, the Snowwind began to pull away from the dock. Roland stood there, ice following its path as it cut through the water. He could feel how everyone was changing, all moving forward in their own way. And even though the sisters were parting for now, this wasn't a goodbye but rather just a pause before the reunion to come.